Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of my presidential tier list. The first two videos, in which I rank the presidents up to FDR, and the script and slides are all linked in the description, so check them out if you feel like it. In this part, I'll cover Truman to Trump's second term and compare my opinions to historians' lists. We start today with the 33rd president, Harry Truman. Truman became president in 1945 after FDR died. FDR's VP was John Nance Garner in his first two terms, and Henry Wallace in his third. So why was Truman chosen as VP in 1944? Well, after Garner broke with FDR over court packing in 1938, FDR chose Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace as his running mate in 1940. After the poor 1938 midterm, many Democrats did not want to nominate the far-left Wallace, fearing he would cause them to lose. But the public loved FDR, so most Democrats went along with his wishes, and Wallace became FDR's running mate and then vice president. But in 1944, FDR had less sway. Democrats had lost 45 House and 9 Senate seats in 1942, giving them 112 and 19 less than their peaks after 1936. They won the 1940 presidential election by 10%, from 24% in 1936, and the party knew of FDR's poor health. They nominated FDR again, but this time with a different VP. Wallace's performance as VP had been poor. He was replaced as Board of Economic Warfare head after clashing with the Secretary of State, and was friendly with the Soviet Union, even praising their labor camps after a visit there. Missouri Senator Harry Truman was a much more liked and competent pick. He had broad bipartisan support for leading Senate committees that investigated wartime profiteering, a populist move of fighting big business that also showed his independence from FDR. And he was staunchly anti-communist, which was much more popular than praising the Soviet Union. This made him effective at winning over moderate voters that Wallace may have lost, and with FDR's health worsening, the VP was more important than ever. But Truman also strongly supported the New Deal, so he was a pick that pleased all factions of the party. FDR and Truman faced governors of New York and Ohio, Thomas Dewey and John Bricker, in the 1944 general election. They were the first Republican governors of their states since the Depression, so Republicans hoped they could appeal to moderates around the country and beat FDR. But with the war still going on, their limited foreign policy experience held them back, and FDR won by 7.5% of the popular vote and 5% in the tipping point state of New York. Still, Republicans were at their strongest point since the Great Depression. FDR's presidential margin had narrowed yet again. Democrats didn't gain any Senate seats, even running against their poor 1938. And while they gained 22 House seats, this was less than half of what they had lost 2 years prior. So Democrats were still more popular than Republicans, but only by a little bit. After FDR's death in April 1945, Truman started with approval ratings in the 80s for winning World War II and sympathy for FDR's passing. But over the next year, the economy worsened and his approval ratings fell into the 30s. Then in the 1946 midterms, Republicans broke through and won both houses of Congress. With the war over, millions of men returned home, and unemployment went from 1.2% in 1944 to 6.6% in 1949. Inflation hit double digits as the increased demand for non-war goods was not met by an increase in supply, and wartime price controls and rationing ended. Workers struck for better wages, but with unemployment high, they lacked bargaining power and failed. Republicans then gained 57 House seats and 13 Senate seats in the midterms, giving them majorities in both for the first time post-Depression. One notable gain was Joseph McCarthy, who would go on to lead the Red Scare, defeating progressive Robert La Follette Jr., son of the 1924 presidential candidate, in the Wisconsin Senate race. Over the next 2 years, congressional Republicans passed conservative priorities like the Anti-Union Taft-Hartley Act and the Tax Cut Revenue Act of 1948, both over Truman's veto. But Truman continued advocating for his beliefs, which he called the Fair Deal. This included increased funding for New Deal programs, universal health care, and civil rights legislation. Though these didn't pass Congress, Truman still showed he was fighting for the American people. Republicans were heavily favored in the 1948 presidential election, so they played it safe, renominating Dewey with another governor as a running mate, this time Earl Warren of California. Truman also faced 2 Democrats running on third-party tickets. Henry Wallace was mad that Truman took his VP slot and was opposed to Truman's anti-communist foreign policy, so he ran on a far-left platform. And Strom Thurmond ran on an explicitly racist platform, angered by the Democratic Party's support of civil rights after Truman desegregated the military. September polls showed Dewey up by 17%. Truman campaigned aggressively on his platform and against the conservative Congress. Dewey was more moderate than Congress, but he refused to criticize his fellow Republicans and was still not trusted on foreign policy. And as the economy improved from its 1946 nadir, the final polls only had Dewey up by 5%. Still, Dewey was favored, so the Chicago Tribune went to print with the headline "Dewey defeats Truman." But they were wrong, and this famous picture shows Truman with an inaccurate headline. In retrospect, Truman was not such a large underdog. Dewey's lead had been steadily narrowing, and the final poll was taken before Election Day, so Truman had likely cut into the margin even more. And the polls were also flawed, as they were mostly conducted by phone, which at that time only rich people, who lead Republican, owned. Northern blacks voted massively for Truman due to his support for civil rights and their economic gains under FDR, but were rarely captured in polls. Truman's campaign showed that delivering for the public, running on a real message, and attacking the other side wins elections. He beat Dewey by 4.5% of the popular vote. The electoral vote was closer, as he lost Pennsylvania by 4% and New York by 1%. The tipping point state was Illinois, which he won by 0.84%. Thurmond received 2.4% of the popular vote and won 4 southern states, while Wallace also won 2.4% but was a distant third in all northern states. Democrats also retook both houses of Congress. Running against 1942's midterm, they picked up 9 Senate seats by flipping every Midwestern seat except for Michigan. The Midwest was anti-war in 1942, but supported Truman's economic populism in 1948. Democrats also flipped 75 House seats to retake the majority. They haven't even gained 50 in any election since. They made large gains in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic and held all their southern seats. While Southern Democrats opposed civil rights, they stayed in the party as they mostly agreed with Truman on economic issues. Republicans only remained strong in the wealthy Northeast. Democrats then had minor losses in 1950 as the Korean War became unpopular, but retained both chambers. However, the war continued to drag on, and 1952 went poorly for the Democrats as the Republicans regained their trifecta. Before we cover Truman's terms, let's cover the fifth party system, which I believe started in 1938 and ended in 1980. The fourth party system began in 1896, when Democrats radically shifted from Cleveland's conservatism to William Jennings Bryan's liberalism. They have been the left-wing party ever since. Republicans were clearly conservative by 1920, and Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover all won in massive landslides. But the elections from 1930 to 1936 were disasters for Republicans. They lost 182 House and 40 Senate seats in them, and went from winning the presidency by 17% to losing by 24%. They then shifted their ideology and gained 81 House and 7 Senate seats in 1938, by running moderates who supported the first New Deal but opposed the second one and court packing. From 1940 to 1976, their presidential nominees were all moderates, like New York Governor Thomas Dewey and then General Dwight Eisenhower. Barry Goldwater's racist 1964 candidacy was an exception, but the fact that he got obliterated further proves the rule. Nixon, who started as Eisenhower's VP, moved the party a bit to the right, but change accelerated with Reagan, beginning the sixth party system in the era of neoconservatism and neoliberalism in 1980. Reagan lost to Ford in his 1976 primary challenge, but easily won in 1980. His VP, Bush Sr., also faced a primary challenge for being too moderate, and the next Republican presidents, Bush Jr. and Trump, are far right. And Democrats also became more conservative in the 70s and 80s. From 1932 to 1968, they had left-wing presidents like FDR and Truman, and congressional leaders like House Speaker Sam Rayburn, and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, who of course later became president. But in 1972, George McGovern from the left wing of the party only won one state against Nixon. Nixon cheated, and Democrats had a dominant post-Watergate midterm in 1974, but the party still moved to the center in 1976 by nominating Jimmy Carter. In 1980, Ted Kennedy ran to Carter's left in the Democratic primary. But he lost, and his incredible speech, "The Dream Shall Never Die," at the 1980 DNC was sadly ignored by most Democrats. For example, one of the first lines is, "Let us never misuse unemployment, high interest rates, and human misery as false weapons against inflation." And he argued strongly for universal health care. But 40 years later, the Democratic nominee said he would veto Medicare for all during a pandemic, and his successor campaigned with the historically unpopular war criminal Cheneys. So 1980 is a clear marker for the sixth party system. What were the party's beliefs and bases during the fifth party system? On the economy, as mentioned, Democrats were quite liberal and Republicans were moderate. Dems were more pro-union, as seen with Truman's veto of the Taft-Hartley Act, for universal health care, though they were only able to pass it for seniors, and in favor of more welfare programs in the New Deal, Fair Deal, and Great Society. But the Republicans were also okay with a large government role in the economy. Eisenhower put a lot of federal money towards highway construction and the biggest infrastructure spending in U.S. history. He also doubled Social Security payroll taxes from 1.5% to 3%, and they were further increased by Nixon and Ford. The minimum wages increased by every president until Reagan, and Nixon tried price controls to stop inflation, while Carter and Reagan preferred interest rate hikes. Nixon even created the EPA, a clear contrast with the Republicans since who are hostile to environmental regulation, starting with Reagan, who removed Carter's solar panels from the White House. So the Democrats were left-wing and Republicans moderate during the fifth party system. Social policy was similar, with Democrats being strongly liberal and Republicans largely agreeing. Post-Civil War, Democrats were racist and dominated the South, but this changed starting in 1928. While Al Smith outperformed the party's last two nominees in the popular vote, he lost southern states to Hoover because he was Catholic and for civil rights. Under FDR, northern blacks began voting Democratic for economic reasons. Then Truman desegregated the military and supported a pro-civil rights plank at the 1948 DNC, and LBJ passed the Voting Rights, Civil Rights, and Fair Housing Acts, and the 24th Amendment was passed to ban poll taxes. Now, the Republicans supported these moves at first. Eisenhower enforced desegregation, and most Republicans voted for LBJ's legislation in Congress. As a result, racist third-party presidential candidates won southern seats in 1948, 60, and 68. But anti-civil rights Barry Goldwater's 1964 nomination signaled a shift in the Republican Party. They won some Southern congressional seats that year, and Strom Thurmond switched parties and became a Republican. From 1972 to 92, the South was a swing region for president, while Democrats won most congressional seats there. But in 1994, Republicans made huge gains there in the midterm, gaining 12% among Southern whites and flipping dozens of seats. Starting in 2000, the region became super red for president. Democrats have only won Georgia and North Carolina once, and Florida twice since 1996, and have lost every other Deep South state every election. Now, not all of this was due to racism. Some of it also had to do with them becoming more Christian. This started when Eisenhower added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance and changed the U.S. motto to "In God We Trust," and accelerated after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Additionally, Carter and Clinton were Southerners, giving them more appeal there, while Democratic nominees since 2000 have not been. But much of it was racism, such as Nixon's war on drugs. Reagan had strongly backed Goldwater in 1964 and ramped up the war on drugs further when he took office. And Republicans admitted to this. Read this quote by RNC Chairman Lee Atwater, I'm not saying it out loud. But while Republicans became more racist after 1964, Southern Democrats today are much more liberal on social issues than they were in the fifth party system, when they were largely racist out of exceptions like LBJ. Only 8% of Southern Democrats voted for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and there were no Southern Black Democrats in Congress. While today, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, there are many Southern Black Democrats in the House, and Raphael Warnock represents former slave state Georgia in the Senate. Now to the party's foreign policies during the fifth party system. World War II started in 1939 and ended in 1945, and the Cold War started immediately after and only ended in 1991. FDR entered World War II, Truman the Korean War, and LBJ Vietnam, while Eisenhower ended the Korean War and Nixon left Vietnam. But these Republicans were also interventionists, they just preferred the CIA and coups to conventional forces. For example, Eisenhower okayed the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, and Nixon supported Pinochet in Chile. And while Nixon did eventually leave Vietnam, the war continued for most of his presidency, and he even expanded it and bombed Laos and Cambodia. So both sides were interventionists during this period. Finally, both parties were fans of NASA, as it was seen as a matter of national pride to beat the Soviets to the moon, and the Republicans were not yet anti-science. As for their bases of support, we already covered the evolution of Southern seats. The racist vote started switching in 1964, and after it was mostly complete in 1994, Republicans held the House and Senate for 12 straight years. From 1954 until 1994, Democrats had continuously held the House and had the Senate for all but 6. They did best in areas that benefited the most from the New Deal, mainly big cities with urban poor. Republicans did best in wealthy suburbs, like Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, as well as the plain states of the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska. The Midwest was Democratic, as Democrats were more pro-union than Republicans, and New York and Pennsylvania were swing states. Democrats also competed in almost every state during this period, as only the Corn Belt states continually voted Republican. The appeal to the working class of Democratic economic policy without much cultural backlash until the Southern strategy made them resonate with the majority of Americans. In the six-party system, Democrats are still popular in cities, although less since 2016, and have gained ground in suburbs, but are much less popular in rural areas, especially white Southern ones, causing them to go back and forth in the House and Senate instead of dominating them. Now let's analyze Truman's terms, beginning with the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. When Truman took office, World War II was still ongoing in both Europe and the Pacific, but the war in Europe ended quite quickly. Allied forces had already been rapidly advancing through German territory, Hitler and Mussolini died within a month, and the war in Europe ended without Truman doing much. But Japan kept fighting, and they were not known for surrendering. The word kamikaze comes from Japanese and the practice of pilots suicide crashing their planes into their enemies. There were 120 deaths for every surrender for Japanese soldiers, compared to only 3 per surrender for Western militaries. And the US was fighting Japan on its own. In 1941, when the Soviets were taking over Eastern Europe with Germany, they also signed a 5-year non-aggression pact with Japan. And Britain was recovering from being bombed and was too far away to help. So it seemed like the US would have to fight alone to defeat Japan, not only on their islands, but also in parts of Asia they had conquered, like the Philippines, China, and Vietnam. In the Battle of Manila in February 1945, over 100,000 Filipino civilians were massacred as Japan fought to the end before the US eventually liberated the city. The US won the battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima, but lost over 20,000 men in each. Truman wanted Japan to surrender, but even 3 months after the other Axis powers had, they still refused to. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman told Churchill and Stalin that the US had tested an atomic bomb. They then sent the Potsdam Declaration to Japan on July 26th. It outlined the conditions for a Japanese surrender. Japan would lose all of its territory acquired by force and become a democracy, but the emperor and most soldiers would not be prosecuted, just those who led massacres of civilians or prisoners of war. It read, We call upon Japan to proclaim the unconditional surrender of all Japanese forces. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. But despite the warning, Japan kept fighting. Truman didn't want any more troops to die in invading Japan, and regular bombs had not induced surrender, even after FDR's firebombing of Tokyo in March killed over 100,000 people. So Truman decided to nuke Hiroshima on August 6th. The immediate casualties from the bomb were around 70,000, and a similar amount died due to radiation over the next 6 months, the vast majority of which were civilians. A ground invasion would have killed countless American troops, and other bombs had killed just as many civilians without inducing surrender. If killing 70,000 people with a nuke is a war crime, is killing 100,000 by firebombing a city any different? Is FDR a war criminal too? And the effects of the nuke were unknown at the time. Oppenheimer thought only around 20,000 would die. But Truman then ordered another nuke to be dropped in Nagasaki only 3 days later, which killed just as many. The Japanese likely hadn't realized what had happened in Hiroshima, as nobody had ever seen a nuke before. Additionally, the same day, the Soviet Union invaded Japanese-held Manchuria. The Japanese cabinet then met to discuss surrender. Unanimous agreement was not reached, and when the emperor planned a surrender speech, the dissenters attempted a coup to stop it. But the coup failed, Hirohito surrendered, and the war ended. Given even after the second nuking and the Soviet declaration it took 6 more days for a Japanese surrender, and the decision was still not unanimous, one could argue the second nuke was necessary. But it's quite likely the Soviet entry would have been sufficient. Truman should at least have waited longer before dropping the second nuke, and the targets could have been more military-focused or less populated rather than cities, so their power could have been displayed to Japan while minimizing civilian casualties. So overall, Truman was unusual in World War II, as the nukes were bad but defensible, while the European front was a quick success. What happened to Germany and Japan after the war? After World War I, Germany had to pay reparations equivalent to $1 trillion in today's money. They were unable to, so France occupied the German Ruhr Valley and ensured the materials from there were directly paid as reparations. This led to shortages, hyperinflation, and economic collapse in Germany, and then anti-France nationalism and the rise of Hitler. But after World War II, they were treated much more fairly. Germany and Japan did lose all their conquered lands. Austria, Albania, and Korea gained independence, and parts of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and China were returned. As agreed upon at Potsdam, Germany was partitioned into a Western capitalist democracy and a communist East. Nazi leaders were tried for war crimes at the Nuremberg trials, the start of international law. West Germany was forced to destroy arms factories, demine along the French border, and give their research and scientists to the Allies. Japan was solely run by the US. The new constitution kept parliament the same, but gave women voting rights, removed the emperor's power and state religion, and limited Japan's army in exchange for some war crime amnesty. So Germany and Japan were certainly politically and geographically punished. But economically, they were not saddled with debt like they had been after World War I. Instead, they entered a post-war economic boom. Europe needed to rebuild from the war's destruction, so the US started the Marshall Plan, in which the US exported discounted goods to Europe to help them rebuild. Originally, this plan did not include West Germany or Japan. FDR had approved the Morgenthau Plan, in which West Germany would have been left economically backwards. But as the Cold War ramped up, Truman instead decided to keep them prosperous, happy, and on the side of the West, rather than angry, bitter, and pro-USSR. One escalation in the Cold War was the Berlin blockade. Berlin is in the east, but as the capital, it was also split into an east and west. But West Germany needed permission to access West Berlin. In June 1948, the USSR blocked off all trains to West Berlin and tried to annex it. In response, the US airdropped supplies into the city and banned imports from East Germany. The USSR then relented and ended the blockade, but the damage was done and enmity grew between the US and the USSR. After this, West Germany began receiving more Marshall Plan funds and joined the European Coal and Steel Community, a free trade region that eventually evolved into the EU. They paid off their reparations by exporting discounted goods, which also helped their own economy. After the Communists won the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and the Korean War began in 1950, the US invested more in Japan as well and allowed them to keep a cheap currency in order to make them powerful exporters. The US then stopped administering Japan in 1952. Truman's policies were clearly successful in making not only France and Britain, but also West Germany and Japan peaceful, democratic, and prosperous. While the mood in the US was isolationist prior to the war, now Americans were more willing to be involved in world affairs. Truman completed FDR's vision by creating the United Nations. Unlike what happened with the League of Nations after World War I, he got congressional Republicans on board, which was necessary after they won Congress in 1946. Their headquarters was even built in New York City. While the UN is limited by Security Council members vetoing resolutions, like the US does to help Israel oppress Palestine, and Russia does to let it invade Georgia and Ukraine, it is still a force for good that fights pandemics, eradicates diseases, funds developing countries, and creates international treaties on things like maritime boundaries and climate change. The world also entered an era of free trade, moving away from the disastrous Smoot-Hawley tariff that exacerbated the Great Depression, with a General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. This was an agreement between 23 Western nations to keep low tariffs in order to help their economies improve. In general, other countries imported U.S. goods in order to invest in their futures, allowing all parties to benefit. There's a reason the post-World War II period is known as an economic miracle or the golden age of capitalism. But not everything was so happy on the world stage as the Cold War had begun. After the Berlin episode in 1948, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created. It is a collective security alliance where if a member is attacked, all others must aid in its defense. NATO has never attacked Russia or any other post-Soviet country, and no NATO member has ever been attacked by a foreign country since, while non-NATO countries, like Georgia and Ukraine, have been. So this was clearly a great move that led to peace. It also made France okay with a prosperous West Germany, as they knew that the US would defend them if needed. And then West Germany themselves joined NATO in 1955. But other countries in Europe had already become communist. The USSR had annexed Moldova and the Baltics, while Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, like East Germany, were separate from the USSR but also communist. In 1946, communists attempted to coup the Greek monarchy. But Truman gave military and economic aid to Greece and neighboring Turkey, and the rebellion was defeated. The two countries would later join NATO. The policy of giving aid to stop the spread of communism, exemplified by this in the Marshall Plan, is known as the Truman Doctrine. Now, this rationale was later used to arm vicious dictators or even radical Islamists just because they were anti-communist, but Truman armed legitimate regimes. Greece's monarchy was not authoritarian. In fact, it was overthrown by a right-wing military in 1967, and the country saw strong economic growth until 2008, so helping them was very reasonable. Italy was also given aid ahead of the 1948 election, and it avoided falling to fascism or communism, and Spain, led by the dictator Francisco Franco, was not given aid. Beyond NATO, one other deterrent of Soviet action was the US's nuclear program. Truman did, of course, start his term by using nukes in combat, the only person to ever do so, but after that cooled down a bit, putting nukes in a non-military department that later became the Department of Energy. The Manhattan Project ended in 1947, and the US only had around 50 nukes. But after the Soviets tested a nuke in 1949, Truman poured money into the department. By the end of his term, the US had around 1,000 nukes, the Soviets 100, and France and Britain also began their own programs. The US developed the first ever hydrogen bomb in 1952, the USSR did in 1953, and the arms race continued to accelerate. In this aspect, Truman certainly was too hawkish. Now let's move on to the Cold War in Asia, especially the Korean War. After the Second World War ended, a lot of Asian countries were decolonized. Once the US freed the Philippines from Japan, Truman granted them independence and they became a democracy. They've been a US ally since, though a dictatorship took over the country in 1972. Truman also conditioned aid to the Netherlands on them granting independence to Indonesia, which then became a liberal democracy until 1965. But Truman didn't support all decolonization, as he opposed Vietnamese independence from France if it entailed Ho Chi Minh and the communists taking power. Independence came in 1954 with a split into North and South Vietnam, one communist and one not, before the full Vietnam War 10 years after that. Truman made a reasonable decision here, one far better than what LBJ and Nixon later did, so I won't fault him for it. Communists also came to power in China and Korea. The former Civil War restarted in 1946 after being frozen during the Japanese invasion. The US gave some aid to the nationalists, but never sent troops, and the Soviets aided the communists way more, leading to their victory and the nationalists fleeing to Taiwan, which is still the situation today. Meanwhile, Korea was divided after being freed from Japan, with a Soviet side north of the 38th parallel and a western south. The US withdrew troops in 1949, though many stayed in nearby Japan. But then the North invaded in June 1950, backed by the USSR and China, and captured Seoul. Unlike the Chinese Civil War, which had been long ongoing and had only paused during World War II, this war was between two defined countries with a set border. Letting the North capture the South would set precedent for one country invading another without punishment. So US forces were sent, first those from Japan, but then also via a draft. They retook the South and even pushed into the North by October. China then sent troops to help the North, and they briefly took Seoul again in early 1951. US General Douglas MacArthur, who had led World War II's Pacific Theater and now led the Korean War, wanted to keep fighting. He even floated nuking the North Korea-China border, which nobody else approved of. But Truman proposed a ceasefire at the UN and fired MacArthur. The public loved MacArthur as a World War II hero, so this move hurt Truman politically and is part of why he didn't run in 1952. But it worked, as the war calmed down. Fighting was minimal after July 1951 and fully ended in 1953. The US still has troops in the South and the North now has nuclear weapons, but the direct fighting has not resumed. If we compare North and South Korea today, it's obvious intervening was a good decision, and Truman did de-escalate as much as possible once it was obvious China would fight until the end. But I'm very against the draft, so he gets negative marks there. Around 35,000 Americans died in the conflict, compared to 140,000 South Koreans. Sending aid, tanks, training, and intel was a good decision, but forcing young men to die in a foreign country is something I can't support. When it came to third world countries, which then meant those neutral in the Cold War, Truman also gave them aid. He remarked, "Communist propaganda holds that free nations are incapable of providing a decent standard of living for people in underdeveloped areas. The Point Four program will demonstrate the complete falsity of that charge." In this program, the US shared knowledge with developing countries. Most of Africa was still colonized by Europe, so the main recipients were countries like India, Pakistan, Iran, and Israel. The US didn't take sides in conflicts between these nations, and instead uplifted the poor everywhere while improving its image. The US set up things like agricultural colleges and vaccine programs. Child mortality fell and agricultural productivity improved in these countries as a result. Foreign aid between this and the Marshall Plan made up around 2% of GDP under Truman. Now let's wrap up foreign policy by talking about refugees and immigration. FDR refused to accept Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, such as those in the MS St. Louis, but Truman was much better. He personally increased refugee visa quotas via executive order and signed the Displaced Persons Act, which let more Eastern Europeans flee communism, and the War Brides Act, which let spouses of American soldiers immigrate. The 1952 Immigration and Nationality Act repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned immigration from most of Asia. The law still kept some country quotas, so it favored Western Europe, and Truman vetoed it for that reason, though his veto was overridden. From his veto message, "I have long urged that racial or national barriers to naturalization be abolished. The quota system discriminates deliberately and intentionally against many peoples of the world. This discriminatory policy claims that Americans with English or Irish names were better than Americans with Italian or Greek or Polish names. It violates the doctrine of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal." As you can see from this message, he was far better on immigration than all of his predecessors. The quota system ended under LBJ. Finally, other Jewish refugees fled to modern-day Israel, which was then controlled by the UK. The UK split the land into separate Palestinian and Israeli states, but all of Israel's neighbors refused to recognize it and declared war on it. What Israel is doing today with the settlements in the West Bank and genocide in Gaza is obviously wrong, but it was the UK's territory, they had the right to create Israel, and Israel had a right to defend itself in the 1948 war. Truman recognized Israel once it was created, and as mentioned, gave it aid, but also gave aid to Egypt starting in 1946 and did not support Israel attacking or annexing neighbors. Overall, he had a great foreign policy. You can critique some decisions, especially the nuking of Japan in the draft, but he never armed dictatorships, gave the Philippines independence and pressured for Indonesian independence, protected Korea and the NATO members from communist invasion while avoiding war with the USSR and fighting for a ceasefire in Korea. I think he mostly found the right balance between being hawkish and peaceful. Now to his domestic policy. On this slide are the US's macroeconomic statistics from 1929, when the Great Depression started, to 1954, after the Korean War ended. Before FDR, government spending was low in peacetime, but it has been persistently high since. In October 1929, the Depression began. Hoover ran 3 budget surpluses, and the GDP tanked, unemployment spiked, and deflation persisted, while the debt-to-GDP ratio still increased. FDR's first 5 years featured government deficits, and the economy stabilized and then grew, unemployment fell, deflation ended, and the debt-to-GDP ratio stayed the same. What can we learn from this? When there's deflation, a recession, or high unemployment, the government should run a deficit. Not only did Hoover's lack of spending and tariffs exacerbate the Depression, they didn't even reduce the debt-to-GDP ratio. While the debt, or the numerator in the debt-to-GDP ratio decreased, the denominator also did, both because real GDP fell, and deflation meant the past debt became more expensive. Then when FDR ran deficits, the economy had double-digit growth and deflation ended, so the debt-to-GDP ratio barely increased. And after FDR increased income and payroll taxes, growth slowed in 1937 and went negative in 1938, and unemployment again rose. The 1938 deficit was the lowest since 1932, but the debt-to-GDP ratio increased a ton since the economy suffered. Growth would have slowed anyway, as most of the prior growth had been a natural recovery from the Depression, but it wouldn't have been negative without these bad decisions. The lesson from this is that if the debt-to-GDP ratio is stable, there's no need to reduce the deficit. You can still increase taxes on high earners or capital gains, but it should be paired with reduced sales taxes or investments in the economy. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. From 1939 to 1942, the US had massive GDP growth with low deficits as World War II ramped up and exports to the Allies grew. The lesson from this is that exports help GDP grow without large deficits, since it means other countries are footing the bill. But then as the US joined the war and military spending went from 1.7% of GDP in 1940 to 36% from 1943 to 1945, the debt-to-GDP ratio skyrocketed from 36% to 114% from 1943 to 1946. Growth remained strong, unemployment fell to 1.2%, and women also joined the workforce in large numbers to help the cause. But this level of government spending was unsustainable. After the war ended, as military spending fell to 5.4% in 1947, the GDP also fell in 1946 and 1947. This shows that military spending provides fake growth at the cost of increased debt and deficits. While some wars are worth fighting, the spurious economic benefits should never be a reason for one. Unemployment also rose yearly until 1949, although it was kept down by some women leaving the workforce to take part in the baby boom, and many veterans going to college thanks to the GI Bill. And only in 1949 was it above 5%, which is generally considered around the natural rate of unemployment, so the rise was totally okay. Inflation was high in 1946 and 47, as it took time for the economy to reorient itself away from war mode and towards consumer goods, and wartime price controls were lifted. But as the government cut spending, inflation slowed until it was near zero in 1949, and the debt to GDP ratio fell from 113% in 1946 to 74% in 1951. The GDP did crash in 1946, which is the downside of reducing spending too fast, and Truman had wanted more spending than the Republican Congress. Nowadays, interest rate hikes are used to reduce inflation, and they are also set to try to achieve a soft landing rather than an abrupt economic crash. But these hikes discourage investments by making loans more expensive in the crowding out effect, can hurt banks that have taken out long-term low-interest rate treasuries, and make the U.S. debt interest more expensive, thus increasing the debt to GDP ratio. So these hikes also have plenty of downsides. After 1948, the economy was strong for 2 decades. GDP growth averaged 4% and was never under 1% in a year, and inflation averaged 2% until Vietnam, 1973 oil embargo, and stagflation brought their own problems. So after only one poor year in 1946, Truman got America on a strong and steady growth trajectory. Let's now get into the specifics of his policies. The biggest challenge Truman faced domestically was what to do right after World War II ended. With millions of soldiers returning home and large parts of the economy dedicated to the war winding down, the economy was going to take a hit. Congress had passed the GI Bill in 1944, which gave veterans cheap college tuition and mortgages, small business loans, and unemployment insurance, helping integrate them back into the economy. The bill had problems, like encouraging for-profit colleges in suburban sprawl, and that black veterans faced mortgage and college discrimination. Truman did address the first issue by putting federal funds towards community colleges, and I'll cover his great civil rights record later. And this law, plus increased science funding and bringing several scientists from Europe, made the US more productive and a research powerhouse. But it wasn't enough to stop unemployment from rising and GDP from falling in 1946, as overall spending still dramatically fell. But Truman made his positions known by asking Congress to pass several progressive priorities, such as universal health care, which was passed after World War II in many European countries, a federal commitment to full employment, a more progressive tax structure, and public power projects like the Tennessee Valley Authority and Hoover Dam, and work on rural electrification. Congress did none of these, and instead passed smaller budgets and merely created a council to give non-binding economic advice. And as mentioned, workers began striking in 1946 when inflation was highest. Truman wanted to avoid strikes, and during the war, the National War Labor Board let the government set wages to avoid them. But the office had been disbanded, so several strikes proceeded with Truman unable to intervene. After a strike in steel mills during the Korean War, Truman attempted to nationalize the industry to raise wages and keep production going so the war effort would not be harmed, but the Supreme Court ruled against him. The Republican Congress also passed the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act that banned government workers from striking, allowed states to pass right-to-work laws, and allowed companies to make anti-union statements, among other changes. Truman vetoed the bill, believing it went too far, but his veto was overridden and used some of its powers afterwards. The bill also forced union leaders to vow that they were not communist, marking the start of the Red Scare. Truman was by no means pro-communist, as we saw from his foreign policy, but he was largely against the Red Scare. He did remove communist sympathizers from his cabinet, which is why Henry Wallace ran against him in 1948, but he spoke out against Joseph McCarthy, who led the House Un-American Activities Committee, and vetoed the McCarran Internal Security Act, an anti-Fifth Amendment bill which allowed the president to indefinitely detain suspected communist spies, though it passed over his veto. Other laws Truman vetoed included cuts to Social Security and the weakening of the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the 1948 Revenue Act which cut taxes, though that veto was also overridden. After Democrats won Congress in 1948, Truman was able to pass some left-wing economic bills. The minimum wage was raised from 40 cents to 75, the Sherman Antitrust Act was strengthened, and money was put towards building public housing in cities. Social Security payments were increased and rent control expanded, two popular policies, but ones to my left. But after Republicans gained seats in 1950 and the Korean War started, fewer bills passed in Truman's last 2 years, one being a 2% tax increase to pay for the war that ended in 1954. Overall, he had a strong economy with 5% average GDP growth after 1947, and the brief crash wasn't really his fault given he wanted more spending than Congress. But he didn't pass any major legislation as he didn't have the large majorities FDR had. So an A on the economy, but not an S. Finally, let's get to social issues. I already covered Truman's great immigration policy, but he was also fantastic on racial equality domestically. His first action was the creation of the 1946 President's Committee on Civil Rights, which returned a detailed report of how black people were being oppressed. Truman met with the NAACP in 1947 and then requested congressional action in 1948. Requested legislation included making the Wartime Fair Employment Practice Committee permanent, banning discrimination in public transit, allowing more immigrants to naturalize, anti-lynching legislation, voting rights, and more. While Southerners in the Senate filibustered to make sure none of this passed, Truman did what he could by passing an executive order to desegregate the armed forces and civil service. He also appointed the first ever black federal appellate judge, and his Justice Department filed briefs in favor of ending segregation in multiple cases, including Brown v. Board, which kicked off the civil rights era. Finally, Truman also called for Alaska and Hawaii to become states, something that hadn't happened yet as they had large non-white populations. They would become states in 1958 and 59 respectively. Truman also recognized Puerto Rico's constitution and was open to them being independent if they desired. Overall, easily the best president on civil rights since Grant, and only LBJ has been better since. Now let's just summarize Truman's term in one slide and give him his grade. In summary, Truman had a very successful foreign policy, as he won World War II quickly with few US casualties and stopped communist expansion in Korea while pushing for peace within a year. Western Europe and Japan quickly recovered economically and became democracies and reliable US allies. But the use of nukes was questionable, and I'm also against the Korean War draft. Overall, a great record, but not as good as FDR. His economic record was also good but worse than FDR. The 1946 crash was because Congress stopped him from spending more, and after it, inflation subsided and the economy was strong for the next 20 years. The debt-to-GDP ratio also fell from 114% in 1946 to 67% in 1953, making Truman the best president, reducing it in the country's history. But larger goals such as universal healthcare or more federal projects on infrastructure went unfulfilled, and he had to face many strikes with middling effectiveness. But Truman was much better than FDR on social issues. Instead of Japanese internment and denying Jews fleeing the Holocaust, he rejected the Red Scare, accepted refugees, and liberalized immigration. And instead of refusing to meet with Jesse Owens, he desegregated the armed forces and civil service and sided against segregation in Brown v. Board. Overall, I have him just below FDR all time, also an A. If he had FDR's majorities in Congress, he could have been an S. He would have passed universal healthcare and avoided the 1946 recession. But he didn't. And as the Korean War continued, and one of his few mistakes in the draft hurt his popularity, he declined to run for a third term and was succeeded by Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had been head of the U.S. Army in Europe during World War II and then became the first NATO head. He was the first president since Grant to have never held a previous political office, but he had strong name recognition and was broadly liked by the electorate, so he won easily in 1952 against Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. Republicans also took minor majorities in Congress. The midterms delivered minor losses as Democrats won back the House and Senate. They would continue to hold the Senate until 1980 and the House until 1994. But Eisenhower himself remained very popular. He easily won re-election, facing Stevenson again, and the House and Senate barely changed. People were happy with the direction of the country and delivered incumbents of both parties wins. But in 1958, Democrats gained 50 House and an astonishing 15 Senate seats. Eisenhower was now a lame duck and had health issues, so the much less popular Nixon was effectively the face of the party. The economy had a down year before then growing by 7% in 1959, and Eisenhower became more partisan in his second term and passed some unpopular right-wing policies that we'll cover later. Still, Eisenhower left office popular and is widely considered to be a top 10 president. Let's see why and if I agree. The major foreign policy issue of this era was the Cold War. When Eisenhower took office, the US's first major Cold War conflict, the Korean War, was winding down, and Stalin died and was replaced by a more moderate leader, Nikita Khrushchev. So no more fighting by US or USSR troops took place under Eisenhower. But plenty still happened behind the scenes. Firstly, military spending still stayed high. While before World War II it was 1.7% of GDP, and between World War II and the Korean War it was 3.5%, it averaged 9% during Eisenhower's term. How did he spend so much if no troops were deployed? Well, on a shit ton of bombs. The nuclear arsenal went from 1,000 warheads to over 20,000 during Eisenhower's term. I criticized Truman for his nuclear buildup, but Eisenhower was much worse. 1,000 was already enough to destroy every major city in the world, and the nukes were also stronger. The ones used in Japan were only 20 kilotons, but by 1954 they reached 15,000 kilotons. The US also deployed nuclear submarines around the world that could hit foreign targets much faster, and placed nukes in NATO countries like Greece and Turkey closer to the USSR. Eisenhower did try negotiating with Khrushchev to slow the buildup when he visited the US in 1959, but when they met at a summit in Paris the next year, negotiations were scuttled after an American spy plane crashed in the USSR. So overall, way too much spending on nukes, and the relationship with the USSR stayed frayed. And while Eisenhower didn't deploy any troops after leaving Korea, the US nevertheless interfered in a ton of different countries under his watch. The CIA, which was created in 1947, mostly just gathered intelligence under Truman. But Eisenhower and CIA Director Allen Dulles led coups all over the world. The most infamous was the 1953 Iranian coup. Their Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the oil industry, which the UK had previously controlled, in 1951. Truman met with Mossadegh that year and asked for the US to receive compensation, but was strongly against regime change. Churchill then started an embargo on Iranian oil, but as Iran's economy suffered, their Communist Party gained popularity. Eisenhower and Churchill did not want to risk Iran becoming an ally of the USSR. So they paid protesters to storm government buildings and convinced the Shah to seize power. After he did, the oil was then controlled by American and British companies. The Shah remained in power until 1979, but since then, Iran has been extremely anti-American. This was a terrible decision done just to make US companies happy that violated Iran's sovereignty and made the US much less popular in the region. And the CIA did a lot more than just that. They also successfully overthrew the Guatemalan government, who tried to take away farmland from US fruit companies, as well as Patrice Lumumba's Pan-African nationalist government and the newly independent DRC. Both countries faced decades of chaos afterwards. A similar attempt in Indonesia was unsuccessful. After Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba in 1959, the US started planning regime change there. The Bay of Pigs invasion took place under JFK and led to the Cuban Missile Crisis, a massive escalation of the Cold War. In addition to regime change against left-wing leaders, Eisenhower also funded authoritarians as long as they were anti-communist. Like Truman, he supported the French colonizers in Vietnam, and after they left, he armed South Vietnam so it could defend itself from the north. This was a reasonable move. However, he went further, giving Franco's fascist government Marshall Plan funds. But now to some of his foreign policy I approve of. West Germany joined NATO, and the US removed some troops from Europe. When the USSR repressed protests in Eastern Europe, the US didn't get involved, avoiding escalation, but accepted refugees fleeing those countries. Similarly, in the Middle East, Eisenhower proclaimed he was willing to defend countries the USSR invaded them, but did not actively depose any governments. After Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, France, and Israel attacked it. Instead of regime change like in Iran, Eisenhower got the attacks to stop by threatening to withhold aid, and the situation was diffused. He showed that the US was willing to call out its allies when they did something wrong, and Egypt stayed friendly with the US. He also agreed to aid Taiwan and India if China invaded them, even though the US was more allied with Pakistan. And finally, in his famous farewell address, Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." As I mentioned, he himself had quite high military budgets, but he was aware that weapons manufacturers would push for more war, and a lot of his spending was not on traditional weapons, but rather on nuclear weapons research or funding of overseas groups. So overall, Eisenhower probably had a below-average foreign policy, as he spent a ton of money, overthrew governments, and escalated the Cold War. But he had some bright spots in never deploying US troops and speaking out against the military-industrial complex. Now to his domestic policy. We'll start with how the Cold War influenced domestic politics. Firstly, there was the scientific arms race. Truman recruited several European scientists and invested in research, and Eisenhower continued to do so. Some of his research was counted in the military budget, which is another reason I won't criticize his military spending too much. While he spent a lot more on nukes than Truman did, Eisenhower also prioritized nuclear energy. He made a speech to the UN in 1953 about nuclear energy and signed the Atomic Energy Act the next year, which led to the first US reactors. In 1957, the International Atomic Energy Agency was created to ensure more countries could pursue nuclear power, and the USSR launched the first satellite, Sputnik. So in 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, which further funded colleges and research at them, and created DARPA, another research wing counted under military spending. Its many breakthroughs included early versions of the internet and AI. In 1959, NASA was created, and it eventually landed a man on the moon before the USSR. GPS, solar panels, more efficient rockets, and numerous other technologies were developed by all of this, and the US became the world's research powerhouse. But the Cold War also led to the Red Scare. When Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee accused government workers of being communists, Eisenhower criticized McCarthy and prevented his investigations into the army. McCarthy was censured by the Senate and died of liver failure in 1957. But Eisenhower was also very hard on communism. When Oppenheimer was accused of being a communist, Eisenhower supported him losing his security clearance, and the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, stepped up their domestic surveillance efforts, funding many informants in domestic groups and surveilling figures like MLK. One notorious program was COINTELPRO, which set up illegal wiretaps, break-ins, and planted evidence in order to convict dissidents. Similarly, the CIA started MKUltra, a program which tested hallucinogenic drugs and torture techniques on Americans in order to use them overseas. So on civil liberties, a very poor record. But on civil rights, Eisenhower continued Truman's push for racial equality. Firstly, he continued desegregating the military, something he had also done as a chief while serving. He also appointed 5 Supreme Court justices, including Chief Justice Earl Warren, and they delivered huge victories for equality. In 1954, the court unanimously ruled that the 14th Amendment banned government schools from segregating in the case of Brown v. Board. In 1955, they ruled schools had to desegregate faster, and court orders began being served to states. When Arkansas violated one, Eisenhower sent federal troops and took control of the Arkansas National Guard to force them to allow black kids to attend school. The Interstate Commerce Commission also banned segregation on interstate trains and buses, and in 1956, after Rosa Parks and bus boycotts, the Supreme Court also ruled segregation was illegal on state and local public transit. Eisenhower also signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, the first legislation on civil rights since Reconstruction. The first created a Commission on Civil Rights and a Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department, while the latter gave more power to federal agencies to prosecute civil rights violations and increase criminal penalties for committing them. These laws weren't nearly as strong as the ones passed under LBJ, but it was a start. And in 1960, DC, Alaska, and Hawaii were now participating in elections. These had been stalled prior as they had large non-white populations. But some of Eisenhower's other decisions weren't as liberal. He fired thousands of gay government employees and carried out large deportations of illegal immigrants. And after framing the Cold War as the religious West versus godless communists, he violated separation of church and state. The U.S. motto became "In God We Trust," which then began being printed on all money, and "Under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, which was recited in schools. So overall, he was above average on social policy, similar to FDR and worse than Truman. Now to the economy. I'll show the full data from 1955 to 1973 later, but overall, Eisenhower had a good economy. There was a small inflation spike in 1956. The Fed then raised interest rates and the GDP fell in 1958, and this is why those midterms went so poorly for Republicans. But the GDP then grew by 7% in 1959, and the average from 1955 to 1961 was 3.2%. Eisenhower kept the progressive taxes of FDR and Truman, and the government ran balanced budgets, so the debt-to-GDP ratio fell from 68% in 1954 to 51% in 1961. Inequality decreased, poverty fell from around 30% to 20%, and median incomes and home ownership rates grew. These were all good results, but the legislation Eisenhower signed was more of a mixed bag. Social Security benefits increased and expanded to disabled workers, but the regressive payroll tax rates also doubled from 1.5% to 3%. He also refused Congress's call for a national health insurance system, and he spent a ton of money on highway construction. This further contributed to suburban sprawl in Americans' car-centric infrastructure, with the federal government investing much less in trains after this. The highways were also often built through the middle of cities by bulldozing and displacing black residents. This worsened the issues of climate change and air pollution, increased American dependence on foreign oil, and subsidized rich suburbanites by giving them free roads while hurting poorer residents of cities. But the program was largely funded by gas taxes, which went from 1.5 cents per gallon to 4 under Eisenhower. And he also spent money on shipping infrastructure with the Submerged Lands Act of 1953, which invested in waterways within the U.S., and the Wiley-Dander Seaway Act, which improved the passage from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean that the U.S. and Canada use. And the government continued to build housing. Eisenhower wasn't as pro-union as Truman, but he also didn't crush as many strikes and didn't use the Taft-Hartley Act much. And the minimum wage went from 75 cents an hour in 1956 to $1.15 in 1961. So overall, good on the economy. I give Eisenhower a C+ for his total grade. He didn't deploy troops, and some of his military spending was on research that helped make the U.S. the technology leader of the world. Domestically, he had a good economic record and was great on civil rights. But the CIA carrying out coups overseas and the FBI's domestic surveillance weren't great, and he also had other domestic mistakes like the highways. I think he's very overrated by people who have him as top 5 president ever, but he's still above average, and I put him in C+. Now to his successor, Democrat John F. Kennedy. Eisenhower's VP Nixon ran in 1960 and benefited from the good economy and lack of wars over the last 8 years, but he was nowhere near as well liked as Eisenhower. After the Democrats had just lost the presidential election twice in a row decisively while winning down ballot, they took a risk by nominating John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts. He was only 42 years old and had little experience, so Texan Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson became his running mate. This election had the first ever televised debates, and JFK was judged to be the winner by most viewers due to his charisma, speaking ability, and good looks. Polling remained tight throughout, and the final popular vote figure was a near tie, but the Democratic ticket successfully appealed to the regions of its candidates, winning enough of the Northeast and South to finish with 303 electoral votes, although it only won the tipping point state of Missouri by 0.5%. The most racist southern states voted for third-party candidate Harry Byrd, while Nixon won his home state of California and most western states, the wealthiest northeastern states, and a few in the Midwest. This was quite different from the last two close Democratic victories in 1916 and 1948, where the West voted Democratic, while New York, Pennsylvania, and their neighbors had voted Republican. Democrats lost 20 House seats and 1 Senate seat from their massive total in 1958, but kept a solid majority in both. They then gained 2 Senate seats and lost only 5 House seats in the 1962 midterms, which occurred while the economy was strong and right after the successful handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK was then assassinated in 1963 and succeeded by LBJ, who won in a historic landslide in 1964. Let's now give JFK his grade. Once again, I'll start with foreign policy, this time with Cuba. As mentioned, Castro came to power in 1959, and Eisenhower prepared an attack on the island. JFK then approved the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. Thousands of Cuban exiles invaded, but they were easily captured in an embarrassing failure. Cuba then became more anti-American, and the USSR tried to send nukes to Cuba to prevent further attacks and get nukes as close to the US as US nukes in Europe were to Moscow. Kennedy then blockaded Cuba while negotiating with Khrushchev, and he reached a peaceful resolution. The US ended the blockade and promised no future regime change, and the USSR removed nukes from Cuba as the US did the same in Italy and Turkey. The last part of the deal remained secret, making it seem like a huge win for Kennedy, so his approval shot up and Dems had a great midterm. The second most serious situation Kennedy had to deal with was Germany. Many East Germans fled to the west by crossing into West Berlin, so Khrushchev wanted to take control of all of Berlin. Kennedy held strong in the support of a free West Berlin and increased arms sales to West Germany. When the Berlin Wall was built to stop East Germans from fleeing, Kennedy used this as proof that communist countries had to stop their own citizens from leaving because they were so repressive. In these conflicts, Kennedy avoided escalation and stood his ground. He also set up a hotline to communicate directly with the USSR and got them to agree all future nuclear tests would be underground to reduce radioactive fallout. And while he did keep building nukes, the US stockpile grew more slowly than under his predecessors and began decreasing under LBJ. Military spending also fell from 9% of GDP to 8.3% and further fell under LBJ. All of these besides the Bay of Pigs invasion were good decisions. With third world countries, Kennedy increased foreign aid rather than intervening. The Food for Peace program exported cheap food to developing countries, benefiting nutrition in poor countries, as well as American farmers. The Peace Corps let Americans volunteer overseas, mainly in newly independent nations in Africa. Unlike Eisenhower, Kennedy didn't use the CIA in the Congo or support rebels in Indonesia. He even met Indonesia's leftist leader Sukarno at the White House. Kennedy also opposed colonization by refusing to sell arms to the Portuguese dictator Salazar to use in Angola, and supported Algerian independence from France, which it achieved in 1962. But he did use troops or the CIA when communism was threatening to take hold. Cuba was the most egregious, but in Vietnam, tensions escalated before becoming a full war under LBJ. Kennedy deployed 16,000 troops in South Vietnam, up from only 900 under Eisenhower, as the communists in the north began attacking the south. This was defensive, but American forces used Agent Orange, a chemical that causes horrible injuries and birth defects, in jungles in ways that affected countless civilians. And just before his own death, Kennedy okayed the November 1963 coup against the South's leader, No Dinh Diem. There were protests by the Buddhist majority against the Christian Diem who discriminated against them, and a famous photo of monks self-immolating made the issue well known. But changing leaders just gave the North an opening to invade, leading to the full war a year later, and violent regime change is almost never justified. Instead, the US should have just withheld aid and not sent troops until Diem stopped the discrimination. Kennedy also used the CIA in neighboring Laos in their civil war, but didn't intervene to the level that Nixon would. Finally, Kennedy also expanded US support of Israel. Egypt was led by the pan-Arab nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Iraq by Ba'athist, a pan-Arab socialist group. Both nations threatened Israel, so Kennedy sold Israel weapons and allowed them to develop nukes. This was somewhat reasonable, as Israel didn't invade its neighbors under JFK, but allowing nuclear proliferation was a mistake. Overall, he had a good foreign policy. Tensions with the USSR slowly began decreasing, and the US prioritized foreign aid over invasions and coups. And his mistakes on foreign policy were not as big as his successors would be. Yes, the Cuban Missile Crisis was caused by the Bay of Pigs invasion, but Eisenhower planned it and numerous other coups. And while tensions grew in Vietnam, much more blame goes to his successors for their policies there. So he earns a largely positive mark. Now to his domestic policy. Kennedy was great on both the economy and civil rights. For the macroeconomic figures, GDP growth averaged 4%, more than under Eisenhower, the debt-to-GDP ratio fell, and inflation stayed around 1% every year of his tenure. His economic policy included reducing tariffs with Europe and Latin America to encourage the regions to be more friendly with the US, money for housing and public transit in cities, and development in rural areas, and free school lunches and food stamps. On civil rights, he increased enforcement of anti-segregation in public transit, which the Supreme Court reaffirmed in 1962. He signed executive orders to prohibit racial discrimination by government contractors or in federally supported housing, and sent troops to ensure black students could enroll in the universities of Mississippi and Alabama. And the poll tax, which was used to disenfranchise poor black voters, was made illegal by the 24th Amendment. Kennedy also met with MLK and other leaders of the March on Washington in 1963, although he allowed J. Edgar Hoover to wiretap King. Much more legislation would pass Congress under LBJ, but Kennedy was still absolutely in support of civil rights. The space race that started under Eisenhower also continued. After the USSR beat the US to putting a man in space, Kennedy declared that the US would be the first to put a man on the moon, which they ultimately did in 1969 before the USSR. A launch center was built in Florida and the main control center in Houston. Finally, Kennedy also advocated equal rights for women via the Equal Rights Amendment, and amended the Fair Labor Standards Act to require equal pay for equal work for women. So overall, Kennedy was a solid president with just a few mistakes in foreign policy. But the fact that he had less than 3 years and didn't pass much major legislation means he goes near the bottom of B. Let's now see what all his successor, Lyndon Johnson, accomplished. Johnson became president after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963. Over the next year, he used his political capital from the assassination to pass the Civil Rights Bill, and he also started the Vietnam War. In 1964, he faced Republican Barry Goldwater, a far-right extremist who opposed the Civil Rights Bill and was seen as willing to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. The public soundly rejected him, giving LBJ 61.1% of the vote, the most by any candidate since voting rights expanded under Jackson. Goldwater only won the most races in southern states and his home state of Arizona. Democrats also gained 36 House and 2 Senate seats, even running against their incredible 1958 when they had gained 15 Senate seats. The two-thirds majority in each chamber was the most seats any party had since 1938, and no party has achieved these numbers since. These margins gave LBJ enough seats to pass further landmark legislation such as Medicare and more civil rights bills. But as the Vietnam War and draft became unpopular, Dems lost 47 House seats and 3 Senate seats in 1966. LBJ could have run again in 1968, but his popularity had cratered due to the war, and he withdrew from the race in March. The frontrunners were his VP, Hubert Humphrey, and Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother. RFK and Johnson never had a good relationship. RFK was JFK's attorney general, and LBJ didn't like that JFK was closer to his brother than the vice president. And after LBJ became president, RFK ran for the Senate rather than remaining attorney general. Still, Johnson remained neutral in the primary, and RFK seemed likely to win it and the general. But he was assassinated in June 1968, so Democrats were forced to nominate Humphrey. Then anti-war protests at the Democratic Convention in Chicago were brutally put down by cops on the order of the Democratic mayor, Richard Daley. Humphrey then fell behind in the polls and went on to lose a close race to Richard Nixon, who was nominated again after losing in 1960. LBJ's term was also the end of a long left-wing era from 1932 to 1968, as Democrats then only won one presidential election of the next 6 between 1968 and 1988. Now to LBJ's term, starting with his civil rights policies. The modern era of civil rights began when FDR pushed for equality in government contractors with the Fair Employment Practice Committee, and Truman then desegregated the military and called for further legislation. But progress sped up when Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953. The Brown v. Board decision in 1954 desegregated public schools using the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as justification. The Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation in interstate travel in 1955. Public protests increased after Emmett Till's lynching in 1955. Rosa Parks started hers that year, and the Supreme Court ruled public transit segregation illegal in 1956. MLK's Southern Christian Leadership Conference started in 1957, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960. But many states violated the Supreme Court and continued segregation. Eisenhower sent troops to Arkansas in 1957 to ensure black students could attend public school, and also signed the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960. After 1957, public facilities and federal jobs were mostly desegregated, and the federal government punished states and individuals who deprived black people of equal rights. However, the most racist states completely closed public schools or defunded public transit in order to avoid desegregating. Some of them even tried to use state money to fund segregated private schools, though that was deemed illegal. Civil rights groups then fought to desegregate private businesses. They organized sit-ins, where large groups of black people sat in white-only areas. JFK took some action by extending equal employment to government contractors and banning segregation in federally funded housing, and in 1963, he met with MLK after the March on Washington and I Have a Dream speech. He then wrote a civil rights bill, but was assassinated before Congress could act on it. After LBJ became president, he used his experience as Senate Majority Leader and the sympathy for Kennedy to get Congress on board with several civil rights bills, bringing on a second wave of progress from 1964 to 68, after the first wave from 1954 to 1957. The 24th Amendment that banned poll taxes became law in 1964. Protests continued throughout the summer, with Alabama cops beating up peaceful protesters on so-called Bloody Tuesday. In July, LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 after racist Southerners filibustered it for 72 days. It banned discrimination in public facilities, voter registration, and any programs that receive federal funds. And it also went after private discrimination by companies with over 15 employees and by establishments like hotels, gas stations, restaurants, and theaters. It was upheld by the Supreme Court in December under the Interstate Commerce Clause, and MLK won the Nobel Peace Prize. 1965 started with police violence in Selma, Alabama against MLK and other marchers. But LBJ had a renewed mandate after his landslide re-election and passed the Voting Rights Act. It banned literacy tests as a requirement to vote, which were graded more harshly for black people to deny them voting rights, allowed the federal government to rule state voting laws unconstitutional if they caused a racist outcome, and required states to draw majority-minority House districts where possible. Another thing that makes voting rights important is that juries are drawn from the voter pool. All white juries would find black people guilty for almost anything and acquit whites who committed hate crimes. This and the 1964 law were the two biggest pushes for equal rights since Reconstruction. This was obviously not the end of racism, as police brutality persisted and has led to riots and protests for the last 60 years, including the LA Watts riots in 1965 and riots in Detroit in 1967, and the Nation of Islam assassinated former member Malcolm X in 1965. But after these acts, MLK shifted his focus to opposing the Vietnam War and economic issues like better wages for sanitation workers. 1965 also saw the Immigration and Nationality Act open up immigration from more than just Western Europe, especially leading to a major increase in Asian immigrants. The Supreme Court also ruled in favor of interracial marriage in 1967, and LBJ appointed the first black Supreme Court justice, Thurgood Marshall, who had argued the Brown v. Board case in front of the court. 1968 started with MLK's assassination by white supremacists on April 4th, after which more riots broke out. More civil rights legislation passed in the Fair Housing Act, which also included some provisions on Native American rights. But after the last major assassination in RFK in June, Nixon won the November election, and the wave of progress came to an end. Overall, the most credit goes to the Supreme Court, with Eisenhower's appointee Earl Warren as Chief Justice and several FDR and Truman appointees siding with equal rights. But after that, LBJ gets the second most credit. He made civil rights a big part of his presidency, even though it meant that the South slowly became Republican over the next 30 years, and despite himself being a Southern Democrat. He gets an S+ for his stances on civil rights, arguably even higher than Lincoln. Now let's move on to the economy. As we covered under Truman, when World War II ended, GDP crashed and inflation spiked. The same thing happened after the Korean War. GDP fell in 1954, and though it recovered in 1955, inflation remained high. Since there was already no deficit, the other way to cut inflation, interest rate hikes, were used instead. GDP briefly fell in 1958, but recovered in 1959. The next decade then had great economic results. Government spending increased on social programs and later the Vietnam War, but GDP grew fast enough that the debt-to-GDP ratio decreased every year. But inflation also rose, even with interest rates raised to above 4% in 1965. A wartime tax increase was passed in 1968, interest rates rose to 9% in 1969, and war spending began declining in 1970. Then inflation began subsiding, and while 1970 had poor growth, the next 3 years were solid as the tax increase was rescinded and interest rates fell below 6% again. This is more proof that lower spending or high interest rates bring down inflation, and although it may mean 1 year of poor economic growth, the GDP should rebound once their measures are revoked. But then the Arab oil embargo in 1973 began a decade of economic turmoil that we'll cover under Reagan. LBJ's years specifically had a great economy. The average GDP growth of 5% was the second highest since 1900 after only FDR. And unlike FDR, LBJ's tenure didn't start the nadir of a business cycle. FDR's early growth was largely just a recovery from the Great Depression, and after the recovery, the US faced another recession in 1938. But when LBJ took office, the economy had already been strong since 1958. Additional growth on top of an already strong economy is more impressive. And the debt-to-GDP ratio also decreased under LBJ despite the increased government spending in the war on poverty, Medicare, and the Vietnam War. This is because the rich paid high taxes. The top rate slowly went from 94% in 1945 after World War II ended to 70% in 1981, and the debt-to-GDP ratio went from 113% in 1946 to 28% in 1981. But Reagan slashed income taxes on the rich, and the debt-to-GDP ratio has since ballooned to over 120%. And economic growth since 1981 has been much lower than what it was under FDR and LBJ, when the debt was last that high. The higher taxes from FDR to Carter meant smaller deficits and more equal growth, not economic stagnation. But LBJ's economic record did have one stain: high inflation. Inflation was still under 2% after just his economic measures, but the Vietnam War spending took the economy to the point where it overheated, and inflation remained high until 1980. One silver lining of the higher inflation is that it also did help to keep the debt-to-GDP ratio down. When inflation is higher than interest rates, the debt-to-GDP ratio decreases as government loans have negative real interest rates. Still, voters have made it very clear that they hate inflation, so the Fed and politicians have to make difficult decisions on what to prioritize: inflation, GDP growth, or the debt-to-GDP ratio. Now to the rest of LBJ's grades. Let's first cover LBJ's economic legislation, known as the Great Society. In 1964, a small tax cut took effect, taking the top rate from 91% to 70%. 91% is probably at the point where higher tax rates do dissuade economic activity, so this was a fair enough move. GDP growth rose while the deficit decreased, and the rates were still high enough to prevent income inequality from growing. Spending also increased as Johnson started the war on poverty. Food stamps were made permanent, benefiting the poor and farmers while improving nutrition. Johnson created the Office of Economic Opportunity, which administered anti-poverty jobs and welfare programs, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which builds public housing and provides mortgage assistance for the poor and veterans. And funding for education was increased via assistance to poor children so they received medical care and school meals, increased elementary and high school funding in impoverished areas, and higher education and research to maintain the U.S. edge in science and tech, while ensuring no money went to segregated schools. But the biggest increase in spending was on Medicare and Medicaid. Healthcare in the U.S. is largely tied to employment, so over half of retired seniors did not have health insurance. So LBJ created Medicare to cover them and Medicaid for low-income and disabled Americans. Both programs save tons of money, as enrollees get cheap care since the government can use its bargaining power with pharmaceutical companies to ensure low prices. This was the best healthcare legislation in U.S. history. LBJ's environmental legislation included the Clean Air Act, Motor Vehicle Air Pollution Control Act, and spending on public transit, with the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act of 1965 funding the start of the Acela corridor between D.C. and Boston. BART in the Bay Area also began construction in 1964, and LBJ presided over the first day of work. He also continued spending on NASA, which landed on the moon 6 months after he left office, passed limited gun control after the string of assassinations in the 60s, required warning labels on cigarettes, and increased auto safety standards. All of this led to a strong economy and improved public health and safety in the environment. GDP growth was strong, unemployment fell from 6% in 1960 to 3% in 1969, and poverty went from 20% in 1964 to 12% in 1969. All this, combined with his support for civil rights, give LBJ an impeccable record domestically. But now we have to cover his foreign policy, which was nowhere near as good. One reason for the low unemployment was that millions of young men were sent to die in the Vietnam War. The conflict escalated under JFK, who sent more U.S. troops there and improved a coup in the South, but it became a full-fledged war under Johnson. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a minor skirmish between the U.S. Navy vessel and North Vietnamese boats, was exaggerated by U.S. intelligence agencies, like the main incident before the Spanish-American War. Congress believed the shady evidence and passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed the U.S. to send troops to fight North Vietnam. Johnson didn't start off hawkish on the war, as he deployed very few troops before the 1964 election and portrayed Goldwater as a belligerent extremist to win in a landslide. But in 1965, the U.S. began bombing campaigns, killing tons of civilians, and sent thousands of draftees there per month, mostly for poor families as richer students could pay to avoid the draft. By July, 35,000 Americans were being sent there each month. But the U.S. never really made inroads into North Vietnam, so Americans were being sent off to die for no reason. Criticism for Johnson grew in 1966 from within the Democratic Party by people like RFK, and the midterms showed the public was not happy either. Rallies against the war picked up, especially on college campuses, and MLK began publicly opposing it in 1967. Finally, in early 1968, LBJ began withdrawing troops and announced he wouldn't run for re-election. The war continued under Nixon, but most of the 60,000 American deaths were during LBJ's terms. Hundreds of thousands more were injured or suffered from PTSD, and millions of Vietnamese civilians were killed or disabled by U.S. weapons. Johnson's Vietnam War policy was a total disaster. But the rest of his foreign policy was okay. As mentioned, the U.S. began reducing its nuclear weapons stockpile. These weapons are extremely expensive, so even with the Vietnam War spending, the military budget under LBJ was a smaller percent of GDP than it had been under JFK or Eisenhower. The US, UK, and USSR all agreed to not help any other countries develop nukes, and relations with the USSR continued to gradually improve throughout the 60s. When Israel invaded neighboring countries in 1967 after terrorist attacks by Palestinians, LBJ did initially support them. But he pressured them to end the war quickly, and it only lasted 6 days. The US even agreed to a UN resolution asking for Israel to return the land it captured during the war, though they have since only returned the land they stole from Egypt. In Panama, locals rioted and demanded the canal be given back. LBJ started negotiations that concluded under Carter, and the canal was given back to Panama in 1999. The U.S. did intervene in the Dominican Republic, as the right-wing regime agreed Cabral stayed in power over the previously elected leftist Juan Bosch. But the U.S. withdrew troops fairly quickly, and they hadn't supported the coup itself. So when evaluating LBJ's presidency, we have some amazing positives in his support for civil rights, the passage of Medicare, and his strong GDP growth rate while cutting the debt, but also a terrible war in Vietnam. I put him at the very bottom of A. His accomplishments make him better than all but a few presidents, but his one massive mistake keeps him from being worthy of Mount Rushmore. Now to his successor, Richard Nixon. Nixon's political career started at the age of 33 when he won a House seat in the 1946 Republican wave. The incumbent Democrat had won by double digits in 1944, and Nixon won again in 1948, even as Democrats gained 75 House seats nationwide. He then won an election to the Senate in California in 1950 by almost 20 points, was selected as Eisenhower's vice president, and they won in 2 landslides. So far, his electoral record was spotless. But when he ran for president in 1960, he lost narrowly to JFK, and then also lost California's gubernatorial election in 1962. After the loss, he indicated in a press conference that he would retire from politics. But he was still only 49 years old, and after the Republicans' terrible 1964, he returned to campaign for them in 1966, when they made strong gains. Then he ran for president again in 1968, and as mentioned, benefited from the chaos of the Vietnam War and RFK's assassination to beat Hubert Humphrey. Nixon had a huge lead in the polls right after the DNC, but the final result was relatively close. LBJ began reducing fighting in Vietnam, and the racist third-party candidate George Wallace attacked Nixon more than Humphrey, as Nixon was his main competition in the South. Nixon won with 301 electoral votes, sweeping the West and most of the Midwest and South, while Humphrey won most of the Northeast and Wallace the most racist Southern states. Republicans also gained 7 Senate seats in 1968, though the House barely changed, as Republicans had already made gains in 1966. The 1970 midterm saw minor losses for Republicans in the House, but more gains in the Senate, as they were running against the 1964 slaughter. Nixon then won re-election in a landslide in 1972, as Democrats were still divided, and their nominee George McGovern failed to win moderate voters. However, Nixon cheated in this election by illegally wiretapping Democrats at the Watergate Hotel in D.C., and once his crimes were exposed and he was about to be impeached, he resigned in August 1974. So we'll cover the 72 and 74 elections under his successor, Gerald Ford. Now to Nixon's terms. Nixon's presidency, as well as Ford and Carter after him, represented the transition from the fifth party system, where Republicans were legitimately moderate and Democrats left-wing, to the sixth, where Republicans a bit far right besides Bush Sr., and Democrats center-left. I'll start with the areas where Nixon was moderate before getting to where he made the U.S. more right-wing. On the economy, Nixon had to deal with the high inflation of 1968. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates from 4% in 1967 to 9% by 1969, and Nixon cut spending by ending LBJ's job agencies like the Office of Economic Opportunity and vetoed social spending laws like a national daycare system. But after 1970 had weak growth, the Fed cut rates to 4%, and Nixon signed the Emergency Employment Act, which funded $2 billion in public service jobs. 1971 was also the first year that the U.S. had a trade deficit since the 1930s, so Nixon ended the U.S. dollar's fixed exchange rate and convertibility to gold, and put up a universal 10% tariff for 4 months. This led to a trade surplus the next year, and when large deficits returned in the 1980s, Reagan signed the similar Plaza Accords. These actions led to high GDP growth in 1972, helping carry Nixon to a landslide re-election. But they also meant inflation remained sticky, as more money entered the economy and imports became more expensive. So Nixon also took more drastic measures, like a 90-day freeze on wages and prices in August 1971. Congress extended these powers, and price controls continued on and off for the rest of his presidency. The Fed only slowly increased interest rates over the next 2 years. Inflation initially fell, but then worsened in 1973 as OPEC stopped selling oil to the US following Israel's war with many of its neighbors. This supply-side shock led to high inflation for the next decade and a recession, a combination dubbed stagflation. Nixon tried price controls again, but this meant major shortages and lines at gas stations, so they were lifted, and inflation thus remained high until 1982. But GDP growth was also high, and the debt-to-GDP ratio fell every year thanks to his progressive economic policies. Nixon raised taxes on the rich by increasing the capital gains rate and creating the alternative minimum tax. He also expanded Social Security for the poor with supplemental security income. This program is more targeted than regular Social Security, so I approve of it more. The minimum wage was also raised annually from 1974 to 1981, and Nixon tried to pass a negative income tax, or universal basic income, only for the employed. Congress passed a similar earned income tax credit under Ford. But Nixon was to the right of Congress on healthcare. Medicare and Medicaid were successes, so Congress attempted to pass universal healthcare. But Nixon refused, preferring to have healthcare continue to be tied to employment, and nothing passed during his term. Obamacare, which passed 35 years later, was similar to his proposed plan. This is a great example of Democrats moving right after LBJ. Nixon did agree to expand Medicare, and the payroll tax was raised to cover that and the Social Security expansion. So on the economy, Nixon was okay. He ran modest deficits every year that helped grow the economy, and the debt-to-GDP ratio still decreased, as did inequality. But he had a bit of a muddled agenda that caused high inflation, so he gets an average grade. Nixon was also moderate on regulation. He signed legislation to create the Workplace Safety Agency OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Endangered Species and Clean Air Act. The depletion allowance, a tax break for oil companies, was also reduced from 27% to 22%. But he vetoed the Clean Water Act, and after Congress overrode his veto and funded the organization, Nixon ignored the law and didn't fund it. Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act to force the president to spend money appropriated by Congress. And one of Nixon's Supreme Court appointees, Lewis Powell, was an anti-regulation tobacco lobbyist who also believed that corporations could spend unlimited money on elections to fund corrupt candidates, which became the case after the Supreme Court decision in Bank of Boston versus Bilotti. After the moon landing in 1969, NASA spending was reduced as the main goal had been reached. But Nixon negotiated a shared space mission with the USSR, reducing tensions between the two countries and improving global scientific knowledge. The government invested in cancer research under the NIH, including on sickle cell anemia, which predominantly affects black people, as it's associated with the gene that reduces malaria risks. And he continued LBJ's support for strong public transit by creating Amtrak in 1970. Nixon also supported other liberal causes at the time. As the Vietnam War draft forced 18-year-old men to go fight and die, Congress decided they should have the right to vote, which in many states only started at 21. Nixon supported this move and it became law as the 26th Amendment. He also signed the 1972 Higher Education Act, Title IX of which bans gender discrimination in federally funded education programs, and supported the Equal Rights Amendment, which would require full legal equality between men and women, though that did not pass. But racial issues showed Nixon's darker side. Although schools could no longer be legally segregated, since they are geographically based and housing had been segregated, they largely remained de facto segregated. Nixon opposed busing efforts that would take minority kids to schools in other districts in order to further desegregate, instead preferring affirmative action in government hiring and support for minority businesses. His Supreme Court appointees made the court more right-wing, and the large expansion of civil rights by the court from Brown v. Board in 1954 to Roe v. Wade in 1973 ended with Milliken v. Bradley in 1974, a decision that limited school busing. Nixon also started the war on drugs after Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act in 1970 and created the Drug Enforcement Agency in 1973. Sentencing disparity and more police activity in black communities meant these laws primarily punished minorities. One of his assistants even admitted this was the point, saying, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really about? Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We couldn't make it illegal to be against the war of black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Do we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. No-knock warrants and civil assets forfeiture, or legalized robbery by cop, also took off. The government also cracked down on anti-war protests, first by prosecuting the 1968 DNC protesters in the trial of the Chicago 7, which Aaron Sorkin has a great movie about, and then by murdering students at Kent State in 1970. Nixon didn't say anything about the shooting, and the perpetrators were found not guilty. He also created an interagency committee on intelligence that planned operations against suspected communist and anti-war protesters, and eulogized FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who died in 1972 after heading the agency for 50 years. Hoover had carried out domestic surveillance operations on people such as MLK. And Nixon's most egregious action as president was his illegal spying, such as in the Watergate scandal that led to his resignation. This started after Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst, leaked the Pentagon Papers in 1971. They showed the U.S. approved of the coup of Diem in 1963, that bombings had expanded to Laos and Cambodia, and that the U.S. knew defeating the North was impossible. Nixon was mad and sued the New York Times, who had published them. The case went to the Supreme Court, who ruled the Times were protected by the First Amendment. After this, Nixon went crazy. He began taping conversations in the White House and created the Special Investigations Unit, nicknamed the Plumbers, and had them break the law for him. First, they broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to find dirt on him. Then in 1972, they broke into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate Hotel, but were caught and convicted in early 1973. The Senate investigated it, and when a White House aide exposed the recording devices, the Senate asked Nixon for the tapes to prove whether he sanctioned the break-in or not. Nixon refused, but was forced to by the Supreme Court in the case U.S. versus Nixon. The House then impeached Nixon, and after Republican senators told Nixon he was toast, he resigned before he could be convicted. Obviously, all of this was blatantly illegal and way worse than anything any other president had done when it came to abusing the power of the office, although Trump this term is trying to beat Nixon's record for evil. So for his domestic grade, on the policy side, Nixon was probably only a little below average, with his economic, civil rights, and regulation records all being mixed bags. But all his abuses of power, from the illegal impoundment and refusal to turn over evidence that violated congressional authority, to surveillance, arrests, and murders of journalists and his political opponents, make him definitely a negative and set some terrible precedents. Nixon's foreign policy was also atrocious, as he carried out both coups like Eisenhower had and deployed boots on the ground and directly bombed civilians like LBJ had done. His national security advisor and then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger might be the worst of all time at those roles. Firstly, the Vietnam War continued for 4 more years under Nixon, even after he claimed he would end it when running in 1968. Bombing campaigns continued until 1972, and the war ended in a miserable failure for the U.S., as a year after the U.S. withdrew its troops, the North took over the South. Nixon was openly in favor of killing innocent civilians, as he commuted the sentence of the perpetrators of the My Lai massacre, an event where the U.S. soldiers raped and murdered up to 500 civilians. He also expanded the scope of the war by sending U.S. soldiers to Cambodia and Laos, and also bombed those countries immensely. Laos became the most bombed country in the world as the U.S. indiscriminately dropped 260 million bombs. It was and still is one of the poorest countries in the region. Not only did these bombs kill hundreds of thousands of civilians during the war, they also rendered farmland unusable as many bombs remained ready to detonate decades later and claim more victims. And like Vietnam, the bombings didn't even further U.S. aims. Laos is still communist today, and Cambodia's communists took power in 1975 and then committed the Cambodian genocide. Ironically, after North Vietnam won the war and unified the country under a communist regime, it invaded Cambodia and removed their communists from power, and then fought with China, who wanted to redraw the border to take more land. The Vietnamese economy liberalized in 1986 and GDP exploded, and today it's closer to the US than it is to China. After Congress found out Nixon illegally bombed Laos and Cambodia when he was only allowed to bomb Vietnam, it passed the War Powers Resolution, which forces the president to inform Congress within 48 hours of action overseas and prove that it is legal. Nixon vetoed the bill, proving he was in favor of illegally bombing countries, but Congress overrode his veto. So Nixon had a terrible policy in Southeast Asia. Another conflict where Nixon supported the mass slaughter of civilians and sided with the losers was the Bangladesh Liberation War. The US had previously been mostly neutral with India and Pakistan, as while India was allied with the USSR, it was rivals with China. But Nixon was insanely racist towards Indians, especially women, and thus hated Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. He remarked to Henry Kissinger after one meeting with her, "Undoubtedly the most unattractive women in the world are Indian women. The most sexless nothing, these people. People say, what about the Africans? Well, you can see something, the vitality there. I mean, they have a little animal-like charm, but God, those Indians, pathetic. To me, they turn me off. How the hell do they turn other people on, Henry?" So when Bangladesh declared independence from Pakistan after the military dictator Yahya Khan ignored election results, Nixon armed Pakistan and sent an aircraft carrier to the Bay of Bengal. The Soviets then sent their navy to support India, and Nixon backed off before causing World War III. Bangladesh achieved independence, but only after Pakistan killed hundreds of thousands of civilians using American weapons. India then pursued nuclear weapons, detonating one in 1974. Again, Nixon's policy was not only morally wrong as it killed countless civilians, it was also unsuccessful. But Nixon also supported Pakistan in order to reduce tensions with China, which was no longer fully allied with the USSR. After Stalin, the USSR became less hardline, but Mao was as committed as ever. Mao's most authoritarian projects were the Great Leap Forward from 1958 and 1962, and the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to his death in 1976. China and the USSR even had a brief border clash in 1969. So Nixon tried to make peace with both by playing them off each other. Nixon agreed to open trade with China, gave them Taiwan's spot on the UN Security Council, and visited Beijing in 1972. The talks there also helped end the Vietnam War the next year. And later that year, he visited Moscow and de-escalated tensions with the Soviets. He was the first president to visit either country since World War II. The US and USSR also agreed upon a treaty to ban missiles in space, which would limit the efficacy of mutually assured destruction and make offensive use of nukes more likely. They also tried to agree on a strategic arms limitation treaty in order to have both sides slowly reduce their nuclear stockpiles. But talks were unsuccessful, and the US actually increased its nuclear stockpile from 1970 to 1974. But overall, military spending went from 9.1% of GDP in 1968 to 5.4% in 1974, much less than it had been even before the Vietnam War. With allies, Nixon had a mixed relationship. The temporary tariff of 1971 made Japan and Canada mad, even though it only lasted 4 months. But the US returned the island of Okinawa to Japanese control, and security relationship remained strong. Canada also received a lot of young American immigrants fleeing the Vietnam War and draft during LBJ and Nixon's terms. Neither of those presidents seriously attempted to prosecute them, and most would return to the US during the Ford and Carter administrations. The US-Canada relationship thus remained strong until Trump's second term. Nixon's foreign policy was bad in many other countries too. He backed many right-wing dictators over left-wing democracies. One example was the Congo, then called Zaire. Leftist leader Patrice Lumumba was overthrown under Eisenhower. Nixon visited his successor, dictator Mobutu Sese Seko, in 1967, and then hosted Mobutu in the White House in 1970. Mobutu stole elections and handed control of state companies to friends and relatives, but because he was anti-communist and willing to export Congo's valuable minerals, Nixon supported him. Similarly, in Chile, Nixon supported the overthrow of Salvador Allende's socialist government in order to make U.S. mining companies happy. Their new leader, Augusto Pinochet, was brutal. He threw dissidents out of helicopters and massively increased income inequality, but U.S. interests benefited. Here, U.S. support was explicit, as economists from UChicago went there to run the economy. And Nixon's Middle East policy was not only bad for the people there, it also hurt the U.S. As mentioned, in 1967, Israel invaded their neighbors and stole land. LBJ ensured that war only lasted 6 days, as he ended weapon sales and urged Israel to return the land they captured. But by 1973, they still had not, so the surrounding Arab countries attacked to reclaim their land. Nixon quickly armed Israel so they could hold their seized lands, giving them supplies worth over $6 billion in today's money. A week later, he asked Congress to send even more billions in aid. This angered Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries, and they began an oil embargo of the West, which led to high inflation over the next decade. The UN passed a ceasefire resolution, but Israel continued to violate it. Only after the USSR threatened to intervene did Israel stop. The US then imported more oil from Iran, but as that relationship grew closer, discontent in Iran grew, and the Iranian Revolution occurred in 1979. The Golan Heights and much of the West Bank are still being illegally held by Israel today, and they haven't stopped taking land or committing war crimes since, as they've invaded and bombed Lebanon and Gaza many times. Nixon was worse on Israel than anyone before him. So like his domestic policy, Nixon's foreign policy had bright spots, but was overall quite poor. I thus give Nixon an F as his grade. I'll put him at the top of F, as he was better than the obscenely racist Van Buren, Pierce, Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson tenures that were also terrible on the economy or foreign policy. But Nixon's abuses of power and other mistakes, like the drug war, pro-corporate Supreme Court, and foreign policy, make me put him below everyone in D. I view him as a similar level president as Harding and McKinley, but since he was in office longer than them, his more time to do bad puts him in F while they're in D. Now let's get to his successor, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford became president after Nixon resigned in August 1974, but he originally hadn't been vice president either. Nixon's initial vice president, Spiro Agnew, was convicted in his own corruption case from his time as governor of Maryland, so he resigned in 1973. The 25th Amendment, passed after JFK's assassination, let Congress elect a new vice president if there is none, and also made the president's cabinet able to declare them unfit and remove them from office, such as if the president is physically incapacitated but not dead. Ford, who led the House Republicans, was selected by Nixon to be the new VP, and Congress easily approved him. He then became president less than a year later. He chose New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, another moderate, to be his vice president. Nixon had won in a landslide in 1972, as the economy grew strongly while inflation slightly fell. He faced a fractured Democratic Party and cheated by illegally spying. Republicans also made gains in the House, though they lost Senate seats running against 1966 when Democrats had a poor year due to Vietnam escalating. But 1974 was a massacre the other way. The oil crisis led to high inflation and a recession, and Nixon's illegal activities were exposed. After Ford pardoned Nixon, he was also tainted. Democrats gained 5 Senate seats and 48 House seats in the election, reaching their best total since 1964, and marks in both they haven't reached since. Thus, Ford's term largely saw him acquiesce to congressional demands. Ford was then primaried by Ronald Reagan in 1976, who viewed him as too moderate. The two were even in delegates at the convention, but Ford won the nomination after ditching Rockefeller for a more conservative running mate, Bob Dole. He then faced Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter in the general election. Though Ford trailed by double digits in polls in September, the polls were much closer by Election Day, as the economy had strong growth and low inflation throughout 1976, and he put up strong showings in the presidential debates. But he still lost re-election and thus had the shortest reign as president since Harding. Now to his grade. A month into his term, Ford made the worst decision of his presidency in pardoning Nixon. He decided that some people are above the law and can commit crimes with impunity. This was made explicit in the 2024 Trump versus United States Supreme Court verdict. Now presidents can do literally anything, even having the army assassinate political rivals, and if their party members in the Senate don't convict them, there's no punishment. Ford's pardon of Nixon, Obama not prosecuting torturers or perjurers in the Bush administration, and the Supreme Court decision are why Trump can break the law 100 times a day with no consequences. Ford's approval rating fell by 30% and Republicans were thrashed in the 1974 midterms. The Vietnam War, Watergate, pardon, and stagflation permanently damaged confidence in government. Ford knew this was unpopular, so a week later, he announced clemency for draft dodgers, saying the government would not prosecute them if they worked for 2 years in public service. This was a damage control move and a half measure, and Carter would fully pardon all of them. Ford also vetoed amendments to the Freedom of Information Act that further increased governmental transparency, though his veto was overridden. The government must prove there is a reason for documents to be classified and thus cannot hide their misdeeds under false pretenses. And after the New York Times revealed many abuses committed by the CIA in projects like MKUltra, Ford created a commission to make a public report on them. But before the report came out, White House Chief of Staff Dick Cheney, who would go on to commit torture and war crimes as vice president, heavily redacted and whitewashed the report. But one law Congress passed that Ford signed was the creation of the Office of the Inspector General. These appointees audit federal contracts and actually reduce waste, fraud, and abuse in government. The Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees Medicare, Medicaid, and more, received the first Inspector General in 1976, and the program was expanded in 1978. Still, when it came to abuses of power, while Ford himself didn't commit any, his pardon of Nixon and other actions proved he was okay with them and hurt his grade massively. On the economy, Ford inherited high inflation and low growth caused by the supply shock of the oil embargo. He first proposed raising taxes and cutting spending to cut the deficit in inflation, but when it was clear the economy was stagnating, he then signed tax cuts instead. The standard deduction was increased and earned income tax credit introduced, both of which benefited the poorest earners the most, while the capital gains tax was increased, which mostly affects the rich who have the most passive income. 1975 still saw negative growth and high inflation, but the economy grew by 5% annually from 1976 to 1978, and inflation decreased. Ford also signed the 1975 Energy Policy and Conservation Act. It created a strategic petroleum reserve, a government stockpile that smooths demand to ensure prices never go too high or too low. It also increased fuel efficiency standards for cars and largely banned oil exports outside of Canada and Mexico. Ford was more hesitant to agree with Congress when New York City faced financial difficulties in 1975 and asked for more federal funding. A month later, he agreed to send $2.3 billion, but made sure the city reduced spending and had a long-term plan for fiscal solvency. These conditions were somewhat reasonable. But worse than this was when Ford and Congress passed Tax Section 936 in 1976, which allowed companies to use Puerto Rico as a tax haven. Companies moved branches there for the tax breaks, but poverty and inequality on the island only grew, and GDP growth there was less than the rest of the country over the next 2 decades. So Ford's economic record was okay. He mostly agreed to the demands of Congress's massive Democratic majorities, and the GDP growth was decent, but inflation remained high. Finally, on social issues, Ford was clearly better than Nixon. His Supreme Court nominee, John Paul Stevens, was a moderate who made decisions I agree with in cases like UC versus Bakke, DC versus Heller, and Citizens United versus FEC. And Ford supported campaign finance reform as he signed the Federal Election Campaign Act, which created the FEC and put limits on political donations, making him much better than Nixon on that issue. Like Nixon, Ford supported the ERA, although it still didn't get ratified, and opposed busing. Geographic segregation remained, and a commission reported that northern schools were more unequal than southern schools. There was violence against black students in Boston who were bused into a majority Irish neighborhood, and Ford barely spoke out against it and in fact discouraged future integration. On foreign policy, Ford was again far better than Nixon, but not great. We'll start with Vietnam. After the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, the US withdrew its troops, but the North soon restarted the war. Ford tried to send military aid to the South, but not more troops. Congress still refused, and the North conquered the South within 2 years. The US allowed in refugees fleeing the South, but Ford then also put an embargo on the reunified country and denied it entry to the UN. As mentioned under Nixon, Vietnam fought with China and Cambodia soon after unification, so the US could have leveraged Vietnam to further its goals rather than try to exclude Vietnam from international organizations. In fact, in 1975, Cambodia seized a US merchant ship near their waters. Ford sent troops instead of negotiating, and up to 50 Americans died, though the rescue was eventually successful. So Ford's policy failed with these countries. But on the Middle East, he wasn't just miles better than Nixon, he was legitimately good. Ford paused military aid to Israel, only resuming it after they continued negotiating with Egypt in the Second Sinai Agreement in September 1975. The same year, a civil war broke out in Lebanon between Syrian, Christian, and Islamist factions. Ford didn't take a side, and after the US ambassador there was murdered, all Americans were evacuated. This was the right decision, avoiding escalating or getting involved in the conflict while ensuring Americans were safe. And on Cyprus, Ford was even better than Congress. The island was 80% Greek and 20% Turkish, living in relative harmony. But in 1974, the Greek military junta led a coup in order to then annex the whole country. In response, Turkey sent troops there to protect the Turkish population in the north of the island. As both countries are NATO members, the US couldn't send troops, but it could still take a side. Despite Greece being the initiator, Congress sided with them and passed an arms embargo on Turkey. Ford vetoed it, but after the midterms he signed a similar bill. This was bad policy by Congress. Greece became a democracy later that year, and had the US been neutral, it could have convinced Turkey to withdraw their troops. But the favoring of Greece angered Turkey, and Cyprus remains split today. Ford was also better than Nixon when it came to relations with US allies. He became the first president to visit Japan, and ensured that Canada could join the G7. This was much better than Nixon's tariffs that angered both countries. But Ford was as bad as Nixon in his support for a right-wing dictatorship in Indonesia. The leftist Sukarno became leader when it became independent in 1945. He was initially a unifying leader, but he seized Dutch assets, declared martial law, made himself president for life, and then invaded Malaysia and annexed West Papua. By 1965, triple-digit inflation and large deficits forced him out. That's why I don't blame LBJ for okaying this overthrow. Sukarno's successor, Suharto, also started decently as he cut inflation and grew the economy, so US aid exported cheap food to Indonesia. But like his predecessor, he was an imperialist, and when he invaded East Timor in 1975, Ford backed him, promising to veto any UN resolution against Indonesia. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and East Timor became independent only in 2002 after Suharto's death. Finally, let's cover Ford's relations with China and the USSR. Like Nixon, Ford visited China and continued to slowly improve relations with them. Mao died in late 1976, and the two countries' economic integration really started after that. And with the USSR, he was better than Nixon. Nixon failed to reach a treaty with them and increase US nuclear stockpiles during his term, but Ford signed a treaty with them on underground nuclear testing in 1976, and the US decreased its number of nukes under him. So overall, Ford was certainly not a terrible president. His list of good and bad moves are about equally long, but I think the badness of the Nixon pardon was worse than anything good he did, so I slot him in below average in C-. Let's now get to the last president of the fifth party system, Jimmy Carter. Carter was relatively unknown before the 1976 election, as he was the governor of Georgia, which at the time Democrats dominated at the state level. But in 1974, instead of running for re-election, he instead started campaigning for president. He spent a lot of time in the early primary states of Iowa and New Hampshire and was able to win both. He also won most of the South, with George Wallace winning the most racist states. And with a large field running to face Ford, the others split the vote while Carter's momentum and improved name recognition from his early wins won him the primary. As mentioned, Ford faced a tough primary challenge from California Governor Ronald Reagan and trailed heavily in early general election polls, but improved as the economy did. Carter won with a similar map to JFK in 1960, who ran with a Southerner in LBJ. Both were swept in the West and split the Midwest, and while Carter won more of the South than JFK in the popular vote by more, the Electoral College was closer, as Ford won Connecticut and New Jersey, which JFK had won, and demographic changes meant California was worth more and New York and Pennsylvania less than 1960. But it was still a win, and Democrats in Congress held the large majorities they won in 1974, giving Carter the votes to pass whatever he wanted. But Carter didn't get along with Congress. He refused to back Medicare for All, and his biggest legislative accomplishment was just middle-class tax cuts. The economy grew well in 1977 and 78, so Dems did well in the midterms, retaining large majorities in the House and Senate. But in 1979, the Iranian Revolution replaced the US-backed Shah with an Islamist regime who took US embassy workers hostage and again cut off oil to the US. Inflation spiked back up to 9%, and the economy stagnated. Carter faced a primary challenge from left-wing Senator Ted Kennedy, but managed to hold him off. As I talked about when describing the fifth party system, I view this as the end of the fifth and start of the sixth, as the Democratic Party moved away from the left-wing Kennedy-Johnson legacy to the neoliberal Carter-Clinton-Biden wing. Carter then faced Reagan in the general election. Polls were tight after the conventions, but Carter skipped the first debate as the moderate independent John B. Anderson was included. Both Anderson and Reagan attacked Carter without him there to defend himself, and Reagan took a lead in the polls. Carter went on to lose handily, and Democrats also lost 35 House seats and a whopping 12 Senate seats, the latter running against the 1974 post-Watergate midterms when Democrats had a great show. Carter was thus largely viewed as a failed president at the time, but his reputation has considerably improved since. Let's go into my grade for him. We'll again start with the economy, where Carter, like his two predecessors, had a mixed record of good GDP growth and high inflation, and he agreed to some of Congress's left-wing demands and rejected others. Carter's biggest fiscal legislation was the Revenue Act of 1978. It created 401ks, which let workers place pre-tax money in retirement investment accounts. The capital gains tax and corporate taxes were also reduced to further incentivize investment. These benefit the upper middle class and rich more than the poorest Americans, but the bill also raised the standard deduction, benefiting the poorest. On welfare, Carter rejected Congress's proposed increases. This made some sense, as growth was high in 1977 and 78, and inflation was still over 6%, so more spending could have exacerbated it. But on healthcare, Carter's disagreement with Congress was incorrect. Congress pushed Medicare for all, but like Nixon, Carter only wanted small changes to the system, and no agreement was reached. This was what made Kennedy primary Carter in 1980. But the most pressing issue during Carter's term was energy policy. The 1973 inflation spike was caused by an oil embargo, so Carter wanted to reduce American dependence on foreign oil. He created the Department of Energy, continued building up nuclear power, and gave tax credits and increased research in clean energy, even putting solar panels on the White House. Regulations on oil were reduced and price controls lifted so production could meet the missing supply. But car efficiency standards, taxes on oil, and mining regulations increased, and public lands in Alaska were protected from drilling. All this reduced oil dependency in the long run while trying to minimize price increases in the short term. Per capita energy consumption began dropping, and oil imports halved by 1983. But in the short run, the 1979 Iranian Revolution caused another spike in oil prices and inflation. And even before then, inflation had been rising since 1976 as the economy picked back up. So the new Fed chair, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates dramatically in 1979. Inflation remained high and the economy suffered in 1980, causing Carter's landslide defeat by Reagan that year. But inflation largely subsided by 1982 and a full recovery came in 1984. So the policy worked, just with bad timing for Carter electorally. Carter also deregulated airlines, trucks, railroads, and banks. The first two moves were good, as airfare and trucking costs fell over the next decades and more routes opened up. But while rail transport prices fell, allowing freight to bylines and prioritize their cargo over passenger trains hurt public transit, and the banking deregulation helped cause the savings and loans crisis under Reagan and eventually the Great Recession under Bush Jr. Carter also bailed out Chrysler, an American automaker, which was probably politically necessary, but again shows how he prioritized cars, as did his failure to raise the gas tax. Finally, Carter was good on education policy. He created the Department of Education, which does not set curriculum standards, but rather provides federal funding to states for schools. He ensured no money went to religious or private schools, and instead invested in Head Start and discounted school meals, helping poor children. So overall, Carter was good at domestic issues. While inflation was high throughout his tenure, his energy policy was great at reducing it while protecting the planet, and his Fed appointees' interest rate hikes brought it down, just not during his term. GDP growth was high before the rate hikes, and his tax cuts and deregulation were pretty reasonable. but his rejection of Medicare for All was a clear mistake, and he could have done a lot more with a massive congressional majorities had he gotten along with them better. On foreign policy, Carter again was viewed poorly at the time due to the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis in 1979. The US-aligned Shah led the country since the 1953 coup, but a poor economy and a growing right-wing Islamist movement led to a revolution that overthrew him with Ayatollah Khomeini, a religious leader. And after the US accepted the Shah, who had cancer when he fled to the country, Iran took the US embassy workers hostage. Carter sent the Air Force to rescue them, but a dust storm caused the mission to be aborted and 8 Americans died. After this, Iran became more angry and released the hostages the day Reagan was inaugurated in 1981. Evidence shows that Iran hated Carter, and Reagan may even have reached out to them during the campaign. Even though only the failed rescue was Carter's fault, the public blamed him for all of it, contributing to his landslide loss in 1980. But most of his foreign policy was good. Unlike his predecessors, he didn't deploy troops, and on day one of his presidency, he fully pardoned all Vietnam War draft dodgers. He also didn't coup enemies and criticize allies when they were in the wrong. The biggest example of this was Israel. Carter convinced them to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt so Egypt would recognize them. The peace between the two countries has held since. He also criticized Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank and withheld aid from them. Carter was also the first president to criticize apartheid South Africa, and he put them under an arms embargo. Namibia soon received independence from South Africa, and Zimbabwe ended its own white minority rule. That said, Israel and South Africa jointly tested a nuke in 1979 in violation of international arms treaties, and Carter said nothing about it, so he wasn't immune to bias in favor of US allies. In Latin America, he cut off aid to dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and agreed to return the Panama Canal to Panama in 1999, but secured the US right to intervene militarily, a compromise that made Congress and Panama happy. Now that Mao was dead and China was led by the moderate Deng Xiaoping, Carter improved relations and trade with them. He extended them formal recognition and made relations with Taiwan unofficial. In all these cases, Carter criticized US allies when they violated human rights and rewarded countries for liberalizing. But when it came to countries fighting the USSR or its allies, Carter did give aid to dictatorships. Like Nixon, he backed Mobutu in the Congo, who faced communist rebels. And Carter backed not only China, but even the brutal Khmer Rouge in Cambodia against Vietnam. Carter first refrained from criticizing the USSR heavily as he hoped to sign an arms treaty. But then the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to support the ruling communists against an Islamist insurgency. The treaty talks broke, and then Carter began arming the Afghan rebels via Pakistan. I'll cover this in full detail under Reagan, but this was a terrible policy. Carter also placed a wheat embargo on the USSR and boycotted the Moscow Olympics, but these moves harmed American farmers and athletes more than the Soviets. Military spending was 5.4% in 1975 after the Vietnam War ended. It declined to 4.5% by 1979 under Carter, but the aid to Afghanistan increased it to 5% in 1981 before further accelerating under Reagan. So overall, Carter's foreign policy was good, but not great. His policies with Israel and Latin America were positive divergences from his predecessors, but his apparent weakness on the Panama Canal and failure on the hostage crisis hurt him at the time, and his policy in Afghanistan aged the worst. Combine this with his above-average domestic policy, and I put him in C+. He can't go higher as his biggest accomplishment were just small tweaks that aged well, like his energy and Middle Eastern policies, and he refused to pass big changes like Medicare for All. But he still had good GDP growth, and his biggest mistake on foreign policy was nowhere near as bad as the Vietnam War or bombing civilians of other presidents, and Reagan's continuation of it is why it turned out so badly. Sadly, at the time he was blamed for the inflation and hostage crisis, and Reagan massacred him in 1980, bringing in the neoconservative era. Reagan, originally an actor, fully entered politics in 1964 when he endorsed Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was slaughtered by LBJ, but Reagan won the 1966 California gubernatorial election by 15% in a good year for Republicans and won re-election 4 years later. He then ran for president in 76, but lost the primary to Ford. After Ford lost to Carter, Reagan became the frontrunner in 1980 and easily won the primary in general, running with George H.W. Bush, a moderate Republican. The Republicans also took the Senate and gained House seats. Reagan became more popular after he survived an assassination attempt 2 months into his term. Though Democrats controlled the House, Reagan convinced House Speaker Tip O'Neill to pass some of his agenda. But the economy was weak in 1981 and 82, as Fed Chair Paul Volcker kept interest rates high to cut inflation. Inflation did fall from 9.4% in 1981 to 3.9% in 1983, but unemployment peaked over 10% in 1982, GDP contracted, and Reagan's approval rating fell below 40%. Democrats gained 26 House seats, though Republicans gained in the Senate. As the economy improved in 1984, Reagan's approval rating hit 55% during the general election campaign. He faced Walter Mondale, who had been Carter's VP and thus had just lost to Reagan 4 years prior. Mondale trailed in the polls, so he took a risk by nominating Geraldine Ferraro as his VP selection, the first female nominee. As only a 3-term representative, she was inexperienced, but she faced extra scrutiny due to sexism. Reagan destroyed Mondale in the second debate and went on to win it on a landslide, winning 49 states and the popular vote by 18%. But this was much more about Reagan's personal popularity in the bad Democratic ticket than support for all Republicans, as Republicans lost 2 Senate seats and only gained 16 in the House, so they had a worse position than after 1980. The economy was still strong in 1986, so Republicans only lost 4 House seats, though they lost 8 in the Senate, running against 1980 when they had gained 12. Still, Reagan left office very popular, and his vice president won in a landslide in 1988, so voters clearly liked his tenure at the time. I'll first go over the economic stats from 1973 to 2000 and see the positives and drawbacks of the economic decisions during that period. Then we'll define the overall beliefs of the two parties during the six-party system, which started with Reagan and still continues today, and then grade Reagan's term. While from 1954 to 1968 the economy grew well with only small hiccups, the Vietnam War led to a surge in inflation and economic uncertainty. The war wound down and inflation fell in 1972, but then the 1973 Arab-Israeli War caused an oil embargo. Inflation spiked and GDP stagnated in 74 and 75. 76 to 78 saw good growth, but inflation stayed high and grew further following the Iranian Revolution and more oil shortages. What we see from this is that supply shocks, here caused by foreign embargoes, both hurt GDP growth and cause higher inflation. We've seen in the last year that massively hiking tariffs has led to the GDP stagnating, while inflation has also stayed around 3%. Most economic tools available to governments that grow the GDP, such as economic stimulus, increase inflation, and those that decrease inflation, like tax hikes, spending cuts, and interest rate hikes, hurt the GDP. So there's no easy way to reduce inflation without hurting the GDP. In 1979, after a decade of high inflation, the new Fed chair Paul Volcker made reducing inflation a higher priority than GDP growth. Interest rates had been raised in 68 and 73, but not to the extent Volcker would raise them. In 1969, the rates reached 9%, and in 1974, 12%. But in 1980, they hit 17.6%, and they were also lowered much more gradually. Interest rates were around 5% from 1966 to 1979 outside of the spikes when inflation rose. But even when Volcker lowered them after 1979, they stayed above 10% and even went back to 19% in 1981. So unlike the strong growth in 1972 and 76 when interest rates were lowered, the economy remained poor in 1982, as unemployment hit 10% and GDP contracted the most since 1946 when World War II spending ended. But 1982 was also the last year of high inflation, and as interest rates were gradually lowered afterwards, the economy saw 2 decades of strong growth, outside of a minor downturn from 1989 to 91 as Cold War spending ended. Again, we see that high interest rates crush inflation but hurt the GDP. But something else changed in 1982. The debt-to-GDP ratio increased over the next 15 years after falling continuously from 1946 to 1975. One reason for this was the interest rate hikes. If inflation is higher than interest rates, then old debt becomes less expensive, as it has a negative real interest rate. This is why, even though in 1974 and 75 GDP shrunk and the US ran a deficit, the debt-to-GDP ratio fell. Inflation was 9% while interest rates were 5%, so the old debt effectively got less expensive. But by 1981, interest rates had been over 10% for years, so the past debt grew more expensive. And even in 1983 when the GDP grew, since interest rates remained high and inflation fell, the debt-to-GDP ratio increased. The rate hikes were Fed policy, not Reagan's fault. But as you can see, the yellow line of the deficit-to-GDP ratio also spiked in 1982 because of Reagan's massive tax cuts that mostly benefited the rich. The highest income tax rate went from 70% in 1981 to 28% at the end of his term, while the lowest rates changed by less than 5%. Reagan also hiked military spending from 5% of GDP in 1981 to 5.9% between 1983 and 1987. It then declined to 3% by 1998 before exploding again under Bush Jr. Reagan defenders will argue that while the tax cuts and military spending increased the debt, they also grew the GDP and won the Cold War. I'll cover the latter point later, but first let's talk about the GDP. Growth averaged 3.5% under Reagan, with a recession in 1982, recovery in 1984, and then average growth of 3.8% in his second term. This was up from 2.9% between 1968 and 1980, but the 0.6% higher GDP growth was less than the increase of the deficit, which averaged 2.2% of GDP from 1968 to 1980 and 4.4% under Reagan. And while Reagan had lower inflation, this is because he didn't have oil embargoes that plagued the previous decade, not because of his policies. Inflation went down early in his term because of high interest rates that started under Carter, and inflation increased over his last few years as president after Volcker's tenure ended in 1986. And if we compare Reagan to the Democrats before and after Carter, JFK, LBJ, and Clinton, they were all clearly better than him on the economy. JFK averaged 4.3% GDP growth, LBJ 5.3%, and Clinton 3.9%, all higher than Reagan's 3.5%. They all had lower inflation, and the debt-to-GDP ratio fell under the first two, while Clinton inherited large deficits but then handed off a surplus to Bush Jr. As you can see, the deficit peaked in 1992, just before Clinton, then declined continuously until the budget was balanced in 2001 before Bush's tax cuts and wars. Now, if the GDP didn't grow more under Reagan because of the massive deficits and tax cuts, where did all that money go? Into the incomes and assets of the richest Americans. When poor people get money, they put it back into the economy by spending it on goods and services. Poverty falls and GDP grows. This in economics is known as the marginal propensity to consume, which is high for poor people. But when the rich get more money, they just invest in existing assets, making it harder for everyone else to buy stocks or homes. While median wages have barely kept up with inflation since 1980, the top 1% have seen their income skyrocket, and the stock market has grown faster than the GDP. This shows that if you're in the top 1%, you should vote for Republicans, as they'll give you massive tax cuts and increase the value of your assets. But if you have a median income or want to see the country as a whole prosper, Democrats will deliver higher average GDP growth and have lower deficits than Reaganomics. The highest tax rates were in the 70s under JFK and LBJ, and Clinton raised them from the lows under Reagan, and the economy grew faster and more evenly under them than under Republicans. Large deficits don't necessarily mean GDP will grow more. They could just mean the rich are getting richer. Now that we've seen the economic beliefs of the two parties, let's discuss their other beliefs during the sixth-party system. Like the fifth-party system, which took over from the fourth gradually from 1928 to 1938, the sixth-party system also doesn't have a clear start date. Some would say it started in 1968 after LBJ's term ended, but I think Nixon and Ford, while obviously right-wing, were different from the Republican presidents since then in some important ways. So I think it started in 1980 with Reagan's victory over Carter. And its end date is also in doubt. I would argue it's still going on today, while others argue Trump has changed politics so much that the new system began in 2016. We'll have to see what the GOP is post-Trump to know which changes are permanent and which are temporary. For the leaders of their parties, Republicans were defined by the philosophy of Reagan, who they uphold as a great president, and congressional leaders like Newt Gingrich and Mitch McConnell. And obviously, if you agree this party system is still ongoing, Trump has led the Republicans over the last decade. Since Reagan, moderate nice guy Republicans like Dole and McCain have lost, and Bush Sr., who won once, faced a serious primary after raising taxes and lost re-election. But Trump won again after losing and leading a terrorist attack on the US Capitol. Republican voters have not wanted moderates since 1980. And if you think Trump's attempts to steal the 2020 election make him way different to prior Republicans, that's false. Not only did Nixon get impeached for cheating while stealing an election, but Reagan colluded with Iran in 1980, and Bush Jr. arguably stole the 2000 election. This is why I view Trump as a logical continuation of the party of Nixon, Reagan, and Bush Jr., not an aberration. Democrats lost the first three presidential elections of this era before winning with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Both were young, charismatic speakers who connected to voters of diverse political beliefs and won convincingly. The other Democrat to win since 1980, Joe Biden, is now a disgraced loser who let Trump come back into office. This shows that with their current policy beliefs, Democrats only win big with inspiring candidates. Others may win the 1% of suburban swing voters, but Dems must turn out minority and young voters to win. Their main congressional leader was Nancy Pelosi, who, while not that left-wing, was able to get laws passed. The economic beliefs of the Republicans have been to cut taxes to the wealthy and deregulate to make big business happy as they deny climate change, a far cry from the 91% top tax rates under Eisenhower and the creation of the EPA under Nixon. They have also massively increased military spending, as all wars of this period started under Republicans. When Democrats are in power, Republicans then complain about the large debt and deficits created by their own policies. Democrats have also been more right-wing than during the fifth-party system. Their biggest accomplishment, Obamacare, was just Nixon's plan, not universal health care like Truman and Ted Kennedy wanted and what LBJ was leading to. They did pass stimuli following the 2008 and COVID recessions, but no major welfare program like LBJ's, and tax rates remain well below pre-Reagan levels. And Dems sided with Republicans on the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. The main change since 2016 has been on tariffs. This gained relevance after NAFTA, which Reagan, Bush Sr., and Clinton supported, and passed Congress with bipartisan support. Ross Perot spoke out against it in 1992, but the economy was strong under Clinton, the US only has minor trade deficits with Canada and Mexico, and Trump's 2018 renegotiation had few changes. Tariffs against China have been more popular, as GDP growth has been slower and unemployment higher after China's 2001 entry into the WTO than under Clinton. And while the overall trade deficit in 1997 was $100 billion, the US trade deficit with China alone was more than that after 2001, peaking at $400 billion in 2018. Obama tried to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a large bloc that didn't include China to diversify import sources, but Trump canceled that and instead used tariffs. During his first term, these were mostly small and only on a few items, like steel and washing machines. Biden kept those in place and then raised tariffs on solar panels and electric vehicles, and now tariffs have been more aggressive in Trump's second term on all countries. So while I don't think this makes it a new party system, it is a clear evolution over the last decade. Overall, both parties have been well to the right of where they were during the fifth party system. On social policy, the two parties moved in opposite directions. Republicans became more pro-gun after the 1994 assault weapons ban, and their Supreme Court nominees made the terrible D.C. versus Heller decision in 2008, where they ignored the text of the Second Amendment and pretended the words well-regulated militia didn't exist. The court also overturned Roe v. Wade in 2022 and made affirmative action unconstitutional in 2023. Republicans floated a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage, though the Supreme Court made it legal in 2015, continued the war on drugs, and opposed any police reform or DEI. Democrats have failed to pass federal laws on these issues, and most of them didn't even support gay marriage until it was legal, but since 2016, they've been more openly supportive of these issues. Critics now call them woke, believing they focus more on these issues where the party is united than on economic ones where they don't really believe in anything, but these beliefs still help the party win the vast majority of Black and LGBT voters. Immigration is one area where Trump did change things. Earlier, both parties were moderate, with Reagan's Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 giving amnesty to millions of illegals, and then Democrats largely voting for the Secure Fence Act of 2006 under Bush. But after failed bipartisan negotiations between Obama and the Republican House, Trump went far right and is illegally sending people to a slave labor prison in El Salvador, using ICE to murder American citizens, and the Supreme Court is considering overturning the 14th Amendment's birthright citizenship clause. Republicans have dominated among white Christians and rural voters throughout this period, and thus have won white Southerners for Congress since 1994 and president since 2000. Democrats continue doing well with minorities and city dwellers to win the Northeast and also dominate the West Coast. Since 2016, Democrats have gained amongst wealthy and suburban voters and have won states like New Hampshire, Virginia, and Colorado every year since 2008. But they lost margins with Hispanics and urban voters and have had less success in Nevada, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The first 5 elections in this period were landslides where the winner received over 370 electoral votes, but the ones since 2000 have been much closer, with even 2008 Obama only winning 365. And Congress has kept the presidents in check. The only time the president's party held the House for over 2 years was in 2002, when Republicans benefited from the post-9/11 war fever. 1994, 2006, 2010, and 2018 saw the president's party get destroyed in the House, and Democrats held the House for the entirety of Reagan and Bush Sr.'s terms. The Senate has gone back and forth, with both parties controlling it for 22 years between 1980 and 2024. With all that background, let's now cover Reagan's term in full detail and see his lasting right-wing legacy that lives on today. I'll start with the economy, which we covered 2 slides ago. Reagan's 1981 tax cut lowered rates by 3% for those earning under $70,000 in today's money, and by 20% for those earning over $300K. The capital gains tax fell from 28% to 20%, and the estate tax exemption tripled, letting Nepo babies inherit more money. The corporate tax cuts were more progressive, as they only cut the rates for the first $200,000 in today's money. But overall, this massively helped the rich while everyone else got crumbs. After Reagan's landslide re-election, another tax cut passed in 1986. It made it so there were only 2 income tax rates, one at 15% and one at 28%, and increased the earned income tax credit and standard deduction, but also removed many itemized deductions and increased the capital gains rate back to 28%. More people now owed 0 in taxes. Most in the middle class paid about the same and had an easier time filing taxes. Some small business owners who abused loopholes paid more, and the highest earners paid less. So still not great, but far better than the first one. As we saw, these reduced government revenue, thus leading to massive deficits and the first growth in the debt-to-GDP ratio since World War II. On the spending side, Reagan cut welfare benefits while increasing military spending. Programs like food stamps, school lunch, and other federal education aid, Medicaid, and social housing were cut. Reagan also proposed privatizing or cutting Social Security in 1981 and later attempted to purge the disability rolls, but Congress and the public refused, so after the 1982 midterms, he agreed to raise payroll taxes and made it so rich old people paid taxes on Social Security, a bipartisan deal that kept it solvent. The macro results of these decisions weren't great. After 1982, inflation fell and growth was good, though as we covered, the results were still worse than most surrounding Democrats. And as the cuts disproportionately favored the wealthy, income inequality skyrocketed. In his first term, incomes grew by 9% for the top 20%, only 1% for the middle class, and the bottom quintile saw their incomes fall. The poverty rate stopped falling, the minimum wage was left untouched for the first time, and homelessness doubled between 1984 and 1987. Reagan also passed a lot of deregulation. Stock buybacks were made legal, letting companies pay back shareholders and let executives earn bonuses rather than reinvest in the business for long-term growth. The 1982 Depository Institutions Act deregulated banks, and it plus high interest rates led to many going broke. October 1987 also saw a stock market crash of 22% in one day, the worst ever. Reagan was also mostly bad on the environment. He removed Carter's windfall taxes on oil companies, cut EPA research into acid rain and global warming, relaxed fuel efficiency standards, vetoed clean water regulation, though Congress overrode his veto, opened federal lands to oil drilling, and even removed Carter's solar panels from the White House. But he agreed to the Montreal Protocol, which banned CFCs to repair the ozone hole, allowed companies to give tax-free money to employees for public transit, and more than doubled the gas tax with the 1982 Surface Transportation Act, with some of the revenue going towards public transit. Finally, Reagan was anti-union. He used the Taft-Hartley Act and fired over 10,000 air traffic controllers in 1981, and his National Labor Relations Board appointees also approved of private sector firings of striking workers. So in economic policy, Reagan definitely took the country in the wrong direction with the increased income inequality and deficits. But his tax cuts had good portions. He did things like raise the gas tax, and the GDP grew while inflation fell, so I can't give him a major negative. But on social policy, I find fewer bright spots. Reagan appointed 4 Supreme Court justices. 2 were staunch conservatives in Antonin Scalia and William Rehnquist, and 2 were moderates, Sandra Day O'Connor and Anthony Kennedy. The court moved more to the right after 2000 than after 1980, but one major decision under Reagan was Bowers versus Hardick, which criminalized gay sex. Reagan argued for blatantly unconstitutional prayer in schools, ignored the AIDS crisis as deaths hit tens of thousands per year, and refused to promote condoms due to his religious beliefs. He also ramped up the war on drugs in a racist manner, as the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine passed under him. The prison population doubled from 0.2% of the population in 1980, where it had been since 1940, to over 0.4% by the end of his tenure. Other racist moves included vetoing the Civil Rights Restoration Act and supporting the lawsuit by segregated and religious schools who wanted federal support and tax breaks. But one area where Reagan was moderate was immigration. The 1986 Immigration Reform Act gave millions amnesty while placing penalties on businesses who knowingly hired them. Still, Reagan's overall social policy was poor, and his foreign policy was also mostly bad. Military budgets went from 5% of GDP to 6% in his first term, with the increase going into various initiatives. One was a renewed nuclear buildup. After dropping every year from 1974 to 1982, the US nuclear arsenal increased under Reagan, and newer nukes were more powerful and expensive than older ones. The US already had enough nukes for every major city in the USSR, so this was completely pointless. Arguably worse was the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to intercept incoming nuclear weapons. This was not only extremely costly and technologically unfeasible, but also violated arms treaties with the USSR and made war more likely. If a country has nukes as a deterrent, other countries won't attack it. But by threatening to remove this deterrent, Reagan just made it more likely that the USSR would strike the US before the shield was completed. Reagan also increased spending on traditional weapons, such as bombers and ballistic missiles, and he massively increased arms exports to questionable regimes. Carter had begun arms sales to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, but Reagan ramped them up, sending tens of billions of dollars to them, and he even invited their leaders to the White House. These sales did stretch the USSR's resources, as they lost the war and collapsed soon after, but the Taliban and Al-Qaeda emerged afterwards and went on to commit many terrorist attacks, including, of course, 9/11 against the US. So this policy worked in the short run, but was horrific in the long run. Reagan also continued supporting Zia-ul-Haq's dictatorship in Pakistan, further pushing India towards the USSR, as well as dictatorships in Indonesia, Cambodia, and the Congo. In the Philippines, Reagan supported Ferdinand Marcos after he assassinated an opposition leader and rigged an election. A popular uprising forced Marcos out of office, and Reagan then allowed him in the US. Another dictator Reagan backed that previous presidents hadn't was Somalia's Siad Barre, who had recently invaded communist Ethiopia. Beyond that war, Barre also killed over 200,000 Somalis in what's known as the Hargeisa Holocaust, when he used US-supplied bombs on his own people. Reagan was worse than Carter on South Africa. He put an arms embargo on them, but only after outcry by the public in Congress, and vetoed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, though it was overridden. Reagan's Middle East policy was also worse than Carter's. He intervened in the Lebanese civil war that began under Ford, sending troops there as a peacekeeping force, but after hundreds of them were killed in a suicide bombing, the rest were promptly withdrawn. Reagan also continued giving Israel billions in aid every year, signed a free trade deal with them, and designated them as a major non-NATO ally. But he did stop cluster munitions sales to them and threatened a total arms embargo to get them to stop bombing Lebanon before he sent US troops there. Whereas Middle East policy was really terrible was the Iran-Iraq war. After the Iranian Revolution, Iraq invaded Iran to try to seize their oil fields. Iran was winning early on, so Reagan removed Iraq from the state sponsor of terror list in order to send them arms. Saddam Hussein was already in power in Iraq, and he used chemical weapons on Iran during the war and later on the Kurds in his own country before attacking Kuwait under Bush's term. Iraq then took the lead in the war, but Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed faction in Lebanon, had taken Americans hostage. So Reagan illegally sold Iran missiles to free the hostages without congressional approval. The admin then broke the law again as they then routed the money to the right-wing drug cartels in Nicaragua who were fighting against the communist ruler Daniel Ortega. This was not only illegal, but also counter to the domestic anti-drug narrative the administration was pushing, and 3 cabinet members were prosecuted. The Iran-Iraq War then became a stalemate, and in its last year, the US downed a commercial flight between Tehran and Dubai, killing 290 civilians. So Reagan made a ton of bad decisions in this conflict. His policy in other Latin American countries was also poor. He supported brutal right-wing regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala, despite human rights abuses by both, and invaded Grenada in 1983, something even Margaret Thatcher, a fellow neoconservative, decried. Nicaragua successfully sued the US at the International Court of Justice for placing mines in their waters, but the US used its veto to avoid paying. But Reagan's foreign policy became more reasonable in 1985 when Mikhail Gorbachev became the new leader of the USSR. He was not a hardline communist like his predecessors and knew the USSR was weakened. The war in Afghanistan had stretched their resources thin, and as Iran and Iraq increased oil exports to pay for their war, Russian oil revenues dropped. Gorbachev began liberalizing the USSR in 1986 and began withdrawing from Afghanistan in 1987. Reagan then changed his tone and moved more towards negotiations. The two signed arms treaties in 1987, and Reagan even visited Moscow in 1988. Military spending declined from 6% of GDP in 1986 to 5.5% in 1989, before then falling much more once the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended under Bush Sr. So Reagan was not completely against the Soviets and recognized when they were willing to negotiate. Trade was a mixed bag. Reagan got along well with fellow conservative Brian Mulroney in Canada, and talks began that eventually led to NAFTA. But he was upset with Japan's car industry and trade surplus with the US. At the 1985 Plaza Accords, he made it so the yen's value appreciated. This reduced the US trade deficit, but inflation went from 2% in 1986 to 4% in 1989, and Japan's economy crashed soon after and hasn't recovered since. So this policy definitely hurt Japan, and may have hurt the US as well. Overall, Reagan was also a negative on foreign policy. His rapport with Gorbachev was good at ending the Cold War, but his funding of dictators and massive military spending increases were clearly bad. I also view him as bad on the economy and social policies, so he goes well below average indeed. He can't go below people like Hoover who crashed the economy or the most pro-slavery presidents, but he definitely moved the US in the wrong direction economically, with income inequality and the debt spiking starting with him, and his foreign policy not only made many third world countries worse off, but was also bad for the US as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were founded. But he left office popular and was succeeded by his VP, George H.W. Bush. Despite being the VP of a popular administration, Bush wasn't necessarily favored in the 1988 Republican primaries. In fact, no sitting VP had won the presidency since Van Buren in 1836, and none has since Bush. As Bush was a more moderate Republican, he made campaign promises to win over farther-right voters. One was the phrase, "Read my lips, no new taxes," a pledge he would later break. Bush actually finished third in Iowa behind Senator Bob Dole and Christian fundamentalist pastor Pat Robertson, but went on to win most of the remaining states handily. Bush ran with Indiana Senator Dan Quayle, who was only 41 at the time, and faced Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. Dukakis led in early polls, but had a strange photo op of himself in a tank, terrible debate performances, and failed to respond well to attack ads, so he ended up losing in a landslide. Still, it was closer than either of Reagan's victories. Congress barely changed, as Democrats gained 2 House seats while the Senate remained the same. The Cold War began ending in 1989 as the Berlin Wall fell and the economy remained strong, so the Democrats only gained 7 House seats and 1 Senate seat in the midterms. The one independent elected was Bernie Sanders. Bush then won the Gulf War in 1991 in just 3 months, and his popularity skyrocketed. But the economy hit a rough patch later that year, and while it largely recovered in 1992, voters were still unhappy. Bush also faced a primary challenge from Pat Buchanan, who was mad as Bush raised taxes and was not far right. Bush beat him fairly easily, but lost the general election to Bill Clinton in a 3-way race with Ross Perot. Bush was still quite popular, and Republicans gained 9 House seats and only lost 1 Senate seat in 1992. But Clinton was just more charismatic, ran a good campaign, and successfully appealed enough to liberals, moderates, Southerners, and minorities. Now let's see if Bush's popularity was warranted. We'll start with foreign policy and the end of the Cold War. Like Reagan, Bush got along with Gorbachev. He praised the USSR's gradual opening of its economy and social freedoms, but he still pressured them and other communist countries to further liberalize. Bush offered Poland financial assistance if they allowed elections, and they obliged. After the Communist Party lost the elections, Bush visited Poland in July 1989 and gave them aid and loans. Poland's PM Lech Wałęsa visited the US in 1991, and the countries have been allies ever since. Even more dramatic was the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989. Bush refrained from celebrating immediately as he was to meet with Gorbachev in December. But by September 1990, German reunification was agreed on. Germany joined NATO and Soviet troops left the East in exchange for German aid to the Soviet Union. Bush remained quiet while Eastern European countries declared independence from the USSR and deposed their communist leaders, as he was again in talks with Gorbachev. They both reduced their troop counts in Europe and signed the START Treaty, which led to their nuclear stockpiles halving. US military spending went from 5.5% of GDP in 1989 to 4.3% in 1993, and the Cold War fully ended in December 1991 when the USSR collapsed. Bush's peaceful strategy worked. As the Cold War ended without any direct conflict between the US and USSR, Germany was reunified, and Eastern Europe democratic and independent. But Bush was too optimistic in dealing with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. As the USSR was breaking up, Yeltsin brutally attacked Chechnya and sent troops to Moldova. But Bush nevertheless increased exports to Russia and spoke of possible peaceful relations, even though Yeltsin was far more belligerent than Gorbachev. Similarly, Bush didn't intervene much in the Yugoslav wars. Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic backed generals like Ratko Mladic in Croatia and Bosnia. The US first failed to take a side, and the initial UN arms embargo hit all sides, just helping the more heavily armed Serbians. While in 1992 sanctions were placed on Serbia, the US didn't intervene militarily, and tragedies like the siege of Sarajevo and Srebrenica massacre took place. Where Bush was much more decisive was the Gulf War. Iraq was broke after its war with Iran, so it invaded its tiny neighbor Kuwait in 1990s to seize Kuwait's oil. The US and USSR agreed in the UN Security Council to allow force against Iraq. A multilateral coalition led by the US mainly used its air force and suffered minimal casualties and won the war in only 3 months. And Bush did not pursue regime change and allowed Saddam to stay in power. This was questioned at the time, but the chaos after his son invaded Iraq and toppled Saddam made it clear this was the correct decision. The US also made sure Israel did not fight Iraq in order to keep Arab countries like Saudi Arabia happy. But Palestinians were being illegally occupied by Israel in increasingly brutal ways, as Reagan had completely backed Israel. As a result, Palestinians began protesting, sometimes violently, in what we call the First Intifada. The US kept siding with Israel by vetoing UN resolutions, and while after the Gulf War Bush scheduled some peace talks, nothing changed. Bush was more different from Reagan with South Africa, as he ensured Mandela was released from jail and invited him to the White House. Bush also ended aid for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and Nicaraguan rebels. After the latter aid ended, the US indicted Reagan-backed Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega on drug charges. In 1989, Noriega rigged the Panamanian election, and then in December, a US troop was killed by Panama. Bush then invaded the country and extradited Noriega. Very few US casualties occurred, but this was illegal under international law. The US only had the right to intervene in the Canal Zone, not all of Panama. Another iffy situation was Somalia. Reagan-backed dictator Siad Barre fell in 1991, and the country fell into chaos. In late 1992, Bush sent US troops there to administer aid, but these troops were then attacked under Clinton. The country has still never been stable 3 decades later, and the simple solution of recognizing Somaliland's independence was not done. So these two were bad interventions. We'll end the foreign policy section with US policy towards its major trade partners. After the USSR collapsed, there was hope that China would also have to liberalize more. After Mao's death, the economy opened up and millions escaped poverty every year. But the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre, where hundreds of peaceful protesters were killed, ended hope for major political reform. Bush suspended arms sales to China, but no major sanctions stayed long-term, and trade between the countries continued to increase. China hasn't become democratic since, and trade with them arguably hurts US jobs, so I view this as a mistake. Bush got along better with US allies than Reagan. Trade with Japan resumed, and while their real estate bubble crashed, GDP stabilized and they only had 2 years of negative GDP growth until 2008. US inflation also went down from 3.9% in 1989 to 2.3% in 1992. Bush also negotiated NAFTA in 1992, though it became law under Clinton. Trade with these Democratic allies was definitely mutually beneficial. So overall, Bush was slightly positive on foreign policy. His peaceful strategy worked with the USSR and East Germany, but backfired with China and Yugoslavia. And his intervention in the Gulf War was a huge success, but the deployments in Somalia and Panama were wrong. While one can certainly second-guess some of his decisions, winning the Cold War while cutting the military budget and avoiding direct conflict with Soviet troops certainly deserves credit. Now to his domestic policy. As I covered under Reagan, while the GDP continuously grew after 1982, the economy had showed signs of weakness. Inflation was up to 4% in 1989, and the savings and loan crisis had begun after deregulation of banks under Reagan. Bush proposed a bailout of the industry, but also called for more regulation, and Congress agreed. Reagan also left massive deficits, which Congress now wanted to solve. Bush had campaigned against tax increases and proposed budget cuts, but agreed to a 3% income tax hike for those making over $170,000 a year in today's money, and to take the gas tax from 9 to 14 cents per gallon. These were very reasonable places to raise more revenue. But between the after effects of the savings and loans crisis, another oil price increase after Iraq invaded Kuwait, interest rate hikes to 9% to deal with the higher inflation, and military spending cuts, GDP growth fell below 2% in 1990 and went negative in 1991. Congress didn't take major action besides longer unemployment insurance. But oil prices fell after the Gulf War, and interest rates fell to 4% by January 1992. Inflation then fell to 2%, and GDP grew by 3.5% in 1992. Unfortunately for Bush, he didn't receive credit for the recovery and lost the 1992 election, but his decisions were fine. He agreed to raise the minimum wage to $4.25 an hour, but had vetoed an increase to $4.55. Bush strongly pushed for and signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, which forces public buildings to be accessible and provides job protections for the disabled. But he vetoed bills that would make employers offer parental leave and vacation days. After a 1989 mass shooting, Bush banned the importation of semi-automatic rifles. This angered the NRA, but domestic semi-automatics were still produced, so it had little effect. Bush was good on the environment, as he updated the Clean Air Act to end acid rain, increased penalties from oil spills, and raised the gas tax. He also signed the Immigration Act of 1990, which created skilled visa categories like H-1Bs and humanitarian ones like TPS while increasing overall caps. But his worst domestic action was the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court. Not only is Thomas an ultra-conservative who I strongly disagree with in his decisions, he was also accused of sexual harassment by Anita Hill in his previous role in government. His Supreme Court confirmation vote was the closest successful nomination in a century. Bush also ignored the Supreme Court when he signed a law to ban flag burning right after the Supreme Court clarified that the First Amendment protects it, and proposed an amendment to Congress to specifically outlaw it. Bush also continued Reagan and Nixon's war on drugs, and after he lost the 1992 election, he gave out many extremely partisan pardons, including to those implicated in the Iran-Contra scandal. So overall, Bush was a slight negative domestically. While his economic policy was fine and he was good on the environment, he was still very right-wing in some social policies, and Clarence Thomas on the court has caused a ton of damage to the country. But his positive foreign policy makes him overall be an average president in the C tier. Now to the first Democrat to win multiple presidential elections since FDR, Bill Clinton. Clinton was the governor of Arkansas when running for president in 1992, and was not that well known going into the Democratic primary. He didn't win any of the first four contests, as California Governor Jerry Brown won Maine, Paul Tsongas of Massachusetts won New Hampshire, and Midwesterners won Iowa and South Dakota. But Clinton dominated southern states and rode his momentum to a fairly decisive primary win. Clinton picked fellow Southerner Senator Al Gore from Tennessee as his running mate. Gore brought foreign policy experience to the ticket and was a favorite of the environmental left. The two faced Bush and the third-party candidacy of Ross Perot in the general election. As the economy remained mediocre and the success of the Gulf War wore off, Clinton took the polling lead in August and never relinquished it. He swept the Northeast, Pacific Coast, and Midwest and had a decent showing in the South. Compared to the last Democratic win in 1976, Clinton did a bit worse in the South, but was much better in the West and a bit better in the Midwest and Northeast. Clinton was the first Democrat to win states like California, Illinois, New Jersey, Vermont, and New Hampshire since 1964, and they've all been blue every year since except for New Hampshire in 2000. The billionaire Perot ran against NAFTA and the deficit and spent millions on ads and TV broadcasts. He ended with a respectable 19% of the popular vote, but won 0 states and only finished second in 2. Bush was viewed as stronger on foreign policy, but with the Cold War over, voters cared more about the economy. The House and Senate saw only minor changes. Clinton's first 2 years were much more left-wing than Carter's. He signed gun control laws, increased taxes on those making over $250,000 a year in today's money, and tried to pass major healthcare legislation. But even though the economy was strong, Republicans gave 54 House seats in 1994 to win it for the first time in 40 years and won 9 Senate seats. And after the election, 2 senators switched parties, making the total swing 11. How did they manage this? Well, Perot endorsed Republicans across the country, so his support helped. And Republicans ran on social issues and overwhelmingly won Christian conservative voters in the South, further continuing the party switch that started in 1964. The Senate gains included both Tennessee seats, Texas, Oklahoma, and a party switch in Alabama. Democrats have not won any of these since, even as they gained Senate seats in the next 3 elections with this map. Clinton had to compromise with the Republican Congress and thus was more centrist in the next 2 years. As the economy remained strong, incumbents of all parties did well in 1996. Clinton won re-election easily against Bob Dole of Kansas and Perot again. Dole was a nice guy, but was 23 years older than Clinton, and Perot got less than half as many votes as 4 years prior. Democrats net gained 3 House seats, gaining in the West and Northeast to overcome further losses in the South, and lost Senate seats in Mississippi and Arkansas. Over the next 2 years, Congress attempted to impeach Clinton for having an affair with the White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. But this was viewed by the public as a distraction and overreach. Clinton's approval ratings hit 60%, Democrats gained House seats in 1998, The first midterm since 1934 where the president's party gained seats, and the Senate was a wash. Clinton remained popular during the 2000 election. Democrats took back the Senate, but Gore lost a close and controversial election to George Bush Jr. Clinton's legacy nowadays varies drastically from person to person. Some Republicans hate him and his wife, while others think he was the last good Democratic president, and all since have been far left. Centrist Democrats see his electoral success and economic performance as something to learn from, while leftists see him as when the Democrats became fully corporate and Republican-like. Let's find out why and where I end up. In the 8 years before Clinton took office, GDP growth and inflation averaged 3%, while the debt-to-GDP ratio grew from 34% to 56%. But over his 8 years, GDP growth averaged 3.9%, inflation was just 1.9%, and the debt-to-GDP ratio fell. How did he do this? In 1993, Congress passed a budget that raised taxes in as progressive a way as possible. Income taxes were only raised on those making over $250,000 a year in today's money, and the Medicare payroll tax cap was lifted, so billionaires no longer paid the same amount as the middle class. The gas tax was also raised and has not been raised since, even when Obama and Biden had trifectas. And military spending fell from 4.6% of GDP in 1992 to 3.3% in 1996. All of these were good moves, as they balanced the budget without hurting the economy. Now to what grew it. In 1993, NAFTA passed, increasing trade with Canada and Mexico. It also included environmental and labor standards to avoid a race to the bottom. This clearly lowered inflation, as it fell every year after 1993 until reaching 1.1% in 1998, easily the lowest inflation since the Vietnam War. Inflation only went over 2.5% in 2004 when the Canadian dollar grew in value, thus making imports more expensive. The impact on unemployment is more debated, but US unemployment went from 6.5% in 1993 to 3.9% in 2000, and GDP growth was strong. Clinton also increased trade with China, and they joined the WTO in 2001, despite their failures to democratize. The trade deficit with China went from $30 billion in 1993 to $83 billion in 2001, and then further grew to $270 billion a year before the Great Recession. While most economists are against almost all tariffs, it's possible this led to slower GDP growth after 2000, although as mentioned, the deficit worsened after Clinton left office. But these figures don't include services trade balance, which the US has a large surplus in, especially in the tech sector. These jobs greatly expanded under Clinton, and while there was a brief dip in 2001, today the industry fuels much of the US economy. The government played a role by increasing funding for technology in schools and libraries, scientific funding, and other programs related to the internet. Other policies to grow the economy included expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, which benefits the poor and encourages working, and increasing SNAP funding while cutting farm subsidies, ensuring welfare goes to people, not big companies who bribe politicians. After Republicans won Congress in 1994, Clinton had to move a bit to the right, but he rejected their worst proposals. He refused to sign a budget that cut Medicare to fund tax cuts for the wealthy, and after a brief shutdown, Congress relented. Compromises included work requirements and lifetime caps on some welfare for a higher minimum wage hike and child tax credit, and lower capital gains taxes for higher tobacco taxes. The poverty rate went from 15% in 1993 to 11% in 2000, so Clinton's policies helped the poor and strongly grew the GDP. On healthcare, Clinton had some successes and some failures. While Congress was Democratic, rather than support Medicare for all or even a public option, he had his wife Hillary try to write a more modest bill to get to 60 Senate votes. But the eventual plan was an overcomplicated mess of regulations that Congress rejected and many businesses disliked. The health insurance lobby also spent a lot of money against Democrats in 1994. After those midterms, large-scale reforms were off the table. But Clinton had other successes. He signed the Family and Medical Leave Act that Bush had vetoed, HIPAA, which promoted medical savings accounts, gave data protection, and let laid-off workers keep their insurance, and the Children's Health Insurance Program, which extends Medicaid to make sure all children are covered. The 2000 Medicine Equity and Drug Safety Act also cut drug prices by allowing the importation of drugs from Canada and some European countries. So he was still the best president on healthcare since LBJ. But I will criticize Clinton's financial deregulation. The 1999 Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act repealed the New Deal era Glass-Steagall law, allowing banks to make risky investments and still benefit from FDIC protections. When some of the investments failed, so did the banks, leading to the Great Recession. The Commodity Futures Modernization Act that deregulated trading, and the Community Reinvestment Act, which made banks give riskier home loans, also contributed. But Clinton was good on the environment. He ensured NAFTA had climate protections, implemented cap and trade via the Acid Rain program, and signed the Kyoto Protocol on climate change in 1998. However, this was not ratified by the Republican Senate, and they have been outright hostile to any environmental protection since. On social issues, Clinton was definitely to the left of the Republicans before him. He allowed the use of fetal tissue in medical research and vetoed a partial birth abortion ban, two things Bush Jr. did the opposite on. He also signed legislation against anti-abortion terrorists and let federally funded clinics provide abortion counseling, though they still could not carry out the procedure. Clinton was not as successful in pushing for gay rights. He wanted to allow gays to serve in the military and found a compromise known as Don't Ask, Don't Tell, where they could serve, just not openly. But in 1996, the Defense of Marriage Act that made the federal government not recognize gay marriages passed with over 80% of the vote in both the House and Senate. Clinton spoke out against the law, and in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. On that note, both of Clinton's Supreme Court appointees were firmly on the liberal wing of the court. But the policy where the modern left criticizes Clinton the most is crime. The 1994 crime bill is often framed as a racist law that was passed by white politicians to lock up minorities. Yet the truth is far different. 2/3 of black congressmen voted for it, and polls show black Americans supported it. It did introduce mandatory minimum and 3-strike laws, which increased prison sentence lengths. But it also included many great provisions. It included the assault weapons ban, and after that expired in 2004, mass shootings skyrocketed in frequency. The Violence Against Women Act and Brady handgun bill also decreased gun violence and sexual assault, as did the creation of sex offender registries. And while the law increased police funding, the money went towards community policing, which lets minorities police themselves instead of outsider racist officers. The crime rate, which had increased over the 70s and 80s, decreased throughout the 90s, and the prison population began declining in the 2000s. And in the war on drugs, Clinton shifted the money from policing towards education and treatment, and especially cut marijuana law enforcement. So while the crime bill was not perfect, the gun control provisions definitely made America safer, and it clearly wasn't viewed as racist by black people at the time. Overall, Clinton was great on domestic issues, and leftist complaints are overblown. He raised taxes on the richest Americans, something that Obama and Biden didn't do, expanded healthcare access more than anyone since LBJ, and increased funding for Medicare by removing the regressive payroll tax cap. He arguably had the strongest economic record since at least FDR, as he had robust GDP growth and a balanced budget, inflation at its lowest since JFK thanks to his trade deals, and America's economy moved into the future in sectors like technology. My only strong complaint is its deregulation. As while trade with China and parts of the crime bill were iffy, the trade deficit with China only spiked after them joining the WTO in 2001, and the crime bill had good provisions on gun control, sexual assault, and community policing. I've heard plenty of arguments about why Clinton's domestic record was bad, but I view it positively. Now to foreign policy. As mentioned, Clinton continued decreasing U.S. military spending and nuke stockpiles just as Bush Sr. had done before him. Like Bush, he still sometimes deployed troops overseas, but all of them were done legally, unlike Bush's invasion of Panama. And the first major action of his term was the removal of troops from Somalia. 19 Americans died in the Battle of Mogadishu, and after realizing the country was too fractured and controlled by warlords for any meaningful peace settlement, all American troops were withdrawn in 1994. But during the Rwandan genocide, the UN didn't vote for large-scale intervention, so the US did not send troops, and hundreds of thousands died. Clinton regretted his decision not to intervene, and then tried his best to make amends. When the UN Secretary General was up for re-election, the US used its veto and he was forced out. And during the Yugoslav wars, the US intervened much more than it had under Bush. Rather than get the whole UN in favor, the US just convinced NATO. The Bosnian War ended a year after US involvement in 1995, and the peace accords that have held until today were signed in Dayton, Ohio. Then in 1998, Serbia became increasingly brutal in its repression of the Kosovar independence struggle. NATO asked to send peacekeepers, and after Serbia refused, NATO placed sanctions and bombed Serbia. This was more questionable than the Bosnian actions, as some Serbian civilians died in the bombings, but after 3 months, Serbia withdrew troops from Kosovo and the war ended. Serbia's hyper-nationalist leader Milosevic then lost an election and peacefully left power. Sanctions were lifted, Serbia joined the UN in 2000, Kosovo declared independence in 2008, and no major fights have broken out in the Balkans since. The US also helped broker peace in Northern Ireland between the IRA and the UK. This conflict, called the Troubles, had been violent since at least 1972, with thousands of deaths caused by both IRA terrorists and UK troops. In 1994, Clinton gave Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams a visa to visit the UN in New York. Adams announced a ceasefire in August and remarked, "It wouldn't have happened at the time if the visa hadn't been granted." Clinton sent George Mitchell, an Irish-American who had just retired from being the Senate Majority Leader, to facilitate negotiations. The Good Friday Agreement was reached in 1998, and while Brexit complicated the deal, violence has never resumed. Clinton also reached peace deals in the Middle East. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli PM Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accords in September 1993. The First Intifada ended and settlement construction greatly slowed. In 1994, Jordan signed an agreement with Israel on water rights, and their peace has held since. But Rabin was assassinated by a far-right Israeli, Netanyahu became prime minister, Israel violated the Oslo Treaty and occupied Palestinian land, and has only gotten worse since. So while Clinton had the best policy since Carter in the region, issues persisted. The US also had its own minor conflicts under Clinton. Al-Qaeda bombed the World Trade Center in 1993 and US embassies in Africa in 1998, so the US bombed their headquarters in Afghanistan and Sudan in response. The US also had brief flare-ups with Iraq, bombing Baghdad after Iraq tried to assassinate Bush Sr., and sending troops to the Persian Gulf after Iraq sent troops to the Kuwait border again. Clinton named Afghanistan and Iraq as state sponsors of terror and placed sanctions, but tensions remained, and obviously Bush Jr. went much further in his term. With Russia, the US had purely peaceful relations. More arms reductions treaties were signed, and some Eastern European countries joined NATO in 1999 without an issue. Russia also didn't invade any countries under Clinton, while they had under Bush Sr. and have under every president since. Clinton also successfully negotiated with North Korea. In 1994, they signed a deal with the US where they would use less powerful nuclear reactors for power that would not be able to produce weapons in exchange for some sanctions relief. This held until Bush became more aggressive and toppled Iraq, forcing North Korea to test a nuke to avoid regime change. The US also normalized relations with its former foe Vietnam. Clinton ended the trade embargo on them, and nowadays they are closer to the US than they are to China. And US support for the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia ended, and elections were held there. In the Americas, many Haitian refugees fled to the US after a 1991 military coup. Clinton sent Jimmy Carter to negotiate with the junta while he threatened to invade. The junta took the peaceful path, and the ousted President Aristide returned in 1994. Many Cubans also fled the island for asylum in the US. Clinton tightened sanctions on Cuba, but this worsened relations and just caused more Cubans to flee. And this had negative political consequences for Democrats, especially after the 2000 Elian Gonzalez deportation case, which has a famous photo of guns drawn on a child. But overall, Clinton had a mostly successful foreign policy with negotiations in place like Northern Ireland, Israel, and North Korea, and intervention when necessary in the Balkans. He did have some failures, like worsening relations with Iraq and Afghanistan, but he was still above average on foreign policy and economic policy, and thus goes in the B tier. I view him as the best president since LBJ. But now to the election of 2000, where Clinton's Vice President Al Gore lost to George W. Bush, son of the president before Clinton. We have to start with Bill Clinton's scandals. In 1994, Republican Ken Starr was appointed to look into real estate transactions that happened back in Arkansas when Clinton was governor. That year, Paula Jones accused Clinton of sexually harassing her in 1991. Clinton settled with Jones, but while that case played out, White House intern Monica Lewinsky revealed that Clinton had sex with her. When Clinton was asked, he denied having sex with her in sworn testimony. The Republican House impeached Clinton for perjury in 1998. But the Senate fell well short of conviction, only getting 45 votes on one count and 50 on another when 67 votes are needed. Clinton's approval ratings remained in the 50s and 60s for the rest of his presidency, and Democrats gained seats in the midterms. But Gore still didn't want Clinton to campaign for him. Bill instead mostly campaigned for his wife's Senate race in New York, and only campaigned for Gore for a week. Not running closer to Clinton was a massive mistake. Gore was shut out in the South. He lost to Arkansas and Tennessee, Clinton in his home states, by 5.5 and 4 points respectively. Clinton campaigning there could have flipped those states. More drastic was West Virginia, where Bush won by 6% after Clinton had won by 15%, as coal miners hated Gore's environmentalist policies. And despite being to Clinton's left, Gore didn't consolidate the left-wing vote. The Green Party's Ralph Nader got 2.7% of the vote, up from 0.7% in 1996, including 1.6% in Florida. And Gore lost New Hampshire, a state Clinton won by 10% in 1996 and has voted Democratic ever since, including in 2004 when Bush won the nationwide popular vote. But despite all these criticisms, Gore arguably still won. The race came down to Florida, which was incredibly close. The machine recount showed Bush had won the state by 327 votes. But some of the ballot designs were extremely confusing, so Gore requested a hand recount in the most populous and Democratic counties. Bush's team then sued and argued only requesting a recount in some counties was unfair, and that there was no set standard for hand recounts, so the machine results had to stand. Bush's brother Jeb was governor of Florida, and his Secretary of State, who had also been a co-chair of Bush's Florida campaign, took his side. The Democratic Florida Supreme Court took Gore's side, so the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, who sided 5-4 with Bush. They ruled that the Florida Supreme Court could not create a standard by which to judge ballots in a hand count. Only legislatures could, and only before an election, so the machine count had to stand. Bush was thus declared the victor. But the Senate elections resulted in a 50-50 tie, as Democrats gained back many seats they lost in the 1994 red wave, including Florida, where the Democrat won by 5% and further proved Gore could have easily won the state and election. And after Bush passed his 2001 tax cut, the Republican senator from Vermont, Jim Jeffords, became an independent and caucused with the Democrats, giving them the Senate. Actual moderate Republicans like Jeffords who opposed tax cuts for the rich are now extinct. This was his last term, and Bernie Sanders won a seat in 2006. So it seemed like Bush was a controversial president who would get little passed and lose in 2004. But everything changed after 9/11. Bush's approval rating spiked, and the Afghanistan war started successfully. This, combined with the 2000 census's redistricting, making the Democratic states from Illinois to Connecticut lose seats to southern states, let Republicans gain 8 House seats. They also gained 2 Senate seats, though this was because the Democratic nominee in Minnesota and the 2000 victor in Missouri both died in plane crashes, and Republicans won those races. By the 2004 election, the U.S. was now also at war in Iraq. But John Kerry, the Democratic nominee, had voted for the war, so he had little to criticize Bush on. Bush defeated Kerry by 2.4% in the popular vote and 2% in the tipping point state of Ohio. Republicans made minor gains in the House, and only because of an illegal mid-cycle gerrymander in Texas. But they gained 4 Senate seats, flipping 5 Southern seats as the region moved right with Bill Clinton no longer the face of the Democratic Party, while Democrats flipped Illinois in a 40% landslide with the strong campaign of a young state senator named Barack Obama who opposed the Iraq War. In 2006, the economy was still decent, but it was now obvious Bush had no plan in Iraq or Afghanistan, and his response to Hurricane Katrina was abysmal. Democrats gained control of both the House and Senate. And in 2008, the economy was also poor, so Democrats further gained in the House and Senate, and Obama won the presidency in a landslide. So while Bush was incredibly popular right after 9/11 and won re-election in 2004, by the end of his term, his approval rating was only 20%, and his party was at its lowest point since 1964. Let's now find out why people hated him so much, starting with the main reason, his foreign policy in the Middle East. U.S. involvement in the Middle East started ramping up in 1979. The Iranian Revolution put an anti-American theocracy in place of the pro-U.S. Shah, and the Soviets began fighting Islamists in Afghanistan. Carter and Reagan armed the Afghan rebels, and Reagan also armed both Iran and Iraq so they could weaken each other. The Iran-Iraq War ended in 1988. The USSR fully withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, and then collapsed in 1991. But the region didn't stabilize. Iraq, running low on money, invaded Kuwait to try to take their oil, and was soundly defeated by US-led forces. When Bush Sr. visited Kuwait in 1993, Iraq tried to assassinate him. Clinton bombed them in retaliation, after which they mostly remained quiet. But Afghanistan became a bigger issue. While the Taliban are a Pashto nationalist group who operate just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, they allowed other Islamist groups to operate in their country. One was Al-Qaeda, who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993 and attacked US bases in Saudi Arabia and embassies in Africa in 1998. Clinton retaliated in Afghanistan and Sudan, where Al-Qaeda also had headquarters until 1996. But then came the 9/11 attacks. 4 US planes were hijacked by Al-Qaeda. 2 took down the Twin Towers in New York and produced most of the 3,000 casualties. 1 hit the Pentagon but caused limited damage, and the 4th was headed for the White House, but was crashed by its heroic passengers who had by then found out about the other attacks. In response, the US triggered Article 5 of NATO for the only time and passed the Authorization for the Use of Military Force Against Terrorists, or the AUMF. Bush's approval rating skyrocketed to 90% in the immediate aftermath. The US gave an ultimatum to the Taliban to evict al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, but after no action was taken, they invaded in October 2001. Within a month, the US took control of the capital Kabul, but bin Laden escaped across the border into Pakistan. The US kept troops in Kabul and increased aid to the new government, but things soon worsened. The Taliban gained new recruits who opposed the American occupation, and by 2006, they began regaining ground. Bush designated Pakistan as a major non-NATO ally in 2004, despite the fact that they did little to stop terrorism. Bin Laden was found there in 2011, closer to the capital than the Afghan border, and a Pakistani terrorist group, Lashkar-e-Taiba, committed the 26/11 attacks in Bombay in 2008. And worse than Afghanistan was the Iraq War. Bush called Iraq, Iran, and North Korea the axis of evil, and said none should obtain weapons of mass destruction. UN inspectors went to Iraq in late 2002 and didn't find any proof of WMDs. But the US invaded anyway in March 2003 with the support of a few other countries, mainly the UK. Baghdad was taken by May. Bush delivered his mission accomplished speech on an aircraft carrier and claimed all major operations would cease, and Saddam was captured in December. At this point, the war was still fairly popular, and Bush won re-election in 2004. But soon it was clear that Saddam never had WMDs and had nothing to do with 9/11. And after the US dismissed the entire Iraqi government, many of the fired employees began fighting against the US. Both wars were clearly unpopular by the 2006 midterms. In 2007, Bush announced a surge of troops in both wars and vetoed a military spending bill that also set a deadline for withdrawal. He also used the AUMF to deploy US troops to other countries like Somalia. When Obama took office, he began removing troops from Iraq and fully withdrew by 2011. In 2014, when ISIS took control of much of Iraq, the US sent some troops, but mainly just funded and shared intelligence with groups like the Kurds who were fighting ISIS and carried out drone strikes. And after bin Laden was killed in 2011, Obama began leaving Afghanistan too. After the US fully left in 2021, the Taliban quickly took control, proving that the puppet government the US propped up had little actual support. Meanwhile, Bush and the UN placed sanctions on Iran in 2006, but the 2015 Iran deal relaxed them in exchange for inspectors, to ensure they weren't developing a nuke. Of course, Trump withdrew from the Iran deal in 2017, bombed some of their sites in 2025, and is now threatening war in 2026, so we'll see if any more escalation happens. After decades of fighting, the Taliban again controls Afghanistan, and while al-Qaeda is heavily weakened, new terrorist groups like ISIS have gained power. Bush's policy in these countries completely failed in their objectives. Killed hundreds of thousands of civilians and made millions more refugees, led to thousands of American deaths, and wasted trillions of dollars. There's no grade I can give him but an F-. And beyond the actual war, Bush did more heinous things. The US tortured alleged terrorists, violating the rights granted to prisoners of war in the Geneva Convention. Many went to extrajudicial prisons like Diego Garcia in the Pacific or Guantanamo Bay near Cuba, where Bush argued they didn't have constitutional protections. And one prison in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, was also very heinous. Suspects were held without specific charges or a trial and anally fed, waterboarded, or tortured in other ways. Bush defended these abuses as enhanced interrogation techniques. He refused to join the International Criminal Court as he knew the US was violating human rights laws, and Congress passed the Hague Invasion Act, which allowed the US to use any means necessary to free Americans held by the court, with only 7 Senate votes against. Bush also violated the Constitution with the Patriot Act. It allows the NSA to spy without a warrant, violating the Fourth Amendment, detain immigrants without a trial indefinitely, and wiretap with few protections. He also created the DHS and ICE, the latter of which has definitely become more notorious since Trump 10x'd its funding. Nowadays, it kidnaps and deports people to Salvadoran concentration camps and murders American citizens without due process, but it was always used to violate people's rights. After an American diplomat exposed Bush for lying about WMDs, Dick Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, outed his wife as a CIA agent. Libby was found guilty for doing so, after which Bush commuted his sentence. Bush did not care about human rights or the rule of law at all. He believed if he did something, it was definitionally correct, even invading allies like the Netherlands, let alone torturing or killing innocent Iraqis. The rest of Bush's foreign policy was also colored by the war on terror. He got along well with Tony Blair, who supported the Iraq War, and feuded with Jacques Chirac and Jean Chrétien, who opposed it. The US put bases in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Kuwait to fight the war on terror in exchange for giving them military aid and buying their oil. Bush took a harder stance than Clinton on North Korea, as he canceled Clinton's deal with them and put them in his axis of evil. This backfired, as North Korea tested a nuke in 2006 and is still a crazy dictatorship 2 decades later. Bush's policy on Russia also failed. After the US recognized Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence from Serbia in 2008 and said Georgia would soon join NATO, Russia invaded Georgia under the pretense of helping Abkhazia and South Ossetia become independent. The US did nothing to support Georgia, and Russia won the war and has occupied Georgia since. But Bush's strategy worked in Libya. Gaddafi gave up weapons and allowed inspectors, and the US relaxed some sanctions. Only after the Arab Spring a decade later was Gaddafi ousted. Bush was also worse on Israel than anyone since Nixon. He did nothing about their settlements in the West Bank, and even said nothing after an American protester, Rachel Corrie, was murdered there. And Israel fully blockaded Gaza starting in 2007, making it an open-air prison ever since. The US and UN were also slow to act during the Darfur genocide in Sudan, and hundreds of thousands died. Sudan is still in an internal civil war today, so there was no easy way to end the fighting, but just like how Clinton gets some blame for not intervening in Rwanda, Bush also gets blame here. But his biggest foreign policy success was aid to Africa in programs such as PEPFAR. US aid against malaria and AIDS saved hundreds of thousands of lives and was continued until 2025 when Elon Musk illegally ended it. Finally, Bush continued Clinton's push for free trade. Trade with China grew, as did the trade deficit, which China largely used to buy US debt. The US also increased trade with Singapore, Japan, South Korea, Jordan, Central America, and more. Trade with Mexico continued, but Bush cracked down on illegal immigration using ICE and by funding border security with laws like the Secure Fence Act. I think these trade policies were okay and don't affect Bush's score strongly in either way. But overall, he was abysmal on foreign policy. The expensive, destructive, pointless, and often counterproductive wars, violations of human rights of foreigners and Americans, and refusal to respect international law, and failures with North Korea and Russia clearly outweigh his only clear successes in PEPFAR and Libya. I give him the worst foreign policy of any president in U.S. history. Now to his domestic policy. Bush inherited a strongly growing economy and a balanced budget from Clinton, but by the end of his presidency, the GDP had tanked and the debt had doubled. In 2000 and 2001, tech stocks fell from record highs, and the whole market fell after 9/11. Unemployment also rose from 4 to 6%. The Fed then cut interest rates from 6% to 1%, and GDP growth returned to 3% in 2003 and stayed there until 2007. This slight blip wasn't Bush's fault, it was just the natural cycle of the economy. However, the deficit quickly went from 0 to 4% of GDP before further exploding after the 2008 financial crisis, and Bush was why. Military spending rose by 1% of GDP due to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and much of it was given in inflated, corrupt deals. Before he was VP, Dick Cheney was Halliburton's CEO, and they were given exorbitant billion-dollar no-bid contracts for work in Iraq. Private military contractors like Blackwater also received large contracts and committed war crimes like the Nisour Square massacre. Bush also created Medicare Part D, a program that partially privatized Medicare and wasn't allowed to negotiate drug prices until Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. It likely marginally improved care, but at huge cost to the taxpayers so Big Pharma could make money. After Democrats took Congress in 2006, they passed an expansion of the Children's Health Insurance Program, but Bush vetoed it. In all these places, Bush was only okay with increasing government spending if it went to private companies so they could rip off the taxpayer. He also tried to privatize Social Security like he had with Medicare. The program has its flaws, but the solution is to remove the payroll tax cap like Clinton did with Medicare, not kill it faster by reducing contributions. And his tax cuts in 2001 and 2003 also blew up the deficit. The highest income tax rate went from 39.6% to 35%, and lower rates fell by around 2%. This was not that uneven of a cut, but many tax cuts only benefited the asset-owning class. The capital gains tax went from 20% to 15%, making it less than half the income tax rate. The estate tax went from 60% to 35%, only benefiting Nepo babies. And pre-tax retirement accounts were expanded, a policy that mostly helps the upper middle class. All of these benefited people who were already rich much more than those who worked hard and earned income. Wealth inequality skyrocketed after these tax cuts. Even as the economy grew before 2008, the poverty rate rose to 12.5% after Clinton had cut it from 15% to 11%. And then the economy tanked in 2008. Regulation repeals under Clinton and scarce enforcement of others by Bush, and low interest rates after the 2001 recession led to a housing bubble and financial companies making risky investments. As inflation rose in 2004, interest rates went up. This hurt homeowners who had adjustable rate mortgages, and once house prices fell, many mortgages became negative value, so homeowners let them fail, and now banks were stuck with houses they had overpaid for. Bush did sign tax rebates to help poor workers, but instead of helping mortgage holders, the government instead bought up the junk bonds, giving banks cheap loans while they foreclosed on houses. While banks stopped failing by 2009, the GDP continued contracting, inequality got even worse, and hedge funds bought up millions of homes for cheap. And the bailout of the banks had no strings attached, so many bankers who had just crashed the economy received millions of dollars in bonuses from taxpayer money. So Bush's policies contributed to the crash, and his response to it was poor. Overall, he had a terrible economic policy that only favored big companies and wealthy asset holders. Poverty, inequality, and the deficit exploded, and at the end, the GDP also tanked. Bush was moderate on some social issues, but far right on others. Congress easily passed the No Child Left Behind Act on education, which increased funding for schools that met test score standards, but closed failing ones and allowed funds to go to private and charter schools. Test scores continuously climbed from 1990 to 2010, before they flatlined as the smartphone era began and school funding fell after the 2008 recession, and then fell during COVID. Since the previous trend continued, this act was likely neutral in effect. Bush tried to pass an immigration bill to give amnesty to some illegals in the country while increasing border funding, but his own party opposed it. He also signed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act that John McCain wrote that put limits on donations to political campaigns. But the Supreme Court moved far to the right after Bush's nominees, and they invalidated it in the 2010 Citizens United ruling. On guns, Bush was far right. The 2005 Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act made gun manufacturers immune from lawsuits, and the Clinton gun control laws expired. Gun deaths grew, and in 2007, Virginia Tech had the worst school shooting to that point, committed by someone who went through psychiatric treatment and was found guilty of stalking female classmates. And in the DC versus Heller and McDonald versus Chicago cases in 2008 and 2010, the Supreme Court changed the Second Amendment by ignoring the words well-regulated militia and struck down reasonable gun control laws. Other terrible Supreme Court rulings after Bush include Castle Rock v. Gonzalez, Heyer versus North Carolina, and Gonzalez versus Reich. Annual gun deaths fell by 25% under Clinton, but rose 10% under Bush and increased further after these rulings. Bush also began the Republican Party's climate change denial, as he withdrew from the Kyoto Protocol Clinton had signed and allowed drilling on federal lands in Alaska. After Democrats took Congress, Bush did sign a bill that gave $2 billion to clean energy research, but his denial of climate change and lax EPA enforcement were very bad. His response to Hurricane Katrina was also criticized, with evacuations ordered late and a federal response waiting weeks to come. Bush's Christian fundamentalist side showed on many social issues. Not only was he against gay marriage, he wanted a constitutional amendment to ban it and opposed a Supreme Court ruling that said states could not ban gay sex. He gave federal money to religious charities and ended reporting rules that made them prove the money only went to non-religious purposes in a blatant assault on separation of church and state. And he ended federal funding for stem cell research and vetoed a law that would resume it. For some miscellaneous policies, Bush signed the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act, which forces the post office to pre-fund its retirement benefits, a burden no other federal or private body has. It caused the post office to fall billions of dollars in debt for no reason. But Bush made the right decision when he vetoed the 2008 Farm Bill. Even as food prices rose in 2007 and farms made record profits, the bill gave billions in corporate welfare to mostly large farms and forced ethanol to be used in all gasoline in a major giveaway to corn farmers. Other countries that competed with U.S. food exports like India and Brazil were also mad. But Bush's veto was overridden, and the U.S. continues to subsidize farmers in a way it does with no other industries. Finally, Bush politicized the Department of Justice as he fired U.S. attorneys who didn't investigate voter fraud in 2006, a scandal that forced his attorney general to resign, and appointed Janet Rehnquist, daughter of the Supreme Court Justice, to be an inspector general. In office, she let Florida, where Bush's brother was governor, receive overpayments. And one of Bush's attorneys, Alex Acosta, gave a sweetheart deal to Jeffrey Epstein that gave him and 4 others immunity from all federal charges. It was later ruled illegal for violating the rights of victims. So in summary, given that 2 things in Bush's positive category were overridden by Congress or the Supreme Court, that leaves 1 major positive in aid programs to Africa, compared to starting pointless wars, committing torture, illegally spying on Americans, letting ISIS gain power, exacerbating inequality, corrupt government contracts, crashing the economy, bailing out banks, blowing up the deficit, destroying the planet, increased mass shootings, and being anti-gay. Safe to say that Bush goes in F- and is without question one of the 5 worst presidents ever. Bush was massively unpopular in 2008, and the Democratic presidential primary thus had many contenders. Senators Barack Obama from Illinois and Hillary Clinton from New York, and Kerry's running mate John Edwards were the main contenders. Clinton led in national polls for most of the race, but Obama was a great campaigner and won the early contest. Everyone else dropped out, and the rest of the primary remained close, but Obama narrowly won. His main advantage was that he opposed the Iraq War, while Clinton voted for it, and with Bush as reviled as he was, being principled in opposition from the beginning instead of being a flip-flopper was important. Obama picked Joe Biden, a moderate, older white Democrat, to balance his ticket. John McCain fairly easily won the Republican nomination. While he was certainly conservative, he criticized the Bush administration on issues like torture as a Vietnam veteran who had been tortured, and had voted against the 2003 tax cuts. But his vice presidential pick of Sarah Palin was poor. She had very little experience and made plenty of gaps, and would resign her governorship in Alaska in scandal a year after the election. Polls were close early, but after the economy worsened close to the election, Obama's lead grew, and he won in a landslide. In the House, Democrats gained 21 seats, and in the Senate, they flipped 8, including states they've held ever since, like Minnesota, Oregon, Virginia, and New Mexico. This gave Democrats 59 senators, and after Arlen Specter switched parties and became a Democrat, Obama now had a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, the first time any president had one since Jimmy Carter. Most of this time was spent negotiating healthcare reform and a stimulus bill. But in January 2010, the Republicans won the special election in Massachusetts after Ted Kennedy's death, taking away the filibuster-proof majority. Democrats had to pass the rest of their healthcare bill via reconciliation, and the 2010 midterms brought massive losses. The economy still hadn't fully recovered, and Obamacare had been fear-mongered about so much and hadn't had time to take effect and convince people it was good. Democrats lost an insane 64 House seats, the most in any year since 1948, and even running against 2004 when they lost 4 Senate seats, they'd lost 6 more. State elections also went terribly, and this let Republicans gerrymander the House for the 2012 elections. But by 2012, the economy had improved, the US had fully left Iraq, and bin Laden was dead. Obama faced former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. Romney had passed a plan similar to Obamacare while governor, so his attacks on it didn't land. And he seemed elitist and out of touch as Obama ran a great campaign and won fairly comfortably. Democrats gained 2 Senate seats, as they held seats in states Romney won in Missouri, West Virginia, and Montana, and picked up Massachusetts and Maine. They also won the House popular vote, But between gerrymandering and the census causing southern and southwestern Republican states to gain seats, while the Democratic Northeast and Midwest lost seats, Republicans only lost 8 House seats. Then Obama's approval rating slowly fell, and in 2014, Republicans gained 13 House seats, giving them their most there since the Great Depression, and gained 9 Senate seats to take a 4-seat majority there too. Democrats were basically wiped out in the South outside of majority black districts and cities. They had 14 fewer Senate seats and 69 fewer House seats than after the 2008 election. This was the most seats lost for a party in Congress over a presidency since Woodrow Wilson. Yes, Obama had to compromise with the Republicans after 2010, but Clinton also had a bad first midterm, yet he had a stellar economic record and good foreign policy. And in the 3 elections after 1994, Democrats gained House seats and regained the Senate, while Democrats lost more seats after 2010. Yet Obama's approval ratings rose after 2014, as he was way more liked than either 2016 candidate, and he's still fairly popular today. So it seemed like people liked his persona and speeches more than his policies. Let's dive into his term and find out why, starting with the background of the 2008 recession that helped cause the 2010 troubles. As we covered, 1993 to 2000 was a period of strong growth and small deficits, as Clinton raised taxes on the rich while growing the economy from the bottom up. Poverty fell, wages rose, and inflation stayed low. 2001's poor growth was not Bush's fault, but the deficit exploded because of his tax cuts and wars. Right-wingers claim that tax cuts for the rich cause higher GDP growth and won't even increase the debt. But this is blatantly false. The low taxes, especially on capital gains, combined with low interest rates after 2001, encouraged buying assets and speculation rather than actual hard work or wealth creation, and inequality skyrocketed. While growth was still good between 2002 and 2006, it was unsustainably fueled by government debt and asset bubbles, and unemployment never went below its 2000 level. Then as interest rates rose to deal with inflation, house prices fell as mortgages became more expensive and many loans failed. Banks also began failing, and the GDP tanked in 2008 and 2009. The government bailed out the banks and auto companies, passed a stimulus, cut payroll taxes, and extended unemployment benefits. This all ballooned the deficits, but the economy slowly recovered as unemployment fell every year until COVID. Interest rates were also cut to zero and remained there until 2016 as inflation wasn't an issue. However, even though unemployment was lower, many of these new jobs were part-time or in the gig economy and did not pay well, so GDP growth only averaged 2.4% from 2010 to 2019, far less than under Clinton. And while after the Bush tax cuts expired in 2013, the debt-to-GDP ratio grew more slowly than it had since 2007, it still grew, rather than falling like it did from 1995 to 2001. So while the economy was no longer in a recession, it was not great either, and inequality continued increasing. The Dow Jones and S&P 500, after crashing in 2008, averaged 8.5% annual growth adjusted for inflation since 2009, compared to 2% real GDP growth over the same period. And since the highest capital gains tax rate is 20%, while income plus payroll taxes are far more than that, even for the middle class, the tax system further exacerbated inequality. House prices also fell during the recession, but then grew faster than the GDP ever since. In 2020, the GDP briefly crashed due to COVID, but quickly recovered over the next 4 years. However, high inflation returned in 2022 for the first time in 40 years due to supply chain disruptions and massive deficits. The Fed raised interest rates to combat inflation, and inflation fell from its 9% peak to around 3%, but this plus the deficits caused the debt-to-GDP ratio to grow a ton. And the 2025 Big Beautiful Bill will make things worse. It cuts the top income and estate tax rates, increases SALT deductions, makes car loans tax deductible, and creates an extra tax cut just for people over 65. Meanwhile, it cuts Medicaid and removes tax credits for clean energy. It will increase energy costs, increase the deficit, cut benefits for those who need them, and further increase income inequality. Another reason for the mediocre economy since 2008 is the retirement of baby boomers and them receiving Social Security and Medicare. This will cause a lot of fiscal strain, as fewer workers have to pay for the benefits of more retirees, since fertility rates fell sharply after the boomers were born. In the past, immigrations of young workers has helped offset this, though the hostility towards immigrants of the current regime, those days may be over. Overall, GDP growth has been okay since 2000, though far worse than under Clinton. And while the COVID pandemic and aging population that have held back GDP growth have not directly been caused by government decisions, the large deficits and inequality caused by tax cuts for the rich are the goal of Republican policy and were not rectified by Obama or Biden. And both parties want asset prices to increase to help the old and rich more than they want to increase affordability for young people, exacerbating the demographic crisis and generational inequality. Bush was terrible for the economy. Obama and Trump's first term were mediocre. Biden grew the GDP but caused high inflation and deficits. And Trump's second term has so far led to stagnating GDP, lingering inflation, growing debt, and the GDP will crash if the AI bubble pops. Now let's cover Obama's decisions in full detail. As mentioned, Obama's response to the financial crisis massively increased the debt, but it did succeed in getting the GDP to grow and unemployment to fall by 2010. The 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act cut payroll taxes, increased unemployment insurance, the child and earned income tax credits, gave aid to states for education, and funded infrastructure and research projects. American automakers received billions of dollars to remain solvent, and bank bailouts continued for a bit longer, but Obama capped executive compensation at $500,000 per year for those receiving bailouts, and the bailouts were eventually repaid. The minimum wage also rose, and after Republicans won the House in 2010 and resisted further increases, Obama raised it just for federal workers. After Republicans took Congress, even though Bush's policies were the reason for the debt, hypocritical Republicans tried to force Obama to cut the deficit to get a debt limit raised. Obama offered to increase the retirement age and cut some other programs in exchange for lower military spending and higher taxes, all of which would cut the deficit. But Republicans disagreed and instead negotiated to make some of Bush's tax cuts permanent and keep the deficit high. Although the highest income tax rate went back to 39.6% from 35%, the cut stayed for those making $700,000 a year or less in today's money, thus helping plenty of rich people, as did letting the estate tax stay at 40% instead of going back to 55% for assets over $10 million in today's money. And while the capital gains tax rose from 15% to 20%, that was still far less than its 28% rate after Clinton's 1993 tax bill. Despite keeping these cuts, the debt only rose very slowly after the stimulus packages expired in 2013. I would have preferred Obama's other proposals to actually tackle the debt while raising taxes, but he was limited by Congress. And while GDP growth was mediocre, unemployment did fall every year. So overall, he was okay on the economy. But on regulation, Obama was certainly better than Clinton. He signed the Dodd-Frank Act, which reduced the ability of big banks to make risky investments and allowed the government to increase reserve requirements. It regulated the derivatives market, an opaque area which largely caused the crash when mortgages were traded, and created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which goes after financial companies for scamming their customers. No banks failed following the act, and hundreds of millions of dollars were returned to customers. After the law was weakened in 2018, some banks collapsed in 2023 for having too little cash on hand when interest rates were raised. And in 2012, the Stock Act passed. While it didn't ban congressional members from trading individual stocks, it forced them to report trades within 30 days, so it was better than nothing. These laws were certainly better than Clinton's Glass-Steagall repeal. But besides these laws, which were a response to the financial crisis and recession, Obama's main focus early in his tenure was healthcare. Early on, he overturned restrictions on stem cell research, increased cigarette taxes, and increased funding for CHIP, all Clinton-era policies that Bush had undone. But the biggest legislation was the Affordable Care Act, now just known as Obamacare. Like Clinton's proposed reform, it didn't introduce public option, let alone Medicare for all, and was most similar to Nixon's plan and Romney's plan in Massachusetts. The law instead was revenue neutral, as it introduced a tax on some healthcare plans, high earners, and penalties for not buying insurance to pay for subsidies for other health insurance plans and expanded Medicaid. It forced coverage for pre-existing conditions, allowed children to stay on their parents' insurance until 26, and forced businesses with over 40 employees to offer health insurance. It did increase coverage, as the uninsured rate fell from 20% in 2010 to 13% in 2015, but healthcare costs continued increasing by more than the regular rate of inflation even after the act. When subsidies were increased during COVID, it kept prices down for consumers, but at the cost of more government debt while ensuring insurance companies stay rich. So like Clinton, Obama improved healthcare, but didn't change the broken system. On energy and climate change, Obama was good, but hamstrung by the Republican Congress for most of his term. The 2009 stimulus bill put money towards solar panel research and electric vehicles, both of which took off over the next decade. Fuel efficiency standards were also increased, and hybrids gained in popularity. But a proposed bill for carbon pricing was rejected by Republicans, and EPA rules placed in his second term and agreements in the 2015 Paris Climate Accord were instantly undone once he left office. And U.S. oil production spiked under Obama with the fracking and shale boom. This helped keep inflation low, but obviously meant the environment was harmed, and Obama didn't raise the gas tax. So all the money for highways and other infrastructure in the stimulus bill was unpaid for. On education, the stimulus bill gave a lot of money to states, and more money was given to districts that did the best on standardized tests. First Lady Michelle Obama made reducing childhood obesity a goal of hers, so school nutrition standards were raised and exercise was emphasized more. College enrollment grew because the job market was so poor after 2008, so the government subsidized loans more. But high school test scores stalled, the unpopular Common Core standard was adopted, and college prices skyrocketed as they saw more demand and the government willing to subsidize them. Obama did place some rules requiring good graduation rates and employment statistics for colleges to qualify for loans, so he did know that funding needed to have strings attached, but it's not clear that the outcomes were necessarily improved by the extra spending. So on all of these issues, Obama was at least average, but he didn't make any fundamental changes or have exceptional results on any. On social issues, the two parties polarized a lot under Obama's presidency, so he was unable to get congressional approval for many changes after 2010. For LGBT issues, in the first 2 years, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed so gay people could openly serve in the military, and sexual orientation was added as a category for hate crimes. But after 2010, attempts to pass anti-discrimination laws failed, so Obama signed an executive order just banning discrimination by federal contractors. The Supreme Court did rule gay marriage illegal in 2015, something Obama came out in favor of in 2012. Speaking of the Supreme Court, Obama appointed justices in 2009 and 2010, but after Antonin Scalia died in 2016, the Republican Senate refused to vote on Obama's replacement, and Trump would appoint Neil Gorsuch to fill that seat instead. The court did have some liberal decisions like the one on gay marriage, but they had many horrible ones like Citizens United, Hobby Lobby, and McDonald versus Chicago, all thanks to the far-right justices the Bushes appointed. The latter case made a state-level handgun ban illegal. Obama didn't pursue any federal gun control legislation in his first 2 years, even with a large enough majority to pass an assault weapons ban. After the Sandy Hook massacre in 2012, he tried to pass universal background checks and other laws, but Congress refused. Annual gun deaths thus climbed from 32,000 in 2010 to 40,000 in 2017. This was much worse than the 25% drop under Clinton, caused by laws he prioritized in his first 2 years. But Obama de-escalated the war on drugs by more than Clinton. He ended federal enforcement of medical marijuana laws, and after some states fully legalized the drug, federal enforcement on that declined as well. Using his pardon power, Obama also commuted federal sentences of thousands of nonviolent drug offenders, and via executive order, he phased out the federal use of private prisons. All of these were good moves. But a more dangerous drug, fentanyl, and the opioid crisis took hold under Obama. Opioid deaths went from 20,000 per year in 2010 to 50,000 in 2017, and further spiked during the pandemic before declining starting in 2023. Obama failed to combat this effectively. Finally, Obama had little success on racial issues. Following the murders of black men and boys like Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and Michael Brown by police, and the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, protests sprang up demanding action against police brutality. But Obama was unable to pass anything on this issue. Similarly, on immigration, like under Bush, House Republicans refused to vote on bipartisan Senate bills. Obama used executive action to give amnesty to children who came illegally, but he couldn't create a path to citizenship, so they remained in limbo. Overall, he was above average on domestic issues. But his healthcare legislation didn't fundamentally change the system or lower prices, it just slightly increased coverage. On the economy, he made many of Bush's tax cuts permanent, thus keeping the US in a large deficit while income inequality grew. GDP growth was far slower than under Clinton, and we covered his inability to pass major legislation on social or climate policy. And on foreign policy, Obama was average at best. His policies were closer to those of Bush Jr. than the more successful and smarter ones of Bush Sr. and Clinton. Now, as mentioned earlier, the US mostly left Iraq by 2012, and while more troops were sent to Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, withdrawal began after bin Laden was killed in 2011. And military spending fell from 4.7% of GDP in 2010 to 3.1% in 2017. But troops were sent back to Iraq in 2014 to fight ISIS, so tens of thousands remained in the two countries when Obama left office. And even the 3.1% was more than what Clinton cut spending to. And the situation in Syria was even messier than Iraq. American troops were sent there to fight ISIS, but Obama also placed sanctions on the pro-Russia Assad government and instead armed a third faction, the Kurds, to fight Assad and ISIS. Obama remarked that if Assad were to use chemical weapons, the US would intervene directly against him. But after he did, Obama instead got him to give up the rest of his chemical weapons and did not intervene. This avoided the US getting involved in another Iraq war, but Assad then remained in power thanks to Russia's backing. The Syrian civil war continued for another decade until 2024, when a former al-Qaeda member, Ahmed al-Sharaa, became the new ruler of the country. Millions of refugees fled Syria during this time, so it's hard to say that Obama's policy was successful. Libya was another country where US policy led to poor results. NATO enforced a no-fly zone in order to allow rebels to take control of the capital, Tripoli, from the dictator Muammar Gaddafi, who was then summarily executed. Gaddafi was brutal and had funded terrorism overseas, but in the aftermath, Libya plunged into civil war until 2020. Jihadists took control of much of the country, and American diplomats in Benghazi were assassinated on September 11, 2012. And in these countries, as well as others like Somalia, Obama greatly expanded the use of drone warfare. This means US troops don't have to risk their lives, but it has much higher civilian death rates and fewer guardrails. When evidence of Americans committing war crimes was leaked, Obama's Justice Department prosecuted the people who leaked it, like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, rather than any of the people who committed them. More evidence about how many civilians were killed by drones was published in 2015 by Air Force veteran Daniel Hale. Obama also renewed the Patriot Act in 2011 and prosecuted Edward Snowden after he revealed the NSA was committing illegal warrantless spying on a mass scale, instead of charging James Clapper, who lied about the program, with perjury. The number of people in Guantanamo Bay fell from 240 to 40 over Obama's tenure, and torture programs ended, but nobody who committed torture there or overseas was prosecuted, and Guantanamo remained open. Obama nonchalantly remarked, "We tortured some folks," and said, "We look forward, not backward," in regards to punishing U.S. war criminals. And his attorney general stated since torture was official government policy, people would not be held accountable for committing it. What Obama should have done was join the International Criminal Court and send all the war criminals who served under Bush there. In these policies, Obama was little better than Bush. He was also overly supportive of U.S. allies Israel and Saudi Arabia. Unlike Clinton and Carter, Obama did not force Israel to make concessions and participate in peace talks, and instead continued giving them billions of dollars in aid as they expanded settlements in the West Bank. And the US armed Saudi Arabia as they carried out bombings in Yemen, which led to mass famine. But now for Obama's better foreign policy. Rather than use force against Iran, he successfully negotiated with them to ensure they didn't obtain nuclear weapons. Sanctions remained on Iran during Obama's first term, but after Iran elected a reformist president, Hassan Rouhani, in 2013, tensions reduced. In 2015, Iran agreed to allow international inspectors in to ensure their nuclear program was not creating weapons-grade materials, but they were allowed to pursue nuclear power and had some sanctions lifted. Like Clinton with North Korea, this was a successful deal that ensured nuclear weapons didn't spread without going to war. Obama also reduced tensions with Cuba and became the first president to visit there in a century in 2016. Cuba legalized some small businesses while the US relaxed its embargo. The two countries also carried out a prisoner swap, and Obama ended the automatic asylum for anyone fleeing Cuba. This also reduced illegal immigration to the US, benefiting both countries. Obama also improved relations with many Asian nations. He lifted sanctions on Myanmar after the military held a legitimate election, and helped countries like Vietnam and the Philippines protect their maritime boundary against Chinese aggression. The US also joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade group meant to strengthen ties between non-Chinese nations in the region, so he certainly took their threat more seriously than Clinton or Bush. But on Russia, Obama had worse results than Clinton. He signed nuclear treaties with them, which made some sense, but Russia then invaded Ukraine in 2014. They successfully annexed Crimea and armed rebels in the Donbass region. Obama should not have treated Russia this well, considering they had just invaded Georgia in 2008. Some sanctions were imposed after 2014, but Obama gave no military support to Ukraine, and of course the full invasion occurred in 2022. So overall, I think Obama was a negative on foreign policy. He was too similar to Bush in the Middle East, as while troop levels and military spending decreased, troops remained there, drone attacks increased, and his policy largely failed in Libya and Syria. His successes in Iran and with Asia were not enough to offset that and the failure with Russia. Combine that with his above-average but not amazing domestic policy and other mistakes like extending the Patriot Act, and I put Obama in the C tier. Yes, he had to face a hostile Republican Congress, but Clinton also did and had much better results both domestically and overseas. Still, considering who we just had before him in Bush Jr. and who we've had since, I get the Obama nostalgia from people too young to remember Clinton's terms. Now let's see how bad his successors were, starting with Trump's first term. After the Republicans had massive success in the 2014 midterms, they were favored to win the presidency in 2016. Several establishment Republicans ran for the nomination, and the two most successful were Jeb Bush and John Kasich. But minor outsiders Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz pulled ahead of them, and non-politicians Donald Trump and Ben Carson led the polls for most of 2015. Carson faded before voting started, while Rubio and Bush had terrible debate performances. All three dropped out by mid-March, leaving Kasich, Cruz, and Trump. Trump was polling around 40%, Cruz 30%, and Kasich 20%. Meanwhile, on the Democratic side, Joe Biden declined to run after his son died of cancer, so the field was clear for Hillary Clinton, with no other major contenders. But left-wing Senator Bernie Sanders rose from relative obscurity to 40% of the polls to Hillary's 50%, and was still competitive in March, especially after a shock win in Michigan. At this point, general election polls showed a clear picture. Kasich was up by 5 to 10 points against Clinton, and Bernie had a similar lead against Trump and Cruz. Kasich versus Bernie and Trump versus Hillary showed small leads for the Democrat. But despite this, primary voters in each party chose the people polling worse, so the general was Trump versus Hillary. Both candidates were very unpopular, with 15% of voters having an unfavorable opinion of both. This was a far cry from 2008, when both McCain and Obama were well-liked. Trump ran against Mexican and Muslim immigration and against free trade deals. In addition to his open racism, he also admitted to groping women without consent in the Access Hollywood tape. Hillary called to expand Obamacare and for small tax hikes on the rich, but was much more of a status quo candidate than Bernie. And on foreign policy, she was dogged by her vote for the Iraq War and the debacle in Libya while she was Secretary of State. She also faced scandals related to her use of an unsecure email server while Secretary of State that got hacked by Russia, which then also revealed cheating in the Democratic primary by colluding with the DNC ahead of debates. Hillary still won the popular vote by 2%, but Trump took the Electoral College and presidency by narrowly winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Hillary still easily won minorities and did better than Obama among suburbanites, but she lost ground amongst working-class voters without a college degree who were disproportionately in the Great Lakes region, causing her loss. Down ballot, Republicans kept their majority in the House and Senate. The Senate winner in every state was the same as the presidential winner, so Democrats gained seats in Illinois and New Hampshire, but failed to retake the chamber. In the House, Democrats gained 6 seats, a slight improvement from 2014, but they still had 7 less than after 2012. But Trump remained unpopular in office, especially for trying to repeal Obamacare, but also because of his stances on immigration and his giant tax cut. In the midterms, Democrats flipped 7 seats in California, 4 in Pennsylvania, 4 in New Jersey, 3 in New York, and 3 in Virginia, mostly in the suburbs of big cities, along with a few seats in other states. Overall, they gained 41 House seats in the 2018 midterms, their largest gain since 1974 post-Watergate. Republicans gained in the Senate by winning in safe red Missouri, North Dakota, and Indiana, as well as a narrow win in Florida. But Democrats won in Arizona and Nevada, and even in Alabama against a theocratic pedophile. In 2020, Trump then lost re-election, tried to steal the presidency, and then encouraged a terrorist attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021. But we'll have to cover that later, and of course, he won again in 2024. Now to grading Trump's first term. I'll start with foreign policy in the Middle East. On the campaign trail, Trump both spoke out against endless wars and simultaneously said he would be tougher against terrorists and that the US should take the oil from the countries they invaded. In Afghanistan, Trump kept troops there for the first 3 years of his term, but then began negotiations to leave in 2020. When he left office, only 2,500 troops remained, well down from the 11,000 when he entered office, and Biden completed the withdrawal later in 2021. Given how easily the Taliban retook the country after the withdrawal, it probably could have been handled a bit better, but it was better than staying there forever, so minor credit to Trump. In Syria, after a chemical weapon attack in 2017, Trump launched missile strikes on a Syrian base, enforcing the red line Obama had proclaimed but not followed through on. He also ended support for Syrian rebels fighting Assad and instead focused on the fight against ISIS. After the death of ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, most US troops were withdrawn. But the lack of support for the Kurds meant that Turkey did treat them poorly. So again, minor credit to Trump for withdrawing troops. But elsewhere in the region, he was poor. He withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, reimposed sanctions, and assassinated Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, massively escalating tensions. Iran then became more anti-Israel, contributing to the October 7th attacks. And of course, when Trump came back in his second term, he then approved more strikes on Iran, killing their supreme leader. Trump was able to get Israel recognized by other countries like Sudan, Morocco, the UAE, and Bahrain in exchange for the US relaxing sanctions, recognizing Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, and for weapon sales from the US. This was a good idea. But he also recognized Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights in Syria, allowed West Bank settlements to expand, and continued giving them billions of dollars in aid. And with Saudi Arabia, Trump was extra bad. He continued support for their war in Yemen, vetoing a war powers resolution, did nothing after they assassinated American journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and engaged in blatant corruption as his son-in-law received a $2 billion investment from the Saudis. Foreign diplomats also routinely went to Trump hotels when visiting the US, and Trump spent weeks of his presidency golfing at his own properties, making his presidency probably the most corrupt since Harding. Trump also weakened reporting rules to hide how many civilians his drone strikes killed. And he pardoned war criminals like the perpetrators of the Nisour Square massacre and Eddie Gallagher, who murdered both suspected terrorists and innocent civilians. So Trump was worse than Obama in the region, though not as bad as Bush. But Trump's biggest departure from prior presidents was in his relation with the US allies. He views every transaction as zero-sum and blames trade deals with other countries for the US's problems. One place where this is true is on NATO spending. NATO countries are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on military spending every year, but most European members fell below that while the US always met it. Trump kept US spending at around 3.2%, where Obama had left it in 2016. I would have preferred it lower, but at least he didn't increase it like Bush Jr. and Reagan had. And his urging of European countries to increase their spending worked, as they ramped up spending and approached the 2% target over the next decade. But in most cases, Trump worsened the US's relationship with its allies for no reason. He withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement and the TPP, and placed tariffs on Mexico and Canada while renegotiating NAFTA, although the final deal had few changes. These didn't hurt the US economy much, but they hurt US relations with its allies. The tariffs that had a bigger impact were the ones placed on Chinese goods like steel, solar panels, washing machines, and other manufactured goods. The trade deficit with China did decline after peaking in 2018, but inflation rose above 2%, tariffs on steel actually hurt domestic manufacturing, and pork and soy farmers suffered from Chinese counter tariffs and then received a taxpayer bailout. Trump's policy changes that had the biggest impact were with North Korea and Russia. On North Korea, Trump met directly with Kim Jong-un, first in Singapore and then at the Korean border, and tried to de-escalate rather than have nuclear buildup. But before the latter meeting, Trump sent Navy SEALs to try to plant a listening device in North Korea. They were found out by civilians in a fishing boat, who they promptly murdered. Talks broke down, and Kim went back to testing nukes as much as ever. But the country that got by far the most media coverage was Russia. As mentioned, they had hacked Hillary's emails and also used fake accounts on social media sites to spread pro-Trump stories. Robert Mueller, Bush's FBI director, looked into collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and 6 Trump campaign members were indicted. Trump himself was not charged, but this was still illegal, and he then fired FBI Director James Comey, even though Comey's letter about Hillary's emails was likely the reason he won the 2016 election. He then later pardoned most of his subordinates who were charged. This was a blatantly corrupt abuse of power. Trump also blackmailed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and threatened to withhold US weapons sales unless Zelensky investigated Trump's political opponents. Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, had been involved in corrupt deals in Ukrainian energy, but asking a leader for dirt on that in exchange for money is blatant corruption and illegal. The Democratic House then impeached Trump, but the Senate fell well short of conviction. Overall, Trump's foreign policy was bad, as relations worsened with most countries between escalation with Iran and North Korea and pointless trade spats with allies in China, and he also used his power to make money from his own properties. But he did have success against ISIS and withdrew many troops from the Middle East afterwards, and got European countries to spend more on NATO instead of just having the US foot the bill. So a negative and worse than Obama, but nowhere near as bad as Bush Jr.'s foreign policy. Domestically, on economic issues, Trump was very similar to previous Republicans. He passed a large tax cut just like Bush Jr. and Reagan. The poorest workers got a slight decrease, the upper middle class paid more, and the rich paid much less. The top corporate tax rate was also slashed to 21% from 35%, and overseas profits were allowed to be brought to the US at only an 8% rate, thus rewarding countries who used accounting tricks in the past. And the most obviously bad provisions were a cut to the estate tax and a tax deduction on private jet purchases. It had some good provisions, like capping the state and local tax deduction, which benefits rich people in high-tax states, and a small tax on colleges with massive endowments, but it still benefited the rich the most and grew the deficit with only a small boost to the GDP. Trump also slashed regulations in many areas, such as in education, by allowing for-profit colleges to qualify for federally backed loans even if student outcomes sucked, in banking, by weakening the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and making it harder to file class action lawsuits against banks, and on the environment, as he raised tariffs on solar panels while cutting air quality and fuel efficiency rules and fines on polluters. Air pollution worsened from 2016 to 2019 after dropping 25% under Obama. Trump continued Bush-era surveillance programs like FISA, and like Bush, he had a poor response to a hurricane, in his case in Puerto Rico, which was left without power for almost a year. His Supreme Court nominees were also all conservatives and made bad decisions in cases like Loper v. Raimondo, Trump versus United States, Trump v. Anderson, and most well-known, Dobbs v. Jackson, when abortion rights were eliminated. In all these areas, Trump was bad, though maybe not as consequential as Reagan and Bush Jr. But where Trump represented a clear break with past presidents was on immigration. In his first month in office, he signed an executive order to ban immigration from many Middle Eastern countries like Iraq, Libya, and Iran. After legal challenges, those with green cards were exempted, but other visitors and asylum seekers were banned. This policy didn't affect that many people, although the intent was clearly racist. But Trump's immigration policies regarding the southern border were much more consequential. He consistently campaigned on building a border wall and directed money for that purpose via the DHS and military budgets. Then in 2019, he refused to sign Congress's budget as it didn't include funding for the border wall, and the government shut down for a month. The wall wasn't that crazy of an idea, as a similar 2006 Secure Fence Act passed with bipartisan support, but Trump's obsession with it and willingness to harm the economy by shutting down the government for it was a clear mistake. And even after signing the USMCA to replace NAFTA, he placed more tariffs on Mexico, demanding they send more of their own troops to the border. Mexico sent some, but also placed counter tariffs, and eventually Trump removed his tariffs. He then declared a national emergency at the border to send more funds to build the wall. And he was even more extreme when using law enforcement against immigrants in the US. Previous presidents deported plenty of criminal illegal immigrants, but largely left law-abiding, tax-paying ones alone. But under Trump, deportations of non-criminals doubled. He created a family separation policy where child asylum seekers were separated from their parents and placed in detention, but after 2 months of public outcry, he ended the policy. He was also almost as hostile to legal immigration, as he revoked the legal status of many immigrants from places like El Salvador and Haiti, and tried to end DACA status for immigrants who were brought here as children and granted legal status by Obama. Here he was certainly different from previous presidents, and for the worse. Given all these actions, Trump would probably go in high D tier. He was below average on all issues, but didn't crash the economy, get into any more wars, and wasn't as bad on social issues as the pro-slavery presidents. But so much happened in 2020 and 2021 that tanked his grade, starting with the COVID pandemic hitting the US in March. Trump had ended the NSC Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense, which prepared to handle pandemics, in 2018. But his early actions in 2020 were reasonable. Flights into the country were ended to try to stop the disease from entering, a White House coronavirus task force was promptly created, and Operation Warp Speed, where government funding expedited vaccine development, was successful. But as case numbers remained high, Trump spoke out against wearing masks and social distancing. He held a rally at which Herman Cain got COVID and then died, and then himself got the disease in October. So he was mixed on dealing with the disease. After the economy tanked and unemployment spiked due to lockdowns, Congress passed the CARES Act, which gave $2 trillion in stimulus. The vote was nearly unanimous, but this was a poor law. More money went to corporations and business owners than to individuals, hospitals, or to states for unemployment insurance. Airlines received bailouts as their passenger numbers crashed, but conditions in the bill forced them to often run empty flights, and pilots got lavish retirement packages and executives took bonuses, so by 2022, there was a pilot shortage. A month later, the Paycheck Protection Program received another $450 billion in funding, again going to business owners and other rich individuals. The stock market rebounded by July even as unemployment remained sky high, house prices rose as rich people spent their government welfare, and only in December did individuals finally receive direct cash relief, but only $600 per person, way less than these prior bills. Trump also fired the inspector generals that looked into fraud related to all these business payments, and it was later estimated up to $400 billion was given out incorrectly. While the GDP did recover by the end of the year, all this spending caused massive asset inflation starting in 2020, with inflation in goods starting in 2021, and the debt also ballooned from 100% of GDP to 115% between 2019 and 2021. In my opinion, not a great response, but these bills passed Congress with veto-proof support, so I can't criticize Trump that much. But the next major event was the murder of George Floyd in May, after which massive protests broke out against police brutality. In 2017, Trump commented that there were fine people on both sides after a neo-Nazi murdered a counter-protester with a car. But in 2020, his comments and actions were even worse. He tweeted, "When the looting starts, the shooting starts," gassed peaceful protesters for a photo op in front of a church, and sent federal officers in unmarked vehicles to cities like Portland to again crack down on peaceful protests. And policy-wise, Trump was a fan of police brutality, as he reversed Obama bans on sending military equipment to local police departments and civil asset forfeiture or legalized robbery by cop. So Trump's responses to COVID and BLM protests were bad, and his conduct during and after the 2020 election was the worst part of his presidency. During his campaign, he decried mail-in voting, which expanded in many states due to COVID, and after the results came out, he refused to concede. He filed lawsuits in many states which all failed, and his Justice Department was ordered to find voter fraud, but obviously couldn't. Then the actions got even darker. His campaign sent fake elector slates to try to get states to send electoral college voters who would vote for him and not Biden, called Georgia's Secretary of State and asked him to find 11,000 votes in order to steal the state for Trump, and after all these legal pathways failed, he gave a speech on January 6th, after which pro-Trump terrorists attacked and infiltrated the US Capitol. One Capitol police officer was murdered and at least 100 were injured. All these actions were beyond the pale and an order of magnitude worse than Bush's legal pathways to try to win the 2000 election, and they bring his grade to an F. Democrats then tried to impeach Trump, but only 7 Republicans in the Senate voted for it, so it failed. Biden's Justice Department then waited 2 years to investigate Trump, and he then won again in 2024, so I'll fully summarize his grade then. But even just for his first term, he would get an F. Now let's fully cover the 2020 election. In the Democratic primary, the main candidates were Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and Elizabeth Warren. Early polls had Biden and Bernie in front, but Biden performed abysmally in the first 3 states of Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Bernie tied Buttigieg in Iowa and won the next 2 states. But Biden then won South Carolina due to his support amongst older black voters and the endorsement of Jim Clyburn. Then, before 14 states voted on Super Tuesday, Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris all endorsed Biden. The first two even dropped out despite finishing ahead of Biden in the first three states. On Super Tuesday, Biden won the most states, and while Warren dropped out after finishing third or lower everywhere, including her home states of Massachusetts, she didn't endorse Sanders. Then COVID ground campaigning to a halt, and Biden easily won. He chose Harris as his running mate, even though her own campaign flopped so hard she dropped out before Iowa. In July, after George Floyd's murder and with the economy still suffering, Biden led in polls by between 8 and 10 points. The race tightened as the economy improved, but after Trump himself got COVID, Biden's lead went back up to 7%. In the end, he only won the popular vote by 4.5% and won 306 electoral votes. He won the Midwestern states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin that Obama won twice but Hillary lost, though Iowa and Ohio remained red. He also won Georgia and Arizona, but Florida remained red. Compared to 2016, Biden improved on Hillary's margin with white voters and held up amongst minority voters outside of Florida. Down ballot, the Senate result was the same as the presidential in every state but Maine, so Democrats won the Arizona race and both seats in Georgia to get to 50 seats. Democrats lost House seats running against their successful 2018 campaign, but kept the majority there, giving them a trifecta. Biden passed major legislation in the American Rescue Plan, another $2 trillion stimulus, vaccines were ruled out, and his approval rating remained high. But then COVID cases increased with the Delta variant, inflation grew to 5%, and Biden received a lot of criticism for his withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. His approval ratings fell and never recovered. Inflation then peaked at 8% in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine, but Democrats had a decent midterm. They lost the House, but only lost 9 seats, the best midterm for the president's party since 2002. And since Republicans ran joke candidates like Herschel Walker and Dr. Oz, Democrats even gained a Senate seat, and thanks to the overturn of Roe v. Wade, they even gained governorships. But none of this was because Biden himself was popular. Like I said in the very beginning of the very first episode of this series, it was obvious Biden was too old to be president even in 2023, let alone for 4 more years. In polls, 70% of voters agreed. Inflation stayed high in 2023 and 2024, even though the White House had claimed it would be temporary. And Biden's arming of Israel's genocide in Gaza pissed off the left and Arab voters. He finally dropped out of the race a month after the worst presidential debate performance in history, and his VP, Kamala Harris, became the Democratic nominee. Meanwhile, Trump won the Republican primary with ease. Harris took a lead in the polls after becoming the nominee, but then she said the only thing she would have done differently from Biden was appoint a Republican to her cabinet, and she paraded around with Liz Cheney and ran on democracy instead of the economy. The polls seemed tied on election day, but Trump won the popular vote by 1.5% in every swing state. He made major inroads in safe blue states like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and California by improving by double digits amongst Latino voters, which polls missed. The swing states only changed by 3% on average, with Arizona and Nevada having the largest swings to their Latino populations, with Michigan next due to its large Arab population. But unlike 2016 and 2020, the congressional results did not align with the presidency. Democrats gained 2 House seats and won the Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Michigan Senate races even as Trump won those states. Many minority first-time Trump voters either left down-ballot races blank or voted Democratic in them. But Democrats lost the deep red states of West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio, and 1 swing state Senate race in Pennsylvania, so Republicans still took the Senate. The 2024 election was a referendum on Biden, and the people did not approve. They were willing to vote for other Democrats for Congress, but after Biden's poor presidency, even more pathetic campaign, and Harris's inability to separate himself from him, Trump got back into office. Let's now see if Biden deserved to be that reviled, or if his old age and inability to communicate were the only reason his presidency was hated. Biden's term started with major economic stimulus to recover from the pandemic, first with the American Rescue Plan in March. Most of the money went directly to individuals, with $1,400 payments going to those making $75K a year or less, extended unemployment benefits, and an increased child tax credit which cut child poverty in half. It also funded vaccine distribution, COVID tests, protective equipment for schools, local transit agencies, and for a few bad provisions, giveaways to airlines and more PPP forgiveness. It also increased healthcare subsidies, which obviously helped those who received it, but also ensured big pharma and insurance companies got rich and put the US further in debt. Biden had pretended he was in favor of a public option while campaigning, but never brought it up after getting elected. He did make it so Medicare could negotiate drug prices, something Bush's law did not allow. It was only for 10 drugs and only kicked in 2024, but the limitations were because of his slim Senate majority. When it came to COVID specifically, the vaccine was rolled out effectively, as most people got 2 doses by the summer and death rates dropped. Case counts increased when new variants spread, but most deaths after mid-2021 were then of the elderly or anti-vaxxers, so Biden's policies worked to a large extent. More success came in tackling the opioid epidemic, as naloxone was approved by the FDA to be sold over the counter, and overdose deaths dropped after continually increasing until 2021. So the American Rescue Plan succeeded at tackling the specific issues of COVID and the opioid epidemic, but had limited success at decreasing overall healthcare costs. And while unemployment fell and the GDP recovered quickly, inflation also shot up in 2021. Biden and his Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen claimed that the inflation was only temporary, but this was proven false, as inflation went from 6% in mid-2021 to a peak of 9% in mid-2022 after Russia's invasion of Ukraine increased energy prices, and then stayed above 3% for the rest of Biden's term. In 2022, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, but it failed to live up to its name. It raised revenue via a minimum corporate tax rate, an excise tax on stock buybacks, and IRS funding to crack down on tax evasion by billionaires. The money was then used to fund tax credits for solar panels and electric cars and other clean energy. This decreased oil dependency in the long run, but in the short term, prices remained high, and Biden refused to raise the gas tax or place excess profits taxes on oil companies, so they just made a ton of money and increased production to record levels. Biden also increased tariffs up to 100% on Chinese solar panels and electric cars, and this made it so the law was corporate welfare for US companies. Tesla benefited the most, and its CEO is a far-right lunatic, so the law was a poor move politically in that aspect. So the law was overall good, but limited in effectiveness by the tariffs and inability to crack down on oil companies making massive profits. Biden's last two major laws, the 2021 Infrastructure Bill and the CHIPS Act, were even worse. While the former had a large price tag, most of what was actually spent went to red states that were never going to credit Biden for anything, and much of it hadn't resulted in any progress even by the end of his term. The law put $42 billion towards rural broadband and $7.5 billion for electric charging stations, but none of either were built by mid-2024. States had to meet onerous requirements and go through 14 steps before receiving the money, let alone actually finishing building. And projects funded by the law that I'm not huge on included carbon capture, green hydrogen, and new highways. Biden also implemented Buy American requirements and strengthened the Jones Act to ban foreign competition in government-funded projects. This increased costs while pissing off US allies. The law had good provisions for passenger rail, highway removal, bike paths, and more, but most of the spending was either in the wrong place or took way too long to deliver results. Some of this can be blamed on Biden's slim Senate margin, but he refused to agree on a permitting reform deal with Joe Manchin that caused many of these projects to be stalled. The CHIPS Act had less of these problems, but it was a $300 billion giveaway to big tech companies. The projects increased electricity prices, and the law didn't even stop companies from engaging in stock buybacks. Nvidia's stock price boomed, and a lot of the money went towards AI companies, which obviously have legitimate applications in improving productivity, but threaten to increase unemployment, help enable the spread of disinformation and fake news, and commit mass plagiarism. All of these policies led to large deficits, and since the high inflation meant high interest rates, the debt became more expensive. The interest rate hikes also caused some banks to go bust in 2023, and the Treasury bailed them out above the normal FDIC limits, another scenario of Biden giving out corporate welfare. Biden's government had also done nothing in January 2021 when Robinhood halted trading of GameStop as short sellers were losing money. But his administration had successes, as the FTC reduced junk fees and fought monopolies, and his pro-labor NLRB also helped to lead to wage gains faster than inflation in 2023 and 2024. Biden also increased the minimum wage for government employees and contractors to $15 an hour. But more corporate welfare came when he bailed out the Teamsters pension plan for $36 billion. And this one also failed politically as the Teamsters didn't endorse Harris in 2024. He also increased Social Security pensions with the so-called Social Security Fairness Act, which allowed workers who didn't pay Social Security taxes to receive benefits anyway. Biden also paused student loan payments for most of his presidency and attempted to forgive up to $10,000 per person, though this was blocked for most recipients by the Supreme Court. But this was not the right place to focus on educational policy. High school and lower test scores cratered during the pandemic and still haven't recovered as of 2026. The number of students who didn't know middle school math increased 30-fold at some colleges, and literacy levels also fell as students became addicted to phones and unable to read anything longer than a paragraph. Just subsidizing student loans was a giveaway to colleges that had hiked tuition and increased staff levels over the previous decades, and not a move to actually improve educational quality. So for Biden's grade on the economy, he was average. The worst predictions, such as Bloomberg saying that there was a 100% chance of a recession in 2023, were proven false, and the GDP recovered from the pandemic. But this came at the cost of high inflation and massive deficits. The debt-to-GDP ratio declined between 2021 and 2023 due to the economic recovery, but in 2024, It increased to 120% as Biden kept spending, but GDP growth was only 2.3%, the lowest year since 2016 besides 2020. The spending was often in narrow schemes just to benefit certain special interests or voting groups, and Biden didn't raise taxes on the rich outside of the increased IRS funding. But his legislation was effective at combating climate change, the opioid epidemic, and rolling out vaccines. While the effects were not as large as previous Democratic administrations despite the large price tags, voters in 2024 were overly pessimistic. Some of that was because of Biden's initial denial of inflation and his pure communication skills, but a lot of it was also due to negative press coverage. Now to social policy. While Black Lives Matter peaked in 2020, Biden failed to pass any major police reform or voting rights legislation due to Republican opposition. He did reduce federal private prisons, made Juneteenth a federal holiday, and pardoned all federal weed charges, though the vast majority are on the state level. After the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, Congress refused to reinstate federal protections, but Biden ended a ban on abortion pill sales via the mail, which is controlled by the federal government, and got gay marriage codified in case the Supreme Court overturned that. After the Uvalde school shooting, Biden did get some federal gun control passed. It gave money to states for red flag programs and school mental health services and applied background checks for gun purchasers 21 or younger. This was far weaker than Clinton's assault weapons and Brady handgun bills, but better than nothing passing under Obama. In these areas, Biden was well-intentioned but only had minor successes. But immigration was another story. After falling in 2020 as the economy tanked, the number of southern border crossers doubled to 2 million per year under Biden. Most of them claimed they were seeking asylum, and Biden ended Trump's policies to make them remain in Mexico or return them to their home country and let them in while they were waiting for their asylum court hearing. Many were housed at hotels at government expense as their case made its way through the courts. The number of asylum seekers went from 1 million in 2020 to 3.2 million in 2024. Border state Republicans, especially in Texas, bussed these migrants to states like New York and Massachusetts. And as Texas put up fencing on its border, Biden told the federal government to take it down. Then, after years of claiming there was no immigration crisis, in 2024, Biden finally tried to pass an immigration bill through Congress. After House Republicans refused so the issue would hurt Democrats in the 2024 election, he passed an executive order to allow for deportations of illegal crossers who seek asylum. This could have been done at any time during his first 3 years as well, but it worked. The number of illegal crossers went down, but this was far too late in his term. The policies of letting in more asylum seekers and cutting down Texas's fencing were not made up. They were intentional decisions that made the numbers much higher. The fact that more people were seeking asylum was not Biden's fault. In fact, it was because the economy was doing well. But his policy clearly failed politically, especially in regions like South Texas and amongst legal Latino voters, and in my opinion, it was also a policy mistake. Finally, we also have to discuss the government's pathetic efforts to hold Trump accountable for trying to steal the 2020 election. Biden's DOJ only started an investigation in November 2022 after Trump declared he was running again. This made the appointment look political when in fact it was necessary if the country's laws were to apply to everyone, and was way too late in the process to achieve anything. Trump and Biden also had cases of not returning classified documents after their terms as president and VP respectively ended. Trump's case was only brought to a grand jury in June 2023, even though the issue was known about as early as May 2021, and was dismissed after the horrific Trump v. United States Supreme Court decision in July 2024. In Biden's case, he was interviewed by special counsel Robert Hur. Hur declined to charge Biden and called him a well-meaning old man with a poor memory. Democrats objected, as Biden was still running for re-election, but this was just a denial of something everyone could see. Only after the 2024 debate where he said he finally beat Medicare did Biden drop out. In December after the election, the Washington Post reported that Biden had barely held any cabinet meetings throughout his presidency. And he spent his last few months in office pardoning his own son for drug and gun charges and pretending the Equal Rights Amendment was ratified instead of using any of the power granted to him by numerous Supreme Court decisions. Biden's lack of urgency in holding Trump accountable and his running for re-election despite being senile were the biggest mistakes of his tenure, and they bring his domestic grade down to a negative, the first Democrat I've given that to since Wilson. Wilson was also senile after a stroke in 1919, but he didn't run in 1920 and had a good foreign policy, albeit one brought down by the Treaty of Versailles being used over his 14 points and the US not joining the League of Nations. Do I think Biden was good on foreign policy? Biden's first major foreign policy decision was to withdraw troops from Afghanistan, something Trump had signed an agreement on. The original withdrawal date was May 1st, but Biden pushed it back to September 11th. Troops were gradually withdrawn throughout July and August, but on August 15th, Taliban troops easily retook Kabul, and President Ashraf Ghani fled the country, literally taking bags of cash with him. This showed that the regime the US had propped up over the last 2 decades was fraudulent and corrupt, and that Bush's policy failed miserably. The withdrawal then got even worse, as many American weapons were left, and Afghans who worked for the US and had been promised asylum were unable to leave. On one hand, no Americans have died in Afghanistan since 2021, and it's clear the previous strategy was failing if the Afghan government was so inept, but it's also clear the withdrawal could have been handled better and delayed so more people and US assets could have been evacuated. So I give Biden a neutral grade on this. I give him more credit for reducing the use of drones and for putting a pause on arms sales to the Saudis and resuming food aid to Yemen to mitigate the starvation there. These policies were clearly better than his predecessors who killed civilians by using drones and armed the Saudis. But Biden's Middle East policy changed dramatically in 2023 after the October 7th attack by Hamas against Israel. 1,000 Israelis were killed, mostly civilians, but immediately after, Israel began bombing Gaza, destroying their infrastructure and killing tens of thousands of civilians. They also cut off electricity and aid, leading to mass starvation. Benjamin Netanyahu was indicted by the ICC on war crimes charges, but Biden let him make a speech to Congress and kept giving him tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons instead of stopping the slaughter. Giving arms sales to a regime that commits human rights abuses was also illegal under US law. The US vetoed multiple UN resolutions for ceasefires, until almost a year later, closer to the 2024 election, Biden finally called for a ceasefire. But he still refused to withhold weapons, and instead pretended to give Gaza aid via a US pier. But the pier was a complete lie. It was used by Israel during an operation to rescue hostages in which 300 Palestinians were killed, and then abandoned less than a month later. Only in January 2025 did Israel finally agree to a ceasefire. Needless to say, arming and funding the slaughter and arguable genocide of at least 70,000 people was horrific policy. Israel also assassinated the leader of Hamas while he was in Iran, used exploding pagers to kill Hezbollah members in Lebanon, and invaded southern Syria during Biden's term, all with tacit approval. They escalated wars and killed way more people than were victims on October 7th. Biden had the worst policy on Israel of any US president, and this is a massive stain on his legacy. The other big foreign policy event, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was handled much better. Biden gave over $200 billion in military aid to Ukraine over his term that helped it rebuff Russian advances despite its much smaller size and army. One effort to hurt Russia failed when Biden reduced sanctions on Venezuela to try to get Maduro to hold a free election, and export oil to Europe to hurt Russian oil revenues. But Maduro then rigged the election and threatened to invade its neighbor Guyana, so the sanctions were reinstated. Another area where Biden made a mistake was in supporting the ousting of Pakistan's democratically elected Prime Minister, Imran Khan, for refusing to stop buying Russian oil. Khan was removed and thrown in jail, and the next Pakistani election was then rigged against his party. Biden was more lenient with India, who still buys Russian oil today. But Biden's policy helped Ukraine without making the US the only one paying for the defense. He also helped get Finland and Sweden into NATO, as they now feared Russia more. Other NATO countries gave Ukraine aid and increased their military budgets, and Biden let the US military budget fall to 3% of GDP, its lowest level since Bill Clinton. As mentioned in the domestic section, the US subsidies in the CHIPS Act did anger the EU, but Biden still vastly improved relations that Trump had weakened. The US also improved relations between Japan and South Korea, created AUKUS alongside Australia and the UK, and the Quad Security Alliance alongside India, Japan, and Australia. These alliances were mostly meant to counter China. Biden also broke with past US policy of strategic ambiguity and said out loud that the US would defend Taiwan if China invaded, and he continued weapon sales to Taiwan. But Biden was too hawkish towards China in some aspects, especially with the tariffs that worsened inflation and then the shooting down of a weather balloon in 2023. But actions like banning TikTok, first on government devices in 2022 and then in general in 2024, was good, not just for theoretical national security reasons, but also because it's brain rot that's making Americans dumber. And while the CHIPS Act was a massive subsidy to big tech, exploring alternate supply chains for rare earth minerals and types of batteries was important in case China embargoed these items. So in total, the abysmal policy in supporting the Gaza genocide outweighs everything else in Biden's foreign policy and brings his overall great as president to a D. Most of his policy was just mediocre, but between allowing Israel to kill at least 70,000 people with impunity and his arrogance in running for re-election that led to Trump's second term, I put him below every other Democratic president since the Civil War. Let's close off quickly with Trump's second term. I covered the 2024 election in detail under Biden's slide, and we all just lived through it, so I'll just get straight to Trump's policies during his second term and give him his grade for both terms. Trump's macroeconomic results from his first year were below average. His main policy on the economy is raising and lowering tariff rates several times. The first major raise was on so-called Liberation Day in April, but they changed many times after that on his whims. The Supreme Court just ruled these tariffs illegal, but Trump promptly used another law to put up a universal 15% tariff. Inflation did not spike as much as the worst predictions, as companies stockpiled imports before the raises, but it lingered at 3% in 2025 instead of continuing to fall, and just now oil prices spiked because of the Iran war. And despite the revenue brought in by the tariffs and alleged spending cuts via DOGE, the deficit was basically the same as 2024. GDP growth was also lower than every other year post-pandemic, and most of the growth that did happen was caused by AI investment, an industry Trump gave a tariff exemption to. He also created an AI litigation task force which will sue states who try to pass their own AI regulations. Like in his first term, farmers were hurt by counter tariffs and relied on government subsidies, and manufacturing jobs also fell every month since April. As while US imports decreased, tariffs on supply chain inputs made the US a less competitive exporter. The unemployment rate slowly climbed from 4% in January 2025 to 4.5%. And just now, the December numbers were revised down by 60,000. January 2026 was the worst January for layoffs since 2009 during the Great Recession, and in February, 90,000 jobs were lost. If AI is a bubble, then the economy will fall into a deep recession very soon, and if it isn't, then unemployment will just get even worse. And even these poor numbers might be inflated, as Trump fired the BLS chief in July after jobs numbers were revised down, and other reports have been delayed or cancelled, ostensibly because of government shutdowns. Since Trump's first big tariff announcement in April, the US dollar has fallen in value and the US stock market has grown slower than Europe's. Trump's main economic legislation besides the tariffs was the Big Beautiful Bill. It made most of his first-term tax cuts permanent, added tax deductions for tips and overtime which will encourage companies to use those as loopholes, created a tax break only for seniors, and added an auto loan interest tax deduction while ending fuel efficiency standards and a biking tax benefit in blatant favoritism to the auto industry. Meanwhile, Biden's clean energy tax credits, Medicare drug price negotiation, and increased IRS funding were cut, as was funding for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, food stamps, and Medicaid. Hundreds of rural hospitals are expected to close because of the bill. This mostly gave benefits to the rich, old, and car lobby, added more loopholes, hurt the environment, and made healthcare more expensive. The bill also increased funding for ICE from $10 billion a year to over $30 billion, as well as funding for the DHS and Border Patrol. The money was used to hire more poorly trained agents and conduct far more sweeping raids, construct detention centers to hold more immigrants, including Alligator Alcatraz in Florida, and increase border wall construction. After these agencies murdered 2 U.S. citizens in Minneapolis, Democrats refused to fund DHS for 2026, but ICE is still funded. In addition, the U.S. Army and National Guard were deployed in cities like LA, DC, and Chicago. These were largely ruled illegal later, but they were not as violent as the immigration agencies. Reasonable immigration policies include the Lake and Riley Act, which denies bail to non-citizens accused of theft, assault, or motor vehicle crimes, and the reinstatement of the Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers. But Trump basically ended all refugee admission except for white South Africans, ignored court orders, and deported people without due process, including to a slave labor camp in El Salvador. He revoked legal statuses of pro-Palestinian protesters and Haitian immigrants in Ohio to try to deport them as well. This is obviously all immoral and largely illegal, and also led to less tourism and foreign students in the US, hurting the economy. Other actions against free speech included NSPM 7, which the government has used to try to subpoena the social media histories of protesters while labeling them domestic terrorists, attacking law firms who opposed Trump's actions, and freezing federal funds to universities who allowed pro-Palestine demonstrations. In addition to ending the clean energy subsidies, Trump hurt the environment by forcing unprofitable coal plants to stay open while revoking wind farm approvals. The EPA also no longer claimed greenhouse gases or air pollution harm public health. The CDC was handcuffed even more. The insane anti-vax conspiracy theorist RFK Jr. was made health secretary, and many vaccine trials were defunded and others were no longer recommended. 2 other terrible government agencies were the FBI and DOJ, who covered up the Epstein files, including redacting Trump's name in it repeatedly, and a made-up government agency, DOGE, illegally destroyed U.S. aid, slashed malaria and food aid to third world countries, leading to mass deaths and much of the food simply rotting instead of being shipped out. It also conducted mass layoffs of federal government positions, violating laws there too. Finally, Trump's corruption hit new levels in his second term. His worst pardon was day 1 of his presidency when he pardoned all of the Jan 6th insurrectionists. But he then used his own crypto scam coin to receive bribes and pardoned over 50 white-collar criminals, many of whom were also spared from having to pay restitution. The White House's East Wing was demolished to build a ballroom, and many companies and individuals made bribes to Trump for that project. He also received a $400 million debt from Qatar and sued the IRS for leaks of his taxes and the DOJ for investigations into him under Biden. There are very few positives here, so he gets an F on domestic policy.
And in foreign policy, Trump has been worse than his first term. Once again, he ruined relations with Europe and Canada by threatening to annex Canada and Greenland and by increasing tariffs. In the Americas, the US bombed boats in the Caribbean, claiming they were stopping drug traffickers, but many were just fishermen, and video evidence shows the US killing survivors floating in the wreckage. Trump then kidnapped Nicolas Maduro and arrested him under drug charges. All of this was illegal. Trump also gave Argentina a $20 billion bailout before an election to help his ally Javier Milei. He helped Ukraine less than Biden did, as he massively reduced arms sales to them, berated Zelensky at a White House meeting alongside Vance and Rubio, and held a meeting with Putin in Alaska, and then pushed for a ceasefire with Russian-friendly terms. But Putin then overplayed his hand, and Trump called for tariffs on any country still buying Russian oil, something Biden had not done. And he was straight up better than Biden on Israel. They ended their mass bombings of Gaza, had a final hostage exchange, and entered a ceasefire. Violence has not ended. The US made Microsoft brick the email address of the ICC prosecutor accusing Israel of genocide, and Trump created a fake board of peace and threatened to annex Gaza. So he's definitely still bad on the issue, but he beats Biden's incredibly low bar. However, the reason Israel stopped bombing Gaza is because Trump moved on to war with Iran. He first struck them in June 2025, supposedly over their nuclear capabilities, even though the Iran deal under Obama had solved that issue. Then in February 2026, full war broke out as the US and Israel bombed Tehran. The leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, was killed, but so were hundreds of schoolgirls and thousands of other civilians. Of course, neither of these strikes were legal under international law. Iran then retaliated by bombing US bases, leading to American deaths, something that didn't happen in the short Venezuela operation. Iran also hit oil refineries in the Middle East and ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Oil prices spiked, and the US then allowed countries like India to buy Russian oil again, so that strategy ended up failing. While the impact of this has not fully played out yet, and it may not last as long as the Iraq War, at least Bush got congressional approval for that action, while this has been completely illegal under US law, let alone international law. I originally wanted this part to be out on Jan 20th, 1 year into Trump's term, but I'm glad I waited, as the Minneapolis murders and now this illegal war make me confident in putting him at F- instead of just F. He has broken countless laws both domestically and internationally, been insanely corrupt, hurt the economy, cut healthcare and food stamps just to let the rich get even richer, gone way further on immigration than his first term, destroyed US standing on the world stage again, and this latest war will now spike inflation and probably cause a recession. Let's now see my full rankings and then compare them to historians' lists. Here's what I had after part 2. I made a few minor tweaks since, but nobody moved by more than one spot or rank. For today's entries, Truman slots in just below FDR with a similar record, but slightly less standout legislation domestically. LBJ goes at the bottom of A, for a great economy and incredible civil rights legislation, but a terrible war in Vietnam. Clinton and JFK both had broadly good tenures both domestically and in foreign policy, but with no single success good enough to put them in A. Eisenhower and Carter were broadly above average, though Carter was hurt by the Iranian Revolution, so he wasn't as liked at the time and lost re-election. Obama and Bush Sr. were both mostly above average, but Obama was too hawkish in the Middle East and attacked whistleblowers, while Bush nominated Clarence Thomas, putting both of them only in C. Ford was also mostly average, but pardoned Nixon, putting him in C-. Reagan took the country in the wrong direction with his tax cuts, deregulation, and Supreme Court, but did negotiate with Gorbachev and helped end the Cold War. Biden was merely okay economically, armed a genocide, and let Trump come back into office. Nixon had lows worthy of F-, but had a few positives in visiting China and some progressive economic policies and decent growth, while Bush and Trump had almost no positives, and both passed massive tax cuts for the rich and blew up the deficit without having strong growth. Bush was worse on foreign policy, but Trump is worse on the rule of law, and his foreign policy might catch up to Bush if he sends ground troops to Iran. I think the two of them and Buchanan are a pretty clear bottom 3 all time. Now let's see the latest historian list from Siena College and C-SPAN, and where I differ with them. As you can see, their two lists are quite similar. The Siena poll is a little more left-wing, with Reagan, Coolidge, Nixon, and McKinley lower, but besides those four, their top 3 and bottom 3 tiers are the exact same. They're similar to mine as well. I have Clinton, Hayes, and Jefferson higher because of their strong economic records, and Obama, Eisenhower, McKinley, and Madison lower, as I view all their foreign policies negatively. As you can see, over time, Grant has been rising and Jackson falling as people reconsider their racial legacies. But one thing I find baffling is how Bush Jr. has been rising. Just because Trump is also awful doesn't make Bush any better. Obama has also been rising, but Clinton and Carter for some reason have not been. As mentioned, Foreign policy is where I disagree with them the most, as I have Reagan and Nixon much lower and Eisenhower a fair bit lower. They also have Polk and McKinley on similar levels. Both were imperialist and gained the US territory, but I think Polk's claim to fight Mexico over a disputed Texas border was way more legitimate than McKinley fighting Spain and then subjugating the Philippines and fighting a war there. LBJ's Vietnam policy was certainly bad, but he belongs way higher than Bush and at least as high as Nixon, who was also bad on Vietnam and Laos, but worse with Bangladesh and Israel. But that's it for me for this part. Let me know your biggest disagreements with my list, and I hope we get another A or S tier president soon, as it's been 60 years, and I'm tired of going from a horrible Republican to mediocre Democrat. I'm not sure why C-SPAN didn't do a 2025 survey, but if either of these two organizations release another ranking, I may leave a comment about it and my thoughts. Until then, take care.